Chapter 41, Chapter 41 Rated R for Rabbit. Although Harry was tempted to break out the reality bomb, set the timer to 5 seconds and say adios, he wanted a better idea of the situation before he started destroying everything. Harry opened the eyelids of one of the unconscious lab coat-wearing personnel and used legilimency combined with telepathy to target and read specific sets of information. It seemed this location was a vast compound run and owned by Mr. Sinister, the one nanny and orphan maker escaped from. Their goal after kidnapping Jean was to implant some mental programming into her mind, collect some DNA, and then wipe her mind of the procedure and release her to be found by the X-Men. What surprised Harry was that after learning that they had no intention to kill or keep her, he didn't feel a need to adjust his plans for wiping out the complex. The fact that she was a target in the first place was the issue. If they had politely invited her, asked nicely, and accepted a refusal if given, then he wouldn't care. But no, they had ambushed her when she was alone, captured her, and taken her. Ping. New quest detected, Sinister takedown. Quest can only be taken from Dungeon, Sinister's lair at the hard or hell mode difficulty. Dungeon settings currently disabled. To enable quest, please exit Dungeon, enable Dungeon mode, and re-enter and choose either hard or hell mode difficulty. The pop-up certainly got Harry's attention. Since the fiasco with hell mode at Hogwarts, Harry had kept the dungeon generation system turned off with the intention to never turn it on again. And yet he was tempted. He did need to level up after all. As for the innocence in the complex, Harry knew there to be none. From his mind, Harry learned that the man was a clone as were all the other personnel. They were created to be loyal and controllable. They didn't even know what the programming they were going to apply to Jean had been for. Harry paused and went over the ups and downs for a while before deciding to give it a go. Worst case scenario was failure to destroy the place. Harry made another portal and left the place before opening his settings and turning on the dungeon settings. He also took a swig of polyjuice potion and changed his clothes. He had been in too much of a rush to disguise himself before getting Jean, but since he was about to go on a rampage, a little precaution wouldn't hurt. Harry made a portal back to the same spot and the moment he was about to enter, he got the pop-up he never thought he'd see again. Dungeon generation active. You are about to enter Sinister's lair. Please select a difficulty. Easy, normal, hard, hell. Rewards scale to match difficulty. Harry physically poked the selection for hell. He had changed the settings a while back so that he had to poke the selection instead of think it. The reason he chose hell on purpose this time was that unlike his time at Hogwarts, he was actually prepared. Hell difficulty selected. Once a dungeon had generated, it would not change, so if Harry left and came back, it would not give an option to select a lower difficulty unless he destroyed it and it was rebuilt. Ping. New quest, Sinister takedown. Destroy Mr. Sinister's evil lair. Defeat Vanisher. Defeat Prism. Defeat Azimuth. Defeat Aries. Defeat Mr. Sinister or force him to flee. Harry opened up his minimap and saw a half-dozen areas where he figured each of the targets were located. He zoomed out of the minimap and though there were no details for areas he had never explored, if he zoomed out enough, he could tell his location on the planet. From what he saw, he appeared to be somewhere in Central Africa. When he compared the map to some of the atlas in his inventory, he appeared to be one of the mountainous regions. After another pause, Harry had a plan that was both vicious, ruthless, and would leave both horror and nightmares to any of the few that may last long enough to survive. The first thing Harry took out was a crystal sculpture that was in the shape of a bunny rabbit. In the center of the crystal was a fist-sized gold sphere of vibranium engraved adamantium which held more magic than any other artifact Harry had ever created and was even comparable to some of the relics Harry had seen in Camartage. Harry cast several unlocking spells on the crystal rabbit which allowed the magic within to activate. The final measure to unlock was a voice command from Harry. Rise, Rabbit of Konogg. The moment the final word was spoken, the crystal turned into a slightly chubby white fuzzy bunny rabbit. Harry telepathically sent the parameters for its targets into the rabbit's mind. Those with clean clothes in this facility, and those who attack the rabbit. Any who meet these criteria were considered targets. The rabbit was gently placed on the ground and it took a moment to scan its surroundings and Harry. By default Harry would not be a target even if he fell in the parameters, but the unconscious personnel in the room were. The rabbit vanished from where it stood at speeds that would have given Pietro a run for his money and it reappeared where it stopped next to one of the unconscious lab techs. Harry turned away and went over to a corner. From his inventory he took out 4 difficult pieces of tech and assembled them into a reality bomb. Unlike that unstable first iteration he used against the Knights of Woolpurgis, this one was far more stable. Relatively speaking, Harry didn't purposely set out to create a reality bomb one day. He was simply trying to create magic that could replicate his inventory while looking through the magics of how the Room of Requirements worked. Since his inventory worked through means he couldn't understand, Harry's experiments went far beyond the recommended practices and right into forbidden territory. Eventually Harry had the idea to expand a point of zero volume into empty space. At first no matter how much he tried, it didn't work, so he tried overcharging the spell. What Harry didn't realize back then was that expanding a zero volume point was the wizard equivalent of dividing by zero. The reason the roar could do so was because the origin of its space was Thin's nether realm while Harry was trying to expand nothing into something. Harry did not create a pocket of space from nothing, instead he created a bubble that rapidly expanded and lasted for a few moments before it popped. The bubble itself seemed to reject the laws of reality, and everything caught within would practically have its logic removed. When the bubble popped, the laws of reality would impose themselves back on the space, which had a myriad of unpredictable effects. Even matter outside the bubble would be affected, as the laws of reality would be pushed from the bubble and then swept back in like a flowing tide, and those near the shore were affected as well. The range of this bomb would be about half a kilometer and wouldn't go off on its own without substantial tampering. Anything caught within may end up crushed, disintegrated, altered, or erased from existence. Harry tested a number of them in the mirror dimension, which fixed itself regularly, so he knew the effects well enough. Harry set the bomb's timer to 30 minutes and headed up the stairs. The dozen guards and workers Harry had knocked out earlier had become blood-stained skeletons with shredded lab coats. Harry spotted the last guard in the ground, who was surrounded by more than 30 white rabbits, gnawing at the man's flesh and stripping it bare. Harry felt no pity for any of them. The rabbit of Konogg was a construct that Harry put a lot of the life force he gathered from Limbo into making. It was designed to be used if Harry was ever surrounded by enemies, like in case he got trapped in hell again with nothing but demons. The adamantium and vibranium core of the original rabbit included over a dozen spells, which was a feat only possible thanks to the magic conductive properties of the two metals. Unlike the adamantium of Logan's skeleton, which was actually an artificial adamantium made with a base of iron, true adamantium made of alchemically synthesized gold could hold spells better than any other. The rabbit of Konogg could absorb energy and replicate itself using the flesh of others through a combination of transfiguration and the Gemini spell. Though it looked like they were eating, the rabbit's skull and teeth had hardness near that of adamantium, and it could move at battering ram speeds, allowing them to bust open doors. They could also jump at blinding speeds, and their teeth also had a severing charm constantly applied to it. If a rabbit had absorbed enough energy, it could use that to replicate itself as well. Harry chose this weapon of mass destruction for two reasons. First, from the memories of the lab tech, Harry learned that Sinister had a fondness for energy weapons. The second was that Mr. Sinister was a scientist who devoted years to studying mutants. He likely had a contingency plan for any mutant he encountered. But how would he react to Harry's swarm of Konogg? Harry wanted to know. Once their meal was over, the rabbits quickly leapt to the upper floor and headed down the hallway. Harry turned himself invisible and decided to just guide his swarm from the back. At the end of the hall was a group of 30 rabbits, and many of them were smashing themselves headfirst into the door, which, dent by dent, seemed like it would give way any moment. Harry, however, was not the patient sort, so he quietly conjured a replica of the Kestrel key of Kraken. Using it as a wand, he fired a beam of light at the door, which lit up green and opened. Although Harry's wizard unlocking spell would fry a computer lock, he was free to use the sorcerer spell to unlock things as he pleased. Harry was not concerned with cameras or sensors. The moment he decided to end this place, he released the tight grip he had on his wizard magic, and every piece of tech around him was flashing, sending off sparks, or shutting down due to critical error. Not to mention the fact that each rabbit contained a massive amount of wizard magic as well. The door he opened earlier had actually already fried and only opened due to the nature of the unlocking spell he used. The swarm of rabbits was met with a platoon of 6 armed guards who started opening fire the moment the door opened. Harry stayed to the side to avoid the incoming blasts, and though he could easily survive them, he didn't want them to target him while invisible regardless. The energy weapons made each rabbit it hit glow for a moment but did nothing else. The swarm of rabbits launched forward like arrows fired from a bow, and only a single guard in the back, who ducked down at the last moment, found himself not deprived of his head as he watched the headless forms of his squad fall lifelessly to the ground. He didn't even have time to scream before another half-dozen rabbits launched forward, removing his head and both arms. One of the scariest things about the rabbit of Konogg was that each copy possessed a hive mind. This made it easier for Harry to direct when needed, but it also meant they could attack in formation. The inspiration for the artifact was half from Monty Python and half from that story Mr. Rasputin told about the 3,000 rabbit army which defeated Napoleon in history class. The corpses were quickly swarmed and transfigured into another dozen rabbits, which continued down the hall. The room at the end of the hall was large and had another 15 or so people in lab coats. There were no screams. The white fuzzy bunnies spreading out was strange, but not something the lab techs would run away from. They didn't see what happened, and the rabbits were spreading out at Harry's command before going for the kill. Harry almost smirked to himself when a few of the personnel actually ignored the rabbits. What they didn't ignore was their computer screens suddenly looking like they had been exposed to a magnet. An alarm on the wall turned on, which got everyone's attention and made a great distraction. Harry used to have a bunny rip the head of each of the lab techs. Harry didn't consider the spell which prevented the rabbit's fur from getting stained with blood useless, because in situations like this, the clean white rabbits made people lower their guard too easily. A bald male appeared in the room out of nowhere, and Harry's minimap showed him blinking, indicating him as one of the targets. The man had extensive tattoos over his head and arms, and after taking a look at the rabbits, took out a gun and started shooting them. Harry used his control over the rabbits to prevent them from retaliating. The man continued to shoot rabbit after rabbit, and when he stopped to reload, Harry shot him with a spell he found in the Black Family Library, which didn't emit light or sound. After he confirmed the spell made contact, Harry had the rabbits attack the man from his blind spot. Harry wasn't surprised when the man vanished in thin air. Many teleporters had excellent space perception, and attacks from behind wouldn't do much unless he couldn't sense them or were fast enough. The man did not return, though, as a checkmark appeared next to the name Vanisher on the quest board. The spell Harry used was a weaponized version of the effect of the blood replenishing potion using the Gemini charm as a base. It caused the opponent's blood to increase without end until the physical body exploded. It didn't have much use on magicals as their blood required a lot more effort to replicate, but a muggle without anything special in their blood would be affected without issue. Though a mutant, the man teleported with his mind, meaning there was nothing special about his body. The rabbits that were shot did not dispel. All rabbits would only dispel when Harry dispelled the activation magic on the original. What did happen though was that the live rabbits went over and made it look like they were reviving their dead, though it was just a recasting of the transfiguration magic on the flesh. Harry had the rabbits rip open and consume the materials on the biohazard marked containers which Harry found contained blood samples. 2 minutes after entering the room, there were now about 100 rabbits. Harry looked up his minimap to learn where his remaining targets were and where the dead ends likely were and went about opening doors and leading his rabbit horde while remaining invisible. The sirens seemed to have been the evacuation order as the following rooms were empty. Harry used his map and door unlocking spells to continue up into the compound until he made it to a room containing a massive brood of a man with enormous goat horns on his head and a long frazzled white beard. The other targets save one are all heading in his direction and this is the one that got there first. The 12-foot-tall behemoth wore thick armor over his torso and shoulders but looked more than a little confused when the herd of fuzzy white rabbits calmly hopped out of the hallway. He holds a hand to his ear and says, sir, it's rabbits. Dozens of them. Aha. Did you find Vanisher yet? Harry has the rabbits do the same as earlier, spread out, and look docile. The giant continued, yes sir, they are white and fuzzy. I don't know sir. Do you want me to check? He walked over to a pair of bunnies and stepped on them, squishing the pair beneath his massive foot. He lifted his foot to confirm the gore and said, they squish like bunnies. No sir. Sir? Sinister, I can't hear you. The communicator fell to the effect of the magic in the room and Harry launched his dimension splitter from behind the massive man. The last time he used the spell it only barely wounded the immortal black dragon but this man was far from Kyantang's standard and the armor had no magic defense as it appeared to be solid metal. The rabbits quickly devoured both halves of the giant and the 100 rabbits quickly turned to 150. Harry vanished the bones which left traces of his magic before heading into the next room. Harry continued unlocking doors and leading the group up the complex. 2 of the final targets had grouped together and were waiting in the next room. 30 armored guards with high-tech weaponry stood at the ready against the swarm. In the back of the group were 2 who stood out. A man seemingly composed of sand-colored crystal and a short woman with pink skin stood in the open, waiting for the horde. The crystal man said into a communicator, Aries is gone. I don't see anyone opening the doors except the rabbits. Understood sir. He motioned forward and the armed guards opened fire. Harry apparat to the far side of the room behind the group as he had no way to easily dodge incoming fire from such a confined space. The rabbits took it in stride and after being struck 2 or 3 times the rabbits would glow brightly and another rabbit would form next to them. Harry had the rabbits slow their advance so they could soak up more energy fire from the guards. The crystal man shouted, hold your fire, and Harry used that moment to order an attack. The rabbit's teeth and magic easily ripped through the guards' armor and limbs and heads were ripped off one by one. The crystal man ran over to the wall while several rabbits had their teeth locked onto his limbs and they were slowly nibbling away as the dense materials. He swatted them away like mosquitoes but they would jump back at him as soon as they had a chance and he shouted, Azimuth, now. The purple-skinned woman had been deftly dodging the attacking rabbits and did a backflip over to the wall herself and opened her mouth wide. From Harry's perspective, it looked like a black hole had formed in her mouth and a vortex of suction force was dragging everything not nailed down in the room into her mouth. Unfortunately for the pair, they were on the same wall as Harry. The young wizard cast an overpowered transfiguration spell at the crystal man and turned him into sand. That spell had little effect on organic tissue but turning glass or crystal to sand wasn't difficult for a strong wizard. Azimuth closed her mouth and turned to see her partner turn to sand just as the severing spell came at her. The woman's reflexes were impressive as she ducked the decapitating slash but the horde of rabbits had taken the moment she closed her mouth and dodged Harry's attack to gain the distance. Surrounded from all sides, she had no place to dodge and she was quickly devoured by rabbits leaving only a skeleton. It cost more magic to transfigure bone into a rabbit compared to flesh so all the corpses left bloody skeletons. Also made for a nightmare-inducing atmosphere which appealed to Harry's nature as a prankster with arguably bad taste. Though he did vanish the sand of the crystal guy and repair the damage done to the wall by the severing spell with a reparo charm. The less evidence of his capabilities, the better. The minimap was showing more and more hallways so Harry had groups of rabbits split off and go on their own while Harry led the main horde to the final target. Harry had no idea how it worked, but he even got experience from the kills of the faraway rabbits. He had already leveled up twice from the massive amount of human guards killed through the complex, not to mention to 4 targets Harry suspected gave more experience than usual because of the quest. By the time Harry's swarm reached what appeared to be a throne room, about 22 minutes had passed meaning the bomb would go off in another 8 minutes. The throne room was empty save the targets sitting on the throne watching the approaching rabbit horde. Harry's energy senses barely reacted to the weapons and the mutants in this place, but this guy was at another level entirely. Harry's first impression of the man with the ash-gray skin was a vampire, but the lack of death energy put that theory quickly to rest. He had a red diamond on his forehead and red eyes. His suit seemed to be made of metallic ribbons which looked both decorative and functional. As there was only one target without a checkmark in the quest list, it was obvious this was Mr. Sinister, the boss of this place. The moment the rabbit horde got close enough, a telepathic attack was sent by Mr. Sinister and attempted to take control of the rabbits. Bad call. Unless he could mimic the signature of Harry's thoughts, they wouldn't listen to him and went into a frenzy as that was considered an attack. The group of more than 50 rabbits launched forward at the same time, but Sinister fired red energy beams from his hands which Harry sensed had a similar signature to Scott's and matched the power of Scott's beam without his visor. The rabbits were blown back but glowed white and multiplied in the air, leading to more rabbits gathering together and charging once more. A few rabbits made it through, but a powerful Chinook barrier formed and the rabbits bounced off. A few rabbits hopped onto the top of the barrier and began to gnaw on it, but the barrier pulsed, causing the rabbits to be shot away. Mr. Sinister then telekinetically lifted the 100 rabbits into the air and one by one, snapped their necks. Harry pulled his magic guns out of his inventory and fired. Sinister's barrier shattered, but another smaller one behind it glowed, revealing the layering the man had set up. He shouted, "Finally showing yourself, huh? I'll admit that your stealth ability is most impressive. My sensors are some of the best in the world, yet they cannot see you nor these creatures of yours." Because Harry's magic was invisible through indirect observation, unless you were recording the light bouncing off their bodies or touched them to feel their weight and fur, these constructs of Harry's magic could not be detected through infrared or energy sensors. Even recordings weren't great, as they were the most sensitive to wizard magic, and as soon as a rabbit entered the camera's picture, the screen would turn to fuzzy gray snow rather quickly. Harry wasn't going to give his position away yet to a hell-level boss and continued moving with magically silenced steps while firing his guns at random intervals from random locations. Sinister's hand motioned to the side and one of the columns supporting the roof was stripped from its place with his telekinesis and swung through the air where he guessed Harry was. This forced the young wizard to play life or death limbo and quickly duck beneath the force of the pillar, which matched Kyantang's tail sweep in overall power. Sinister sneered and closed his eyes. A moment later, Harry found an intruder in his mindscape. The man couldn't locate his presence or energy, but he could locate his mind by spreading his presence into the whole room. From within the library, Mr. Sinister remarked, "What a well-built mind. I shall enjoy turning you into my puppet and taking everything you know." Ping. Physical paralysis debuff added. Movement speed decreased by 75% while debuff remains active. Harry felt that his body was far more difficult to move while Sinister was inside his head. However, he wasn't worried. The man would not be there for long. The intruder took a book from the shelf and smiled at how easily the book allowed for assimilation of the knowledge. Before he could start downloading the knowledge himself, the books of the library all jumped off the shelves and created a gigantic mess. This was nothing, however, as each book transformed into a monster and started attacking Sinister. Sinister's astral form fired red beams and Chinook blasts at the various monsters to dispel them, but each time he did, Harry would pause. When paused, any intruder was also paused. Harry couldn't do anything to them, but he could repair any defenses they broke. Sinister's mental might was extremely impressive, and all but the strongest beasts in Harry's mind were torn apart like tissue paper to the man, but Harry had a resource Sinister could never imagine: infinite mental time. Sinister was aware that each creature was weak, but he could not grasp how each construct so easily repaired itself. Seeing as he was making absolutely no headway, Sinister retreated. Ping. Physical paralysis debuff has been resisted. However, Harry's head didn't just have Chinook defenses, it also had wizard defenses. The reason Harry could sense the presence of even Charles Xavier was due to these defenses, and he could even reverse the tap to learn Charles's identity through his own mind tap. Harry amplified each of the thousands of creatures with his own version of a weaponized legilimency spell and had them follow Sinister's astral form back into his own mind and assault it from within. Sinister's shield wavered and many of the rabbits held in the air fell down. Harry renewed his own magic bullet assault and broke through another layer of the man's shields. Sinister snarled, giving a show of his pointed white teeth, and threw his hands out. The remaining rabbits in the room were telekinetically torn to pieces as he gave up on active defense and relied on the passive defenses of his mind, knowing the creatures that had broken through were too weak to do anything to his own mind. Harry used the opening to throw 3 grenades. The stunner grenade, the blasting grenade, and the slow grenade went off at the same time with a deafening explosion which shook the room. The slow grenade was a new combination of the Arresto momentum charm and the Impedimenta jinx, which had an effect of removing momentum and slowing time of the target. When the smoke cleared, Sinister was still standing as his third and final shield was still holding against the power of the blasts. He was, however, looking towards Harry's position with a cruel smile and said, "There you are." Harry noticed the smoke and debris was going around him, which gave away his position though invisible. Sinister grabbed Harry with his telekinesis and pulled him forward, but Harry used his own Chinooks to resist and broke free. He was, however, marked, meaning Sinister didn't need to see him to attack, so Harry removed the invisibility spell, making Sinister smile again and say, "It will be a pleasure dissecting you, cell by cell." His hands glowed red for a moment before releasing another copy of Scott's beam, but Harry had observed enough of Sinister's tricks to have prepared in advance. Harry tapped a buckler he had removed from his inventory while Sinister was facing off against the rabbits and caused it to expand. The red beam bounced off the mirror-like shield and was directed back at Sinister while Harry charged forward and emptied another clip of his magic gun. No matter how good he was, his magic casting speed was still slower than a gun, so there was little point in not using it. The reason he didn't use spells like Dimension Splitter was that he wasn't sure if it would work against those shields and that the quest stated Sinister might flee. Harry wouldn't show all his cards to someone who might live to prepare for them, so he used guns and grenades and what could very well be stealth tack. Sinister stopped the beam and jumped forward as well. Once within range, the pair quickly entered close combat. Harry measured the man's strength at 10 tons, which was 5 times stronger than his base strength without magic. Harry was matching and even surpassing him, though, as he was controlling the dimensional energy within his body to move his body faster and with more force using the combat style of sorcerers. Sinister initially took each blow with a confident ease, as Harry quickly realized the man had regenerative capabilities which were close to Logan's. The man's confidence, however, waned with each exchange as he realized his own blows were having little effect, as Harry too had some sort of healing factor and his body did not weaken with each connecting strike. Sinister couldn't sense any energy from Harry, and since he wasn't using Sidorac's strength energy or immortal dragon chi, Harry wasn't glowing red or gold, making it look like he was fighting using natural strength. Mr. Sinister took a step back and said, "This has gone on far enough. Your abilities are impressive, but no one is a match for Sinister." He moved in close and went for another exchange of blows Harry was happy to give, however at the last moment he withdrew his own fist and allowed Harry to strike him. Using the opening, he grabbed Harry's arm and slid up the sleeve, revealing Harry's bare flesh. He grabbed it with the other arm and leveled his eyes with Harry while giving a sinister smile. Ping. Dilate power debuff added. Mutant power disabled while debuff remains active. Harry stared dumbly at the pop-up while Sinister clenched tightly onto Harry's wrist. His grip, however, suddenly slipped through as Harry's wrist lost color and turned to black ash-like substance that dissolved into a cloud of black mist along with the whole of Harry's hand. Sinister's sneer turned into confusion as the pair both looked down at Harry's severed wrist, which was slowly breaking down bit by bit. Harry's only comment was a curious, "Huh." And in the next moment, he exploded. Chapter 42. Chapter 42 Exposure and Fallout. Something Harry used to distinguish wizard magic from every other form of magic is the fact that wizard magic is inherently emotional. The difference between chaos magic and wizard magic was that wizard magic synchronizes its emotion with the caster while chaos magic does not. This means chaos magic can be used even when the user lacks the specific emotions required to cast the same magics with wizard magic, while wizard magic could be considered far more controlled, though there were exceptions to these generalizations. Because of the emotional component of wizard magic, a degree of emotional strength is required for each spell. When emotions are high enough, magic effects could be cast with ease or even without intention, as is the case with accidental magics. This is also the reason that those incapable of casting non-verbally must state their spell name aloud and are incapable of whispering it below hearing level, as whispering cannot project the strength of emotion required to cast spells for those lacking in practice. Harry's magic was not an exception to this rule, though due to the mental aspects of his abilities initially provided by the Phoenix Force, he rarely showed off the depths of his emotions. The inherent cohesion keeping the Obscurus particles that composed Harry's cells together had remained throughout his life after his revival. They even retained partial cohesion during the respawn process. Though Sinister's ability released the ability his body had to keep them together, the passive cohesion remained in place, making Harry similar to a sand castle that stood upright even after completely drying in the sun. Sinister's tight grip on his arm, however, broke the bonds between his cells, and in the next moment, like a bubble bursting, the dam broke and the hundreds of Obscurus magic particles that composed each and every one of his cells broke apart and separated at speeds no slower than the ignition of a stick of dynamite into gas. The force of the expanding volume of Obscurus particle partially collapsed Sinister's chest cavity before hurling the man into the far wall. However, the moment before impact, his body vanished in a screen of light. He was unaware of how lucky he had been. The teleportation system tied to his health monitor would have failed to lock on his position even an instant later due to the interference of the Obscurus particles that immediately saturated the room. At the moment of detonation, Harry's emotional limiter failed. He had done his best to suppress his rage at what had happened to Jean and had even done his best to keep each and every death quick and relatively painless. Now, however, Harry's mind was a sea of red. Instead of thinking with logic and concepts, he processed information with emotions and instinct. The pillars holding up the room of the throne room were shattered, but before the room collapsed, the massive black mist-like particles within were drawn out into the hallway. Obscurus's size is determined by a number of factors, but it mostly boiled down to the magical strength of the Obscurial. Historically, the most common Obscurus that appeared centuries ago would be about as large as a car or as small as a shopping cart and was born of witches and wizards between the ages of 7 and 10. However, these Obscuri were separate entities from the Obscurials they formed from. The most notable exception to this was the Obscurial Credence Barebone, who suppressed his magic so long, his own body became an Obscurus partially under his control and had a volume measured to be 4 to 6 times larger than a double-decker bus. Harry's cells, however, contained multiple times more particles than Mr. Barebone's could have due to the nature of Harry's mutant ability. The shockwave of his detonation spread through the entire underground complex and nearly half of the upper rooms were saturated in black mist. At the moment Harry regained consciousness, though emotional consciousness, every speck of black mist started to churn and every location saturated with it was ripped to shreds and torn asunder. His fury at the location and what they had done was without filter or limitation. Like a massive swarm of insects, he destroyed each facilitated, room by room. The heavily armored doors that stood against the rabbits held no longer than a breath of time against his might, which rammed through the door with a force so hard the door was fastened into shattered and exploded out. Harry's emotional state did not differentiate between what to destroy and what not to destroy, so even the rabbits remaining in the various rooms were smeared into dust as if they had been clawed at 1,000,000 times in a single moment. Eventually his form struck even the reality bomb in the basement, which then went off prematurely. The reason the reality bomb was so unstable was that it contained Harry's version of a frozen explosion within which, when released, would power the reaction required to expand a point of empty space at the center. The only real means to stop it from going off was quick disassembly to allow the stored energy to be released correctly. As the suitcase exploded out, a wave appearing to be a ripple of space expanded instantly out from the room, and in a fraction of a second the entire complex was within the bubble. Those still alive within would only be able to watch on in horror as straight lines within their field of vision began to wiggle around like living worms, and colors began to bleed into each other as various points of space started twisting or shaking apart. Body parts of various individuals would stretch or pop off, and noises unlike anything that could be comprehended echoed back and forth. Any who moved found that whatever moved would twist or be pulled in an unpredictable direction as relative space lost meaning and function. Some solids could be seen behaving like liquids or gases, and every surface started shifting around like leaves against the breeze. Harry's Obscurus form, however, actively fought against the effect of the collapsing reality and held itself together when there was no logical reason to do so. Harry had never survived exposure to a detonating reality bomb because once Harry's durability reached his limit it would always break apart, return to his inventory, and then emerge in a safe location and reconstitute itself. Harry had set up Rogue's and Wanda's room as his safe zone with their permission, so he was prepared to die if needed, but had not expected this to happen. This time, however, his Obscurus particles were active instead of passive. Although space and direction had lost meaning, Harry's particles instinctively pulled themselves together regardless of the space-distorting effects of broken reality. In what could have been minutes or seconds later, the bubble popped and a wave of reality passed through, re-establishing the properties of logic to the space, causing everything within to shatter, turn to dust, or worse. Thankfully for those within, there were no survivors, as any alterations that occurred within would not have returned to normal once reality returned to normal. Harry's Obscurus particles naturally survived, but the facility around them did not. Every structure collapsed as the weight of the mountain above it crushed the support beams, which had lost alignment during the logic-free period, and instantly gave way to the shuffled mass of stone above it, which had lost cohesion within the bubble as well. A familiar ping was detected by Harry's senses, but his emotion-based consciousness ignored it, and he instantly started pressing up against the ceiling and charging through the collapsed stone. As he moved higher, his compressed body expanded, forcing him to move more and more rock out of the way. As his form expanded, he exerted more force upwards, and upon reaching the top he instinctively pressed the whole of the mountainside above him far into the air as he reached the open air and faced the sky. Ping. Dilate power debuff has been resisted. The black shadow floating in the sky immediately coalesced into a solid form, and a moment later, Harry was reformed and falling out of the sky. The polyjuice potion had been burned through, so he took his normal appearance. He paused. The first thing that came to mind was the fact that although he was not thinking on the same level he usually did, he was still conscious and aware of everything that occurred and could recall it with crystal clarity, including the pop-up he got for the completed quest. Quest complete, Sinister takedown. Reward, Sinister's backup hard drives. The moment the quest was completed, several servers appeared in his inventory, which at a quick glance seemed to contain all the data the base itself seemed to have stored and saved. Considering the degree of bioscience the man's lab appeared to possess, Harry knew he would get a lot of mileage from those files, especially since he chose Hell mode. When he thought back to Sinister's vanishing act, he was partially confused, but only for a moment. Harry figured the man had teleported out, but the teleportation signature did not originate from the man himself, meaning someone or something else targeted him and got him out. That wasn't much of a surprise, as the quest hinted at the fact that he was likely to escape, and was the main reason Harry had not used direct magic in Sinister's presence. Though even if he could, he'd still likely use his guns. The bullets from Harry's guns contained far more power than his individually cast spells. They moved faster than the travel speed of his spells, and Harry could pull the trigger faster than his spell casting speed. Plus, he could fire his weapons while invisible as long as he cast spells to ensure the sound could not be pinpointed. Most spells look like beams of light, so casting them while invisible would be pointless. Harry's current guns were made of adamantium and his bullets contained magic-charged gemstones, while the potion which acted gunpowder was multiple times more powerful than the irrumpant potion, as it contained crushed magic-infused gemstones as well, while leaving no trace of residue upon detonation. Harry had considered making a magic railgun system using adamantium and vibranium, but he hadn't been able to reduce the theoretical size to something shorter than a long-barreled sniper when he preferred handguns. Long-barreled snipers were tools of assassinations, and if Harry needed to assassinate someone, a sniper would not be his first choice. He had no interest in making and selling such weapons either, and at the moment such a weapon would only move marginally faster than his handguns. Railguns only had real power when they had very long barrels, and anything handheld he could make would not prove useful. For now anyways. When Harry fought monsters during battle meditation, he could only use himself, his skills, and his powers, basically fighting naked. When in the real world, his equipment raised his fighting abilities multiple times. If Harry could bring his equipment into battle meditation, he wouldn't be afraid of fighting level 250-300 monsters, even though he was still under level 200. That's how he was able to defeat the immortal Black Dragon. His reality bomb could also take care of anything that lacked ridiculously dense magic like immortal sorcerers, immortal dragons, or demigod-level figures. With exceptions of course. He had no idea his Obscurus form could survive the reality bomb. Harry was rather upset with himself for how he acted, but he knew holding it against himself wouldn't do. He had no idea that not only could his mutant power be removed, but that it would transform him into a full-fledged Obscurus. Although paused in midair, Harry was not falling, rather he was floating a bit in the air. He looked over the mountain he had just destroyed and gave a light sigh of relief that there appeared to be no settlements anywhere close by. His original intention was for the reality bomb to simply make the location collapse, which, although suspicious, wouldn't draw too much attention. When Harry looked up, however, he knew that was no longer possible. Harry's emergence was so forceful, hundreds upon hundreds of massive boulders had been sent into the sky for all eyes and anything recording the situation to see. Thankfully Obscuri are invisible to non-magicals and normal folk, so they would not have been able to see or record him, but the rocks were very eye-catching and there was nothing he could do about it. Even if no one sees the rocks shooting into the air and no one sees them fall, the massive impact each one causes when they land will change the landscape on a level that could not be ignored. The main reason Harry kept his cards to himself was that in the afterlife, his father had told him time and time again not to draw attention to himself or to make people pay attention to the wrong thing. They'd watch TV and James would give his own little monologues during the commercials about why the villains or heroes lost, and it was usually because their enemies got enough information to prepare to defeat them. There had been many points where Harry felt he could not be defeated, but that was not the case. First of all, Harry discovered a new weakness of his. His level, which had been at 202 after absorbing the energy of all the slain foes, had reduced to 201 after his time as an Obscurus. It wasn't a full level as he had barely reached 202 and now it seemed it was pretty close to reaching 202, but it was a fact that his experience bar decreased. It wasn't the same as a death and respawn, but it was still a level drop all the same. In other words, the power of his Obscurus form had a cost of his Obscurus particles' permanent destruction. If he fought something powerful as an Obscurus, he'd risk permanent death because his respawn system didn't work as an Obscurus. Of course, damaging him in that form wouldn't be easy. Severe blows may disperse him but they wouldn't injure him. He wasn't certain he could survive nuclear fire, but that too was more likely to blow him away than it would be to fully dust his particles into nothing. Looking up at the destruction to come, Harry decided he needed a new plan. Laying low wouldn't work anymore. He needed a distraction. Harry spent a long time going over various plans and ideas, but no matter how many he cycled through, he kept coming back to the same plan. He needed a perfect alibi, a way to ensure he was cleared of suspicion even if he was caught red-handed. And there was only one real way to do so. Harry unpaused and turned invisible. He was likely only visible for a single moment, and as he was surrounded by massive rocks in the air, he doubted anyone noticed him. Harry then took his animagus form and flew around to dodge the incoming boulders and find a safe spot to land. Harry needed to stick around for a while and was curious to see if anything would show up soon. It took about 15 minutes for something to show. Surprisingly, it was cloaked, just like Harry. A cloaked drone if Harry guessed right. Since Harry was already going to draw suspicion elsewhere, he decided to play around a bit. While invisible, Harry attacked the drone with his claws, alerting the drone it was being targeted. The drone moved fast, but Harry was faster and caught up with it to deliver another midair attack, damaging one of the wings, this time causing it to swerve and lose altitude. Something Harry discovered a while back was that he could not drag something under someone else's control into his inventory. For example, when he gave the Ancient One a remote control and had her control a remote helicopter, Harry could not place it into his inventory even if he grabbed it unless he broke it, turned it off, or if the Ancient One turned off the controller. The drone in front of him was small enough to be taken into his inventory, but it was under the control of another. Before it landed, Harry cast the Abubliojinx on the drone, which caused an invisible bubble to appear around the drone. The bubble did not allow air to pass through it, causing the drone to fall out of the sky as if its propulsion had failed. That wasn't all it did, however. Moments before it reached the ground, Harry was able to snatch it and place it into his inventory. Since it was wizard magic, it was effective in scrambling signals and caused the drone to eventually lose contact with its controller. The first thing Harry noticed when the drone was placed in his inventory was the presence of processed vibranium. Something to consider later. Harry flew away since he had played enough and continued waiting while flying invisibly through the sky. Eventually his waiting bore fruit. Traveling to him through the astral plane were a large assortment of monstrous creatures. These beings were the very same ones that had left Harry's mind and traveled into Mr. Sinister's. Sinister had given up on active defending and went for passive defending under the impression his mental defenses would hold. However, Harry's mental constructs included built-in legilimency attacks which were undetectable just like the rest of Harry's wizard magic. That had also been one of the other reasons Harry did not go in for the kill against Sinister when he did have some possible options. He didn't know if the man would somehow escape, and the longer the fight, the more Harry's constructs would be able to dig out of the man. After the constructs returned, Harry paused once more and set aside the information to be assessed later. There was more he already needed to do. Harry flew for the closest cloud and within he made a portal for London and flew directly for the Ministry of Magic. The building had many entrances for post owls, allowing Harry easy access to some of the deeper areas without prior preparation. Next, Harry returned to human form, though still invisible, and made his way for the elevator. Harry wasn't sure how it worked, but his Obscurus transformation somehow stored his clothes, so when he returned to human form he was not naked. He knew the clothes were not stored in his inventory though, so for now it was a mystery how that worked. Still, he was grateful as he did not have to arrive as the minister naked. Once at the elevator, Harry made his way down to the Department of Mysteries, and after dodging a number of unspeakables to make sure he didn't run into anyone, he found his way over to a cabinet containing a neat display of 15 necklaces bearing a pendant with a small hourglass inside. There were several reasons Harry had never tried to get a time turner before this point, even though they'd held his interest ever since he learned several were used to research his living conditions after he exploded. First of all, Bones, Sirius, and Albus all knew he was powerful, and if one were stolen, he'd be the first suspect had he gotten it during or shortly after Hogwarts. Especially after Hogwarts. Next, a majority of the things one normally used a time turner for were things he could do with his inventory and pause function, namely taking extra time to study and read. The following 3 years he'd held back because he knew he'd get scolded by the Ancient One, who would certainly be able to sense any time travel shenanigans he's gone through. Something the Ancient One told him about short period time travel usage was that you could get trapped in randomly generated time loops. One day you would see yourself walking up to you and then you would kick your own ass and leave, and you would have no choice but to go back in time and kick your own ass or risk the destruction of reality. Such things have happened before and they can be considered the price of convenient time travel. However, now it was the best of the worst options he had. There were only 15 time turners total, and to prevent the very time loops the Ancient One warned Harry about, the time turners were always kept on this rack rather than in the possession of others. The rack itself included all manner of warding, security, and secrecy spells. Most wouldn't even be able to see the rack itself if you were standing near it. Still, Harry had plenty of practice on magic-based security. It took him no more than 3 minutes to figure out how to nab one without anyone the wiser. As Snape had once said, for a sufficiently powerful wizard, almost any security measure is little better than a delaying tactic. Harry placed one into his inventory and paused to analyze the magic. From what he understood, a ridiculously unstable spell called the Hour Reversal Charm had been made into a slightly less unstable enchantment and placed on the time turners. The turning of the hourglass would allow consecutive uses of the charm, however from the arithmancy Harry calculated and what he had heard, turning it more than 5 times was nearly fatal. Time travel using a time turner was basically boring a hole into the past from the present. In this sense, the present was like a layer of sand, and each second caused more sand to fall onto the top layer. A time turner could drill a hole into the deeper layers, into the past, where the traveler would then slowly dig back into the present and reach the surface. If they went back further than 5 hours, the hole was likely to collapse, and they could not of course go back further after already going back 5 hours. Once the traveler returned to the moment they left from, the changes to the timeline would stabilize. However, because it was not stable during the overlap, it was dangerous to use a time turner in the same location for the same period. That meant he could not use the time turner to go back to the same moment twice. That was a bit of a shame, since if there was no limit, then he could create an army of himself simply by using the time turner to go back to the same location over and over. After nabbing one, Harry used transmutation once some spare metal bits to perfectly recreate a copy and place it where the original was. However, Harry wasn't going to leave it like that. Harry spent a few days paused to calculate the effect he wanted, and once finished, he went over to find an empty room. The Department of Mysteries was filled with researchers, so it had many research rooms. Harry found an unused one and placed several explosives. These explosives, however, were made from unstable potions instead of his magic, so they would leave residue. Harry placed a few spells on the room to prevent anyone from entering for a few minutes and returned to the cabinet and waited. A moment later an explosion shook the floor and Harry used telekinesis to knock over the cabinet from a distance. The moment the cabinet hit the ground, the space around it blurred and the cabinet was upright once more and started falling over once more. It was in a time loop. Wizards, especially smart wizards, never touched time loops, so that cabinet would fall over and over again for the rest of time. A random explosion was not uncommon in the Department of Mysteries according to a few journals he'd read, and anyone monitoring what happened would conclude the cabinet was knocked over from the explosion. It was a fact that the cabinet didn't have any charms keeping it upright after all. There were numerous reasons Harry wanted the time turners unusable. The main reason, however, was that Harry could detect that they were ridiculously unstable and their very existence was a threat to anyone around them. That was one of the 2 reasons he was only taking one. The second reason was that he calculated that an infinite time loop may not properly generate if there were not enough time turners breaking at the same time, and he wasn't confident it would work with 13 as he would 14. 14 is a far more magically capable number after all. Harry was not worried they would make more. There were very few practical reasons to justify the use of one, and many witches and wizards had lost their lives in their attempted creation, so it was unlikely to be done. As Harry left the floor, he thought back to Hogwarts and considered that if he stayed, this would have been his 5th year. Harry wondered what were the chances of him breaking that display in his 5th year if things had gone differently in his life. Oh well. After clearing a certain amount of distance, Harry apparat to the London Sanctum Sanctorum and knocked on the door, visible this time. Sol Rama answered and greeted Harry before ushering him inside. Harry made his way to Camartage and after a few moments, arranged for a meeting with the Ancient One. Harry still considered himself the Ancient One's student and would not meddle with time lightly without her permission. The main reason for that was because if he messed up, it would likely be her responsibility as his teacher to clean up the mess, so he wouldn't hide this from her. The Ancient One was pleased to see him, though when they spoke, she was not as pleased to hear what he had been up to during the last 2 hours. Still, she understood and after making a few suggestions and conditions, she gave her permission. Although she knew Harry would not exactly be responsible with its usage, he would at least be thoughtful with it, which was good enough for her. Harry had already explained how there were no longer enough hours in the day for all his projects in the first place, so it would prove invaluable to him outside of its use to give him airtight alibis. The Ancient One still wished to see its use and they took a portal to a remote location where Harry turned the hourglass 3 times, which when released, cast the hour reversal charm 3 times on Harry, causing him to flow backwards through time while remaining in place. Ping. Age settings are now available. You may turn aging while outside of the present flow of time off. Harry was more than a little shocked at that and immediately opened the new settings. From what he could see, after he turned 17 in 2 years he could disable aging and manually change his age to anywhere from 17 to 35. He could also prevent himself from aging while using the time turner, meaning he would only age while in the present. Harry wondered why this was not available when he went back in time and freed Merlin, but he figured it had to do with how Harry went to the past as he used Time Lord math that time instead of wizard magic. Once the time was right, Harry made a portal back to the Institute moments after he left and found Wanda there, cleaning up the crystals and sand Harry had asked her to clean up. She asked, "You're already back?" Harry nodded and said, "I had someone else take care of it." The fact that he was now capable of time travel was not something he'd share for a while, especially since they would in fact age with its use. Harry collected the crystals back into the backpack he'd gotten out and Wanda vanished the remaining sand and the pair went into the infirmary to meet up with Jean and Rogue. Chapter 43. Chapter 43 Blood and Family. What Harry had not expected once he arrived at the infirmary was a standoff. Rogue was staring dangerously at Xavier and her hands were glowing red with Wanda's hex magic. Dr. McCoy was standing to the side looking very concerned. Harry stated, "What's going on?" Before Xavier could answer, Rogue quickly summarized, "The professor wants to wipe Jean's mind of what happened before she wakes up." Harry immediately paused just to stop himself from overreacting to that. Perhaps Rogue left something out or misunderstood, or perhaps it was as she said. In either case, he had let his emotions run wild once today, so it was best not to let it happen again. Harry mentally took a few moments to calm himself and unpaused. He looked over to Xavier and asked, "Is this true?" Xavier hadn't expected Harry to ask that so calmly, but that actually worried him more than if he had reacted in anger. It wasn't until tonight that he realized that both Rogue and it seemed even Wanda had somehow developed layered mental defenses. He could still knock them unconscious if he forced it, but both appeared ready to fire those hex bolts he knew were disruptive to mutant abilities, meaning it was a stalemate. Harry's own presence here further worsened his stance, forcing him to negotiate. Xavier stated, "Jean has obviously been through enough tonight and recalling it will do no good for her powers." Harry took in a few deep breaths without pausing in an attempt to stop himself from ripping Xavier a new hole. After centering himself, Harry flatly stated, "Xavier, the next time you prioritize a student's powers over that student's mental health, we will have words you are not going to enjoy. Do you understand me?" Xavier realized that the way he worded that did indeed sound like he was prioritizing Jean's powers. He quickly tried to defend himself, "That's not what I meant. You know I care about all of my students. I would never dash." Harry had a smoky quartz crystal in his hand before Xavier finished and was looking at the man with unreadable intentions. The crystal wasn't glowing, but the threat of it remained. Harry said, "I know you think you know what is best. I want you to accept that in this situation you are wrong. Jean is not her powers. Her ability to control her powers is not how you should measure her mental health just because she is a telepath. I know you think you have experience in this field, but what may or may not work for you won't necessarily work for others. Unless you can convince me you are secretly a 15-year-old teenager girl, I think the others in this room have more of a say for what will and will not help Jean mentally." Xavier wasn't unaware that from the position of Rogue and Wanda, he had overstepped his bounds. However, he was not able to argue against Harry's dispassionate logic. What was most disconcerting for him, however, was that Harry was alluding to the fact that he knew Xavier had done things to his own mind, and Harry was even indirectly telling him not to assume what he did to himself will work in others. In fact, he actually implied that what he did to himself didn't even work for himself. That was what shocked Xavier the most. Still, he knew that Jean's powers would definitely manifest in a negative fashion if this was left alone, which was why he had been set on helping her. Harry said, "I can guess what you're worried about. I will take full responsibility for helping Jean with her powers should an issue occur. I think my track record in this speaks for itself." Rogue spoke up, "Not just Harry. Jean's always been sweet to everyone and I'll be there for her if she needs it." Wanda added, "Count me in. I know what it's like to have powers that are overly affected by past traumas." Xavier gave it a moment of silent thought before nodding. "Very well. I shall entrust this matter to you three. I do, however, ask if anything happens you seek my help." Dr. McCoy let out a breath of relief that everything had been resolved peacefully. He said, "Excellent, now on to the important matters. At the moment Jean is asleep and her vital signs are normal, though I can tell she was under a lot of stress until a few moments ago. May I ask what transpired? Harry said, because I didn't have any of Jean's blood I wasn't able to track her easily, so I asked for Rogue and Wanda's help. Using a ritual I made, Wanda strengthened the connection between Rogue and Jean, which I was able to track and locate Jean. She was bound to a table and it looked like someone was about to stick a needle into her. She was crying for help, but no one in the room seemed to care. They all wore lab coats and had equipment that looked suited towards experimentation. I used a smoky quartz to knock them out and get Jean out of there. I had Rogue take her to the infirmary and I cleaned up the ritual area with Wanda and we came back. Xavier asked, you made a portal in Cerebro, didn't you? Was that how you accessed her location? Harry nodded. Yeah, but that uses dimension energy which I can only access by absorbing a big diamond. Those are harder to make synthetically than a big smoky quartz which allows teleportation. However, portals have almost no impact on the tech around them, so I could use it in Cerebro without damaging the place. McCoy confirmed, well, at least you made it in time. Nothing seems to have been injected into her system, so I expect after she wakes she'll be fine. Harry nodded and said, if you don't mind, I'd like to stay in the infirmary until she wakes. Wanda spoke up, me too. Rogue added, of course, and me. McCoy and Xavier smiled. It was early morning, so there was no real issue with not going back to bed. Xavier said, I'll cancel the classes for today. There is much that the teachers and I need to discuss. McCoy nodded and looked back at Harry. Now you mentioned something about blood and tracking her. Is that to say, if you do possess someone's blood, you can find them? Harry answered, not directly with their blood. My powers don't work that way. There is a way, however, to turn someone's blood into a gemstone. I can't exactly absorb one, but I can use something similar to magic to use a blood gem to track any person. McCoy asked, that is to say, if we kept a stock of blood gems for each student, you would be able to use them to track the students down if they were kidnapped. Harry nodded. That is correct. McCoy gave Xavier a look that Xavier understood. Xavier was reliant on Cerebro to find people, but the number of ways to hide from Cerebro seemed to be growing lately. It was something to consider. Rogue said, I'm up for it. McCoy said, can the way to make a blood gem be done here? I'd like a demonstration if you would be so kind. Harry answered, no problem. It's just a bit of esoteric chemistry. Harry explained the process to Dr. McCoy, who got to work prepping some of his equipment. If they could make them without Harry, they could store them for emergencies. While McCoy was setting things up, Harry was going over the knowledge he had stolen from Sinister. Harry actually wanted to make a blood gem for Sinister and use that to kill him, but he understood from what little he had already gone over that Sinister was no longer close enough to human for that particular ritual to have an effect. Unfortunately, the knowledge Harry's attack was able to copy from Sinister's mind was random and it would take a while to process it all. Harry also hoped Forge wouldn't kill him for suggesting blood gems. The creation of a blood gem was not exactly dark magic itself, but many forms of dark magic could use a blood gem. Having your boss use your blood to make a blood gem basically guaranteed your loyalty, as if you betrayed him, there would be nowhere to run or hide. He'd be able to track you down, track your descendants down, and cast powerful curses directly on you through the blood gem. A little after sunrise, Jean woke and felt someone was holding her hand. She opened her eyes and saw Harry was at her side, and Wanda and Rogue were smiling back at her, with the latter saying, well, good morning, sugar. Jean noticed that for some reason she felt more connected to Wanda and Rogue than she had before, and she could feel their concern and care for her. She thought it was just because they had decided to stay with her until she woke up, which was a real show of care from them. Jean felt that she should hang out with them more often. They were great friends. The actual reason for the feeling of closeness was the ritual Harry used to locate Jean. It had a permanent side effect of strengthening Rogue's connection to Jean, and it created a connection from Wanda to Jean, as well as it was Wanda's power that strengthened that connection. This connection would last for their entire lives, which was why Harry would not have used that method to find her if he had another choice. Both Rogue and Wanda knew enough about magic to understand that as well, and both accepted it when they chose to help with the ritual. Harry's connection to her was strengthened as well, but Jean already felt so close to him she didn't notice it. After remembering what she had just been through, Jean started crying. The worst night of her life was over, and now she was surrounded by those she could really feel cared for her, and she just wanted to let it all out. She cried into Harry's shoulder, and Rogue and Wanda put their arms over her to comfort her. McCoy watched from the side and smiled. He left the infirmary and headed upstairs to meet with the rest of the teachers to discuss what had happened and what steps they would take to prevent it from happening again. Once Jean had calmed down, she told the trio what had happened from her perspective. A group of mutants had ambushed her, defeated her, and taken her away via teleportation. She shouted with her mind for someone to help, but they placed something over her head to cut off her telepathy and telekinesis. Harry took her hand in both of his and told her how he heard her cry and went to Xavier, who heard it too. Cerebro was not able to find her, but with Wanda and Rogue's help, Harry was out of earshot of the security cameras. Harry also whispered, and steps were taken to ensure that place no longer exists. Jean could hear the fire in Harry's voice and she telepathically thanked him. Harry walked the girls upstairs and began making breakfast. It was actually Bobby's, Jubilee's and Domino's turn, but the latter wasn't there to prevent the former two from destroying the food due to the staff meeting, so Harry took over. He knew what everyone would be discussing and wanted a lighter atmosphere, so he practically emptied the walk-in fridge and covertly brought a few things out from his inventory. Once the first couple of students saw Harry at the stove instead of Jubilee, they ran back upstairs to tell the other students. Days Harry cooked were treasured in the institute, and the difference between food cooked by Jubilee and Harry was as great as the difference between black and white. Jean enjoyed a warm meal sitting between Rogue and Wanda, who talked with her about small and silly things to get her mind off her ordeal. Jean wasn't happy with what the professor had tried to do and knew he meant well, but she still felt that leaving her to Harry, Rogue, and Wanda was better for everyone. It didn't take long for Scott Summers to learn what had happened to Jean and race over. Jean assured him she was fine and that Harry rescued her before they could do anything terrible. Scott walked over to Harry and said, "Thank you, man, just, thank you." Harry smiled back, "She's not just your family, Scott. Remember that." Scott nodded and went to get some of the hunger-inducing breakfast plates. A few hours into the day, Forge came looking for Harry. The fact that he did not appear to be wielding any kind of disintegration cannon was something Harry took as a good sign. "Though we need to talk privately," expression seemingly carved into his face, less so. After finding a spot not to be overheard, Forge said, "I looked for you in the lab and was almost surprised not to find you there. When I realized you were probably sticking close to Jean to help her through this, I decided to put down my ion disintegrator." Harry tried not to look nervous. Forge continued, "I'll make sure the staff knows exactly what a person with enough know-how can do with a blood gem. I won't suggest you will do anything, but I will imply that if someone else got their hands on one, what they could do." Harry nodded, "Reasonable. I brought it up full accepting that the entire suggestion might be rejected. However, if someone gets kidnapped or taken, I don't want to feel like it's my fault because I could have done more and didn't. I at least want to give you the choice." Forge sighed. "I figured as much. Can't say I wouldn't do the same if I was in your position." He walked away and Harry rejoined the group. They asked what happened and Harry answered. Jean was shocked by what a person could do with a blood gem, but Wanda said she knew all of that already and already made one and gave it to Harry for safekeeping. Thanks to that, if anything happens to her, she knows Harry will be able to find her. Jean looked conflicted at that and decided to wait and see what the teachers said. The eventual outcome was that the students were told a small amount of blood could be taken from them and used to find them if anything happened, but the giving of blood was voluntary only. What surprised Harry the most, however, was when Logan showed up. He asked, "Just to be clear, you use these blood things to find the person or find their blood?" Harry answered honestly, "Their blood. It can even be used to find relatives." Logan said, "All right then. Make one for me. I got a favor to ask." The pair went to the infirmary and took some of Logan's blood. Dr. McCoy wasn't around, so Harry handled the procedure alone and added a few bits of magic to improve the quality of the gem since it looked like Logan was interested in using it for something. When finished, Logan took a look at it and said, "A while back I lost all my memories. I know I got experimented on and I know they took my blood. Wade Wilson, Deadpool. His abilities came from my blood. If they got more of my blood, I want it found and destroyed." Harry nodded and went to his room to get a few things. He returned and made a proper locator that could use the blood. Logan didn't even twitch when Harry assembled it using magic without taking out a gemstone. Once finished, he started the locator and cleared his mind. 30 seconds later. Ping. New quest, Blood Ties. Destroy every sample of Wolverine's blood at Site A. Rescue X-23 from Site B. Bonus. Rescue X-23's mother from Site B. Don't get identified. Harry sighed. He said, "I got 5 matches from the tracker. The first is you, obviously. The second was a larger-bodied blonde guy with shoulder-length hair, larger than normal incisors, and a wild, almost bloodthirsty aura. He seemed to be a direct relation. Likely brother or half-brother." Logan's eyebrow shot up. "Sabretooth? That explains a lot." Harry continued, "Next was Deadpool. Okay, don't ask me to look for that guy in the future. I could swear when I saw him, he turned around and waved back at me." Logan grunted and didn't seem surprised by Wade's seemingly impossible actions. "Last 2 are what you're looking for. 2 large facilities in Canada. One contains lots of your blood, but it's the other which has me curious. There is a little girl there I'd say is 12 or 13 years old with half your DNA. She's being kept in a locked cement room. I couldn't see more details than that." Wolverine's claws shot out on instinct at that. Harry continued, "Obviously we're going to get her. However, we need to be smart about it. You also have to decide if you want the help of anyone else or if we should just do this ourselves." Harry could get a general sense of the area and a more detailed sense of the exact location, which were enough to make portals, but he couldn't see the rest of either facility. Logan retracted his claws and began to think. He knew what Harry was really asking. Do you want to go in with or without killing them all? If they took the X-Men, they wouldn't take any lives. If they went alone, well, Logan already knew Harry didn't have issues with permanently dealing with some people. Logan decided to ask, "Got any suggestions?" Harry nodded. "If it is just the 2 of us, I can get us in and out easily enough. If you want to go in loud, that is fine. However, we can also go in quiet. Besides, in addition to your blood, the first place might have other things that need dealing with. The second place could also have others there beside your supposed daughter. Give me a day to scout the locations and do some prep work and we can figure out the best way to do this." Logan flatly said, "You sound like Gambit." Harry smiled. Gambit was another member of the original X-Men team, but unlike the others he was not a teacher at the Institute. Instead he was Charles's eyes and ears in many places and go-to fixer for many situations. Harry added, now if we're going to do this, we may need to use a different skill set and use disguises. Besides your claws, can you use anything else to fight? Preferably something distinct. I'm good with a katana. Harry smiled, that works. Harry spent the next 2 days in 2 places at once. He went to sleep at midnight and woke up at 4 a.m. Via portal he went to his workshop and used the time turner to go back 5 hours. He then spent the next 10 hours working on various projects and at 9 a.m. he would use the time turner to go back to 7 a.m. and start his classes. At 2 p.m. he would leave the institute and go back in time 5 hours and then spend the next 10 hours on outside projects which currently included scouting and prepping sites A and B. Harry would then time turner back 5 hours to 2 p.m. and return to his classes. When classes were over around 5 p.m., he'd head over to the study group and help Jean and the others until about 8 p.m. He then spent 4 hours in battle meditation and went to sleep at midnight. In this way he added 18 extra hours to his schedule which opened a lot of possibilities. The following Saturday morning Harry brought out several maps of both sites. Much of it he'd explored using astral projection and some viewing spells. Logan of course directly asked why not get in and out with portals, but Harry said that it was better to leave a false trail. First, Harry made a portal to an unmonitored area near Site A. Harry wasn't wearing a mask and had taken a polyjuice potion to look like someone whose blood he'd taken in the 7th century, so Harry felt it unlikely even the most advanced facial recognition software would recognize him. Logan was harder to conceal. He was shorter than average yet had broad shoulders and weighed several times what a normal person did. Harry gave him an invisibility potion and an invisible katana he'd made. He also cast a featherlight charm on Logan which, although did not make him as light as a feather, did reduce his weight. Harry himself would be using Shinix and spells which looked like Shinix to make people think he was a telepath. Harry checked his watch on arrival and the pair waited another 5 minutes for Harry's prep to start working. At 11 a.m. exactly, the enormous ward Harry had painstakingly set up around the location activated. Harry and Logan ran for the gate at the signal. Harry's Shinix skill was enough to make weak people sleep on command, which was how he dispatched the guards. Harry also got close to each one and cast a powerful obliviate that would permanently erase any knowledge the guards had about this place other than the fact that they worked there. The main entrance to what looked like a bunker was locked with a keypad, so Logan slashed through the lock with his sword. It wasn't adamantium, but with all the spells on it the thing could cut just as well as his claws. Guards opened fire the moment the door fell, so Harry hid behind the entrance until the shooting stopped. Logan swiftly entered and disabled the guards with the back of his blade and they were all unconscious before they noticed the invisible samurai. Harry used obliviate on them as well. He was making himself appear to be a nuisance of a telepath, as wiping memories was one of the most troublesome things a telepath could do. And since he was removing them with magic, another telepath wouldn't even be able to recover them. The pair encountered more guards and dealt with them all. A number of them were strong-minded enough not to be put to sleep by Harry's Shinix, so Logan had to deal with each of them. Their goal was to take out and erase the minds of as many of the employees as possible. Harry's targets for obliviate were not the guards. In fact, he even cast an overly weak obliviate on a number of guards so they would remember Harry's uncovered face and give details of what happened. No, the true targets were the researchers. When Harry encountered one of them, he didn't just erase their knowledge of the facility, he erased their education. Everything they learned working there and all the education required to get there would vanish from their minds. The main reason Harry had decided on such a ruthless outcome was because of how he felt about X-23 and what he discovered during his scouting. He decided there was no reason for this place to continue existing, and this was the best way to thoroughly destroy the essence of the place without killing anyone. The ward around the site had a number of effects. First, it would completely cut off communications. Next, it would prevent those outside from coming inside using a basic muggle repelling field. And last, it was set to saturate the entire place with magic through a magical implosion when Harry was done with it. Harry and Logan made their way to the main control station and Harry plugged in every sort of hacking tool after he incapacitated and removed the knowledge of everyone inside. He would make it look like this place was his goal and everything else was secondary. Once the servers were downloaded, they made their way to the place where all biological samples were stored. Harry removed a backpack he had brought with him and set it inside before closing and locking the door. By this point all of the faculty were either hiding or incapacitated, so the pair returned to the entrance and made their way out. No alarms, even through hardline communications, could get through the wards. A few of the trucks on their way to the site suddenly remembered they had forgotten something and turned around without entering. Once the pair were out, Harry released a signal which caused a massive surge of magic he spent the last few days charging the ward stones with to implode in on itself. The backpack in the room holding the blood was set off and the explosion shook the whole of the base. Every computer and camera was fired. As the off-site security feeds were cut by the ward, which meant no digital recording of the pair entering the location existed. Harry got out the time turner and placed it over his own and Logan's neck. It was time for part 2. Logan was more than a little surprised that Harry's plan involved time travel to hit both sites at the same time, but decided he'd seen stranger things. Harry already told him that it couldn't be used to change the past, it only let you be in 2 places at one. Such a thing was only useful to someone who didn't age, so he didn't mind Logan knowing about it. The point of much of the plan was to throw suspicion off themselves and onto something else with false clues and breadcrumbs. X-23 would likely be attending Charles's school, so they would know it was Logan who took her no matter what they did. Because of that, Logan wouldn't be using the sword or an invisibility potion at Site B and would go in claws blazing. The point was to make whatever group was behind them to think Logan was working with a large, skilled organization and make them target that group before trying anything to Logan. Maybe they'd figure it out one day, but by then Harry would be even stronger. Harry had another portal take them outside the grounds for Site B. Surprisingly, Harry was not able to find any other mutants at the location, meaning X-23 was the only one they needed to rescue while taking the place down. Harry used yet another polyjuice potion to shift into yet another face from the 7th century. He'd run out of it eventually, but until then it was a waste not to use it. This time he was going to use telekinesis and magic to move things and make shields. Harry's Chinook shields were too weak to stand up to bullets, but he knew how to make a dimensional energy shield that kinda looked like a Chinook shield, which was good enough for him to take a more active role in the combat. Site B was more than double the size of Site A, and Harry had to spend a few hours on top of a ley line to recharge himself while charging the ward stones required to cut this place off. The reason this place was larger was simply because it needed to be. If Site A was where the safe tests were done, Site B was where the dangerous tests were done. There was also a large number of enhanced guards using advanced weaponry within, and even if they didn't have backup it wouldn't be easy to take them down. Well, not as easy. This site was 2 time zones over from Site A, and they waited until 1 PM for the wards to kick in and charged forward. A dozen or so fully armed guards started firing at the pair, but Harry used an overpowered banishing charm to throw them back. The few out of range of his charm continued firing, but a shield appeared over him which blocked the shots. Thankfully they used energy weapons, which were far easier for his shields to block over material weapons, as the former was closer to magic. A few of the guards that had hidden behind cover before Harry sent the others away popped out once the pair got close, but Wolverine slashed through their weapons and backhanded their faces hard enough to knock them out. Once the guards were fully taken care of, Logan used his claws again to slash the door, but this time it seemed too thick to penetrate with his claws. Harry destroyed the cameras with telekinesis and then conjured the kestrel key of Kraken, which fired at the door and caused it to open. Logan actually took a moment to give him a look that implied even he thought, "What the hell?" Harry shrugged. The key was weird, he wasn't going to deny it. He was just glad he could still use it after his wizard and sorcerer magics merged. It was very useful magic. When the doors opened, Harry had his arms raised to make it look like he was opening the doors with telekinesis. He made a shield to block the barrage of gunfire that greeted the pair, and Wolverine charged forward directly into the mob. Those who targeted him Harry threw back with either a banishment charm or with telekinesis. To shake things up, he'd occasionally use a summoning charm on the armor of the armor-plated guards to drag them into the line of fire. Turrets would occasionally drop down from the ceiling or rise up from the floor, but Harry would break them either with telekinesis or magic. Some of the heavier-duty turrets were not as easy to break, so Harry just threw an invisible surge of magic at them to fry them. It was his own version of Wanda's hex bolts. The location had about 50 guard total, and 7 minutes into the intrusion they had taken care of half of them. Earlier that morning, Harry had snuck into the place with a portal and placed a tracking and monitor spell on X-23 and the woman he was pretty sure was her mother. Both mother and child were in the same room at the moment with a man who brought 2 guards with him. Harry had chosen this time for the extraction because this was the only time of day the pair were in the same room. Thankfully the guards seemed to be pointing their weapons at the door rather than at the mother and child pair. Eventually they reached a hall where Logan went left and Harry went right. X-23 was in Logan's direction. The main computer terminal of the base was in Harry's. According to the backstory Harry cooked up, a group had found Logan and told him they intended on breaking into this site and stealing all the data before erasing it. They invited Logan to come after telling him about X-23. Logan didn't know anything else about the group and didn't care. Of course Harry had monitoring charms on Logan as well, so if anything happened, he'd be able to get over there fast enough to help. Much of the remaining security was in fact on Harry's route, including several guards in what appeared to be oversized mechanical outfits. Harry couldn't break or even move them with telekinesis, so he pretended to use an overpowered TK throw while sending another surge or magic at the suits. Unsurprisingly, the suits stopped working and Harry moved on. Every once in a while Harry would encounter someone who demanded to know who he was, as if he was obligated to respond. Even when he made it to the computer terminal and pulled out his hacking tools, the people standing to the side he hadn't bothered with because they hadn't drawn their weapons were giving impassioned speeches about how Harry would never get away with this. A few of the creative ones described the manners in which Harry would be dissected. A few of the ones who thought they were clever tried to stab or cut him, not to kill him, but to make him bleed so they could get some of his blood. Harry was tempted to give some to get their hopes up, but decided against. He'd save that prank for another day. From his observation of Logan, the old man slashed his claws together. That meant he needed help. X-23 was also looking very mad and her mother appeared terrified. The important-looking man in the room seemed to have something in his hand which had everyone worried. Harry cast a sleeping spell on those in the main room so they wouldn't unplug his hacking tool, and he teleported into the room behind the man and grabbed what he was holding. Logan had been expecting this and used the moment they were caught off guard to take out the guards and punch the man's face in. Harry, still holding the metal thing, asked, "What's this?" The woman next to X-23 said, "That's Laura's trigger scent. If she smells it, she won't be able to stop herself from killing everyone in the room." The woman looked down and said in a quiet tone, including me. The man Logan had knocked down wasn't out cold and glared at Harry. Logan had told the man the fake backstory and the man said, I don't know who you are but we will find you. And nothing you do will change the fact that she is a weapon. Even if you take her, we will have her back. Harry smirked and said, nothing I can do? Is that a challenge? He turned to the woman and asked, are there many of these trigger scents? She frowned but nodded. Harry walked over to X-23, Laura, and pointed a finger at her and cast a silent obliviate. Laura frowned and felt something, but she didn't know what it was. It didn't seem like anything changed. Harry then opened the can in his hand and tossed it to her. Laura's eyes widened in shock and the woman almost screamed. And nothing happened. Harry turned back to the man and said, you were saying? If she is a weapon, why isn't she doing anything? The man said, that's impossible. What did you do? Harry smiled and said, that would be telling. He then cast a stupefy at the man and knocked him out. Once out cold he cast a light obliviate to remove the last few moments of memories and then cast the false memory spell to make him remember opening the scent container himself and nothing happening before being knocked out by Logan. Laura picked up the can and said, I don't recognize this scent. Harry nodded. Sorry, but I had to remove your memory of all scents. Whatever conditioning they did to you is still there. But now you won't remember which scents were conditioned to which reactions, meaning your brain won't recognize them as triggers. You'll have to relearn your scents, but it's a small price to pay, don't you think? Laura's mother froze in shock at the implication. Laura was trained to be completely incapable of resisting her trigger scents, but now they were all ineffective. That meant Laura wouldn't lose control and could live a normal life. Harry said, escort the pair to the entrance, I'll meet you there, and teleported back. Harry actually woke the sleeping staff members and used a Confundus charm to prevent them from noticing they were asleep, meaning they went right back to rambling on as to the consequences of his actions there. Once finished, Harry unplugged the hard drive he'd downloaded everything onto and left, ignoring the rambling staff. A few tried to shoot him but Harry threw them back to the wall with telekinesis the moment they grabbed a weapon, which put a stop to that. All of them saw Harry's face but none heard him speak as he had not responded to any of their provocation. Harry met Logan, Laura, and her mother on the way back and made their way to the entrance. They met a few stragglers on the way but were taken care of without issue. Harry made sure a few of the guards spotted them running from the entrance into the woods before he set the wards to implode and fry everything. This site mainly focused on weapons and tech. Removing the memories of the researchers wouldn't have as much of an effect since tech was tech. As long as all the computers at the site were fried and the data was lost, it was good enough for him. Once they were clear of witnesses, Harry opened a portal to the Institute's infirmary. Ping. Quest completed, blood ties. Reward +4 warrior path rank. Dr. McCoy was quite surprised and asked what had happened and who the girl and woman were. Harry casually answered, new student and her mother. They both need a checkup though. And with that he left the infirmary. Chapter 44, Chapter 44, the beginning of a harem. Harry spent the following Sunday paused for what could have been months or years. After getting Laura out, he finally decided to take the time to check out his gains from Sinister's mind, Sinister's hard drives, and what he stole from the compounds he and Logan raided. Sinister was unsurprisingly a real piece of work that reminded Harry a bit of Voldemort in his single-mindedness. There was nothing in the data he acquired that showed what Mr. Sinister was afraid of, but it was obvious from what Harry did get from his mind that the man feared something and he was trying to create a mutant powerful enough to fight against whatever it was he feared. Harry felt this was similar to Voldemort, who feared death and tried to become the strongest magical to avoid it. Voldemort, however, was blind to using other means to achieve his goals, and Mr. Sinister seemed to only focus on making himself or another mutant strong enough to fight whatever he was scared of, but he didn't look much into other means of fighting it. His data showed decades and in some cases centuries of research and testing on mutants and their powers, and looking over some of the memories Harry was able to copy, he figured out what the man wanted from Jean. Mr. Sinister apparently had sponsored several orphanages, and when Scott's parents died, the young Summers had lived in one. Sinister's tests seemed to show that a child between Scott and Jean would be stronger than any mutant he was capable of creating. Harry could easily see the man was right, but he doubted if Sinister knew why. After a number of tests, Harry found that the type of energy Scott was capable of connecting to and emitting was basically birdseed for the Phoenix Force. It could literally nourish the Psionic entity, and psychics in general would gravitate towards Scott, though they would look at Scott like a plate of delicious food, not as boyfriend material. If they couldn't tell the difference between hunger and love, they might convince themselves they had feelings for him. Sinister apparently met Scott in disguise years ago and imprinted into the boy's mind a need to be with Jean that would go into effect once he saw her. He seemed to plant something similar into Jean, but that quickly faded and there didn't seem to be a point to putting it back. Sinister had means of monitoring Salem and seemed to know that Jean and Scott were growing further apart. Jean's kidnapping was to implant a need to be with Scott. Sinister was going to arrange it so that Scott would find and rescue her at a place of the man's choosing. He didn't count on Harry, of course. No matter what means he used to gain information, he would only get the lies Harry told everyone else and nothing else. Then there was the stuff he got from Canada. The Weapons Project, Weapon X, founded and funded by a man named John Sublime. It was a way to use mutants to fight and kill mutants. The project shared similarities to Sinister's work in that both were ways to strengthen mutants, but they had different end goals and different means to achieve them. Sinister wanted mutants to give birth to stronger mutants. Sublime just wanted to use mutants to kill mutants. The files he read almost made him regret not killing everyone in both facilities. They had allowed their fear to justify actions that would have made Death Eaters squeamish. He wouldn't go back even if he knew though. The sites appeared to be partially funded by a few governments but were not completely under government oversight, and John Sublime was a civilian. If Harry had killed anyone, they would be declared threats by those not a part of the program, and the response to the raids would be completely different. However, if a weapons program was defeated by two sets of two people, three of which were unknown, and they got in and out without killing anyone, that would look terrible on paper for whoever was in charge. None of the researchers Harry wiped would be able to continue their work, meaning the program would have to hire more, which would cost money. Would a program that got hooped so easily be allocated additional funds though? Most would think it was a waste of money and not even care who took it out, since the perpetrators didn't kill anyone. Even if they did restart it, Harry would see if he could get the goblins to track where the money was coming from and mess with them appropriately. Probably the most interesting part of comparing the data from Sinister and the data from the weapons program was that the holes in one appeared to be filled in the other. Thanks to this, Harry now understood a lot more about mutants than he had before. From what he could tell, the X gene was a somewhat of a blank space in a human's DNA. It was a gene that did absolutely nothing because it contained no information that could be used. In times of great stress or under specific circumstances though, the X gene could change from something that gave no information to something that did include information. A mutant was someone whose X gene filled in on its own, however there were means of manually writing information onto the X gene. Harry had discovered several programs known as super soldier programs, and sometimes they worked on a person, sometimes they would not. Harry now understood that the people it worked on had an inactive X gene, and the process that turned them into an enhanced had manually overridden their X gene to grant them those abilities. That also meant that no one without an unawakened X gene could successfully become an enhanced. Though difficult, it was somewhat possible to enhance a mutant, and sometimes an enhanced would become a mutant as well, though the end result was impossible to guess. Using what Harry already knew combined with everything he learned, Harry figured he could probably create a gene therapy that would grant anyone without an X gene an X gene. He could even think of a few survivable ways to permanently remove an X gene, even an awakened one. Once he had that information, he promptly locked it away into the deepest, darkest depths of his mind. That was not information the world was ready for, and Harry doubted if it would ever be ready for it. The only problem was that if someone else got access to Sinister's data and Project Weapons data and was clever enough, they could figure it out too. Hell, Harry wouldn't be surprised if someone figured it out without their data. Although Harry wouldn't use it for the same purposes as Sinister and the Canadians, he could use it to help Dr. McCoy with his own research. Over the course of the following week, most of the staff and students decided to give Harry some blood to make blood gems. Harry had not told anyone he used them to find Logan's daughter, but a number of the staff and even some students guessed it. 11-year-old Laura Kinney herself was easily accepted into the institute, and Xavier and Warren took care of all the paperwork. Dr. Sarah Kinney was actually offered a position as Dr. McCoy's research assistant, which paid well and gave the woman a chance to stay with her daughter and work in her field, which happened to be genetics, same as Dr. McCoy. Something interesting was that Harry was unable to make blood gems for 3 of the residents of Xavier's institute. Kit's blood seemed to be mostly human, but it was outside of the range required for the blood magic to work, meaning his blood could not be used. Something similar happened with Warren's blood. Harry said he appeared to have an atavism which caused his blood to have similar effects to a distant, less than human ancestor. Something Harry didn't share was that Warren's blood actually burned Kit's. It made him wonder about the angel and demon pair. The third failure was the most surprising. Harry could not use any blood magic with Scott's blood. Kurt and Warren had blood that would be perhaps what a child of a Homo sapien and a Homo neanderthalensis would appear. The descendant of a human and an offshoot of humans. Scott though had at least a grandparent who wasn't born on the planet Earth. This probably explained why Sinister felt his genes were so special. Though his DNA appeared completely human, Harry's magic could tell it was not, and why it was not in ways even the great Nathaniel Essex never could. Harry discussed his findings with Dr. McCoy and Dr. Kinney, and they found the absence of certain markers which showed Harry was correct. After some debating, the three decided to inform Scott of his interesting heritage, though no one else. Harry also used the chance to obliviate Scott of the memories he had of Jean before he met her. That wouldn't affect his existing memories, but it would remove the influence Sinister implanted in him. Harry wondered if he should feel bad about that and decided to set him up on a date at some point. Scott took it relatively well, though he did ask what it meant. Harry just told him that whatever species was in him was highly compatible with humans, which manifested in the power of his awakened X gene, and that his children would have an easy time awakening their X gene as well. Things returned mostly to normal after that, though with the help of his time turner Harry appeared to have more free time than normal, which caused some people to try to take advantage of him. Several students would claim that they were sick at the times when it was their turn to make food and ask Harry to take their shift because he was regarded as the best cook in the institute. On the third time this happened, Harry decided to take steps. Evan had not only shameless begged Harry to step in when it was his turn to make breakfast, he also asked him not to tell his aunt. Harry smiled and agreed. Harry made stacks and stacks of pancakes, which were something with a low enough level of difficulty that Evan could take credit for without suspicion, and Evan accepted everyone's thanks with a warm heart. That was until everyone started shooting flames out of their asses. Harry had added a special potion, something he got from Fred and George Weasley's joke shop, to the batter mix. The flames were bright blue and cold to the touch. They did not burn and would safely go through the pants of the victim without harming the fabric. For a whole day, every student and most of the faculty would randomly fart blue flames at various times. Logan's physical ed class that day was track and field, which many students would recall as the most memorable class of the year. So many butt flames. Safe to say, the truth came out and Harry was not asked to take over another shift again. Kurt did however ask to be taken on as an apprentice. It was a few weeks later near Thanksgiving that two things came up. In the morning when Harry was in his workshop, Goose came in and was followed by a small purple dragon. This was Lockheed, the alien dragon Kitty made friends with during their space adventures. Harry asked, "What's up, Goose?" Harry always took at least an hour or so to spend time with Goose. Sometimes Goose would also visit the study group's table and Harry would just pet her while he tutored the others. Harry had seen Goose and Lockheed hang out a few times but didn't ask about it. Goose conveyed, "He needs assistance with something. I recommended you?" Harry turned down to the blue dragon and asked, "All right, how can I help?" Lockheed seemed to be hissing in various tones while moving his jaw, so Harry asked Goose, "Does he have problems speaking English? Should I use telepathy?" Goose conveyed back, "No. His race speaks with each other telepathically, though a hive mind connection, but they refuse to communicate the same way to other life forms. He can speak English, it just feels uncomfortable." Harry asked, "They don't like telepathy with members of other races?" Goose continued, "Not exactly. Their telepathy is empathy-based. He just doesn't want to talk through his emotions with a guy." Harry burst out laughing at that. It explained how Lockheed was speaking with Goose since Goose was female. He wondered if Lockheed spoke with Kitty. Harry considered a few things and asked using Parseltongue, "Can you understand this language?" Lockheed seemed taken aback at that and answered in fluent Parseltongue, "I did not expect to hear this language from a human." Goose's description of you did not do you justice. Harry asked, "Have you met Goose before? Come to think of it, is Goose her real name?" Lockheed answered, "I've run into the Flurkin a number of times over the last century or so, though I did not expect to see her on Earth. Her name cannot be constructed using sounds you are familiar with, so Goose is acceptable. The same goes for my own name. My parents certainly did not call me Lockheed, but I will not be sharing my true name with you this day." Harry did not hide his surprise at any part of that statement. It proved that Goose was not from Earth and also showed that Lockheed was likely Dragonkeen, for lesser dragons did not have true names. Dragonkeen however were not weak, so his appearance, which was only a size larger than Goose's, did not fit a standard Dragonkeen. Harry decided to directly ask, "Are you Dragonkeen?" Lockheed nodded, "Yes, though very different from most. My species is renowned for its spirit and mind, not our bodies. For example, though you have hidden it well, I can feel a dragon's aura on you. Another would not notice it, but I can." That answered most of his questions, so he continued, "So how can I help you then?" Lockheed jumped up on the workbench and said, "Goose tells me you are an excellent crafter and can learn foreign technology without great difficulty. There is something I'd like you to build for me. I do not have the materials nor skill to build it myself, though I do know how it works, and in exchange for teaching you my people's technology, I ask you to fulfill my request." Ping. New quest, phone home. Lockheed ran away from his flock and wishes to contact them again to inform those he cares for that he is well. Plus bonus, create untraceable connection. Harry said, "I will not build anything that could end up causing great harm to this planet of people I care about. Other than that, there should not be a problem." Lockheed nodded and seemed to respect that. He said, "I was considered something of a hero among my own people in the Brood Wars. I was given many honors, but those honors took away my freedom. I was made into a status symbol and was going to be forced into marriage with another celebrity, I suppose you could say. I was not interested in her, but she wanted to possess me and I was practically sold to her. Had the X-Men not barged into the war, I would have been married off the following day. So I ran." Harry listened without judgment to Lockheed's story. Not all heroes had a happy ending, and Harry was at least happy Lockheed was able to escape the fate of a trophy husband. Lockheed continued, "I left without warning or message to others. Many perhaps think I have died, but there are those I care for who I wish to inform I am doing well. I wish to ask you to build a communicator that I can use to contact my parents." Why me? I mean, I know I'm good, but Forge could probably build a communicator using spare parts from the ship. Goose interrupted, apparently having followed the whole conversation in Parseltongue. His race communicates, interacts with one another, and even travels through the astral plane. He needs someone who can build within the astral plane. Lockheed, apparently having heard Goose, said, "She is correct. I need someone capable of crafting astral tech." Harry smiled, "I'm game." Harry feels the space cave in behind him and turns to find, not Kurt, but Harry Potter. The doppelganger. Harry says, "Jean is going to go critical in 7 minutes. Use Protocol Supreme and take Rogue and Wanda. Clearance code, Wolverine Heartstorm. I'll take over with Goose and Lockheed." The original Harry sighs and operates to Wanda and Rogue's closet and knocks on the door. Harry has been keeping several monitoring charms in Jean's room so that when Jean has a nightmare capable of disturbing the house, the charm creates a timestamp and informs Harry. When Harry goes back in time, he makes sure to be in her room during the period the timestamp goes off so he can contain the effect. This time however it seemed that he alone would not be enough. Wanda opened the closet door and Harry said, Jean's about to go critical, let's go. Rogue was dressed by then as well and Harry made a portal to Jean's room and waited until the room started shaking. Harry cast a barrier around the room and Wanda and Rogue used chaos magic to strengthen it and to soothe Jean's bad dreams. The Chinook energy coming off the girl this time however nearly cracked Harry's shields and pushed Rogue and Wanda back. They increased the strength of their spell and eventually the Chinook storm calmed down. Jean shot up and turned to see Harry, Rogue, and Wanda. Her face turned painful and she started crying. Wanda went to her left and Rogue to her right and they started comforting her. Jean said through sobs, I'm sorry. I keep dreaming about that night. Maybe I should have let the professor take my memories. Rogue shook her head and said, no. You would still feel the fear but you wouldn't know where it was coming from. Rogue had read over a lot of psychology books in Harry's head and was practically a certified shrink at this point. She knew more about people's heads than even Charles did. Jean tried to hold back her weeping breaths and said, my powers are getting worse. It's like before you got here, Harry. Please, tell me what's happening to me. Harry nodded and put his arms around all three girls. He then sent something of a psychic invitation into his mind and Jean followed in. She was surprised to find that Rogue and Wanda came in as well. Harry took out a book of his memories. Jean had already gotten to Camartage and had just finished Harry's encounter with the doctor. This scene is a few months after where you left off so I suspect you would have found it in a week or so. Harry threw the book at a wall and it turned into a projection of the images. Harry fast-forwarded to his meeting with Than and hit play, allowing Jean to watch everything from start to finish. When the Phoenix showed up to save Harry, Jean felt she could not be more grateful, even though she already knew Harry survived. She also realized that the image Harry sent to her when they first met was this very Phoenix. Then came the conversation and the Phoenix's request. Jean was shocked over the fact that the Phoenix was the one who saved her life when she nearly died following the soul of her best friend that horrible day, so many years ago. She didn't like what Harry was being asked to do, but was mollified that Harry took the time to confirm that the Phoenix's avatar would not be controlled, only given power and the knowledge of where to use it, before he agreed to it. Rather than ending, the scene fast-forwarded once more to the point where Harry learned that Xavier had blocked Forge's memories of danger and Harry had scanned Xavier's mind to find out what was wrong with him. Harry ended the picture there and said, Xavier sealed some of the weaker, more human parts of his mind so he could make himself into a symbol others could get behind. He is obviously not aware of the humanity he lost when he did so, which was why he could justify what he did to Forge and what he did to you. I suspect he felt he was doing it to protect you from yourself. Jean sat down on the couch in Harry's mind and started thinking. She knew Harry was trying to get her to do something with her own mind, but she didn't think it was unlocking the sealed connection to the entity of life and passion, the source of all Chinooks in the universe. She couldn't hate Harry for it either. Harry hadn't been straightforward about it, but he didn't exactly go to any great lengths to hide it from her, and she always knew he'd tell her once she asked. Jean asked aloud, so the reason my head is messed up is because of that seal? Harry nodded and asked, knowing what you know now, can you guess why the seal is messing with you? Jean considered it and answered, because the seal isn't just sealing the connection, it is also sealing what the Phoenix connected to. My passion, my heart, and other parts of my mind. Harry nodded and said, not all of it but enough of it to make it unstable. I figure Xavier sealed his own mind after it had matured so he didn't experience the same problem, but he still thinks if it worked for him it will work for you. Jean now understood what the Phoenix meant when it said her mind could be crippled if not the seal was not removed. She figured she had a year at most before any damage became permanent, which was why Harry had not told her everything on day one, and just allowed her to work it herself. Jean said, I want to break that seal. Now. Harry nodded but said, if we're going to do it, we're going to do it right. It's time for you to meet my mystic teacher, the Ancient One. Wanda and Rogue are coming too, by the way. The group left Harry's mind and Harry made a portal to Camartage after Jean changed from her pajamas to something casual. The sun had yet to set and Harry was able to get a meeting with the Sorcerer Supreme and informed her that a future version of himself had said to use Protocol Supreme. That was a plan Harry and the Ancient One had come up with to assist Jean in breaking the seal instead of letting her finish it herself to prevent as much damage as possible. They figured that enacting Protocol Supreme likely meant that something bad would happen if Jean broke the seal herself, so they would do it together and help her to prevent any damage. Harry arranged the ritual room and informed Wanda and Rogue of their plans and how they could help. Once ready, all four of them entered Jean's head and found the spot Jean suspected Xavier had hidden the seal. The Ancient One said, now, Harry and I will reveal the seal, but it would be best if you opened it yourself. Opening it yourself versus another opening it is the difference between opening a door with a key or opening it with a crowbar. Jean nodded and Harry and the Ancient One touched upon the flow of Chinook and mental energies within Jean's mind, and slowly the space within her psyche, which appeared to contain nothing, unfolded itself to reveal a wall containing a door held shut but many chains. Jean noticed the effort that Harry and the Ancient One seemed to be putting into keeping the door visible, so Jean focused on it using what Harry had taught her, and one by one, the chains fell down. Harry and the Ancient One seemed to be struggling, which made Jean nervous, but she set those feelings aside and focused more, felling chain after chain. She put everything she had into the last heavy lock, which clicked open, and Harry and the Ancient One seemed to relax. Rogue walked up and asked, was Xavier's locks really that hard to open? The Ancient One caught her breath and said, it was not the power of Xavier that made the locks strong. He used Jean's own mind and forged parts of it into those locks. Jean's mind, gifted with a connection to the source, is very powerful and we could not afford to harm the locks and chains as they too are parts of Jean's mind. Jean felt what the Ancient One was referring to and changed the locks and chains back into the emotions and mental aspects of herself that had been missing from her mind for so long. The moment she did so, however, she collapsed and seemed to be in great pain. "Bring her to me," came an ethereal woman's voice from the other side of the door. Harry picked up Jean and ran inside and down the winding staircase to where a large flame was burning. The flame shifted into a woman and said, "You have done well, we are not too late. An avatar of mine lives off love and passion. However, her heart was forged into a chain and used to bind me, preventing her from truly feeling love. Had this not been corrected in time, then even if I was freed later she would always have had a hole in her heart, leaving her feeling empty, and she would have used my powers to fill that hole. Nothing good would have come from that." Rogue asked, "How can we help?" The Phoenix answered, "Before the wound in her heart becomes a hole, you must heal it with love. I can feel the love you three bear for my avatar and the connection you have forged. You must use that connection to show Jean your love for her." Harry and the girls nodded and connected their empathy directly to Jean. They knew that Jean had feelings for Harry, but it was light and fragile, so Harry and the girls used occlumency to hide the depths of their own feelings for Jean to prevent her from feeling awkward around them for loving her more than she loved them. Now, however, they hid nothing and turned up the love to 11. Harry remembered seeing her for the first time, speaking with her at the mansion, showing her his mind and every interaction that followed. He remembered her kindness, her generosity, her care for others, and remembered how all of that made him fall in love with her. He put his feelings for Jean on full display and allowed Jean to feel it completely. Rogue did the same and Wanda did as well. Jean's pain-filled face seemed to relax. Harry bent over and cupped her face in his hand just as she was opening her eyes, and he leaned forward. Jean instinctively leaned up and their lips met. She felt Harry's love for her and even Rogue's and Wanda's love. Tears were streaming down her cheeks at the feeling of being so overwhelmingly loved by so many amazing people. She could feel her own heart burn with love for them, and the pain she felt earlier faded and turned to warmth. Jean closed her eyes and wrapped her arms around Harry and kissed him deeply. She opened her mouth and Harry's tongue pressed and danced against her own, making her head swim. Rogue and Wanda smirked from the back as they knew Harry had decades of practice making out after all. The flame behind them turned into a spiral and flew into Jean, but she didn't seem to notice. Her body began to glow and embers burned over her form, but did nothing to harm Harry. Rogue walked up to the pair and separated them, saying, "All right, time to breath, people." Jean realized what she had done and blushed awkwardly. Rogue smiled, took Jean into her arms and said, "My turn, sugar," and planted another steaming kiss onto Jean's lips. Rogue's tongue was just as skilled as Harry's, and soon Jean was swimming again and deeply enjoying Rogue's Frenching skills. The sight of the two kissing made Harry really reconsider his wait until they moved out policy. Thankfully, he would not have to wait too long. Although he was 15, he found a few means that would let him own a house when he turned 16, so he'd already planned to move out next summer, and his heart had already settled in making sure nothing got in the way of taking his girls with him. Rogue broke the kiss and looked satisfied at Jean's zoned-out expression before she turned to Wanda and asked, "You want a turn, sugar?" Wanda blushed and said, "Maybe later." The Ancient One gave a small cough and said, "Perhaps now would be a good time to return to our bodies." Jean regained her composure at that and said, Right." The group left Jean's mind and had returned to the ritual chamber. Harry then asked, "Do you girls want to go through the multiplayer conversion now?" Wanda asked, "You've gained enough levels for that?" Harry nodded and said, "I've found enough time in the last 2 months to do so." Jean asked, "Me too." Harry smiled and said, "I meant all of you, of course." Rogue shouted, "Yeah, let's do it. You do know this is going to be horribly painful, right? I won't be able to stop the process once it starts." Jean said, "It will help me get stronger, right? I'm not turning this down." Wanda and Rogue had known about the pain and didn't change their minds, of course. Harry opened up his menus and selected multiplayer. The multiplayer system scanned his surroundings for those who trusted him and found 4 matches. The Ancient One hadn't left yet and seemed to want to observe, and she was on the list. However, next to each name was how many levels it would cost to convert them. Relatively speaking, an adult's level was 10 plus how many years they spent working in a skilled profession. A desk jockey adult even at the age of 50 wasn't likely to be above level 15, but someone who spent a decade doing something they required training and skill to do was likely over level 20, with higher skilled professions giving more levels on average per year. Soldiers had higher levels than teachers, but teachers had higher levels than cab drivers. The Ancient One was likely over level 300, and Harry would lose more levels than he had to convert her, as the ratio was not 1-to-1. Higher levels required higher conversion cost than lower levels. Jean, Rogue, and Wanda were actually all decent levels, about 20 to 25 apiece. Their power came not from their level but their skill, and both would grow over time. Since Harry was well over level 200, it would cost him less than 20 levels to convert all 3 girls, and with effort he'd have that back by January. Harry selected his girls on the menu, and after a round of confirmation screens and a message that he would be reduced to 195, Harry clicked agree and the process started. 3 small streams of black particles slowly floated off from Harry's arms and connected to each girl. It was uncomfortable, but not too bad. Then came the bad part. Harry felt pain similar to dying but closer to burning. Kinda like having your skin being peeled off while you were on fire. The grunts and hisses from the girls confirmed they weren't any better and Harry could feel their pain. They seemed to be feeling like a corrosive wind was blowing under their skin and through their organs. The entire process lasted about 10 minutes and when it completed, everyone collapsed. Ping. New players added. New player, Anna Marie. Level 24 age 15. New player, Wanda Maximoff. Level 21 age 15. New player, Jean Grey. Level 25 age 16. Harry recovered the quickest from the pain and looked over the girls' stats. Not surprisingly, Wanda and Jean had high wisdom and intellect. Wanda also had surprisingly low luck. Anne Mayer, Rogue, had more well-rounded stats and was more physically fit than either of the others. All in all not surprising. Harry couldn't see their path ranks but he'd ask them about that later. None of the girls seemed inclined on getting up so Harry said his goodbyes to the Ancient One and wrapped all of them up in a time turner and went back 5 hours. He took them to his apartment in London and conjured some extra beds and placed his girls under the blankets and tucked them in. If they weren't awake before classes started he'd tell Xavier enough to get them excused. They had a tough night but pulled through in the end and the future was waiting for them. Chapter 45. Chapter 45 Cutthroat Business. Within a field of kaleidoscopic color which marked the astral battlefield Harry's battle meditation took place in, Harry was standing off to the side while he watched Rogue, Wanda, and Jean fight off a group of 12 tiger-sized wolves. It had been a little over a month since the girls were added to the multiplayer function and every night since they had used battle meditation with Harry. The girls themselves could not initiate battle meditation so Harry had to do so first and only then could he invite them into the astral plane to take part. Of course he had to lower the level of the conjured construct so the wolves they were currently facing were about level 50 apiece. Jean was probably the most excited to take part in Harry's battle meditation because she knew how to access the astral plane on her own, though she had no intention of finding and killing beings within to level up. She knew that Harry leveled up in this space and had tried to find it a few times so she could watch him, but Harry told her he was using a concealment formation to prevent Xavier or other telepaths from interrupting him while he fought. Having the Ancient One find him that one time was awkward enough, he wasn't going for a repeat performance. All three girls were floating above the pack and raining hell down into the poor wolves. Jean had already figured out how to float using telekinesis and Rogue was copying her. Wanda had invented her own chaos magic spell that allowed her to float as well which proved to be a great advantage against opponents incapable of flight. Jean had 3 forms of attack. She could attack the target's mind to stun then, use telekinesis to hold or throw them, or create Shinik blades to physically attack them. She could use Phoenix Flame as well, but they wouldn't get experience for defeating enemies with those so she refrained from using that. While defending she could create barriers and move debris or enemies into the way of oncoming attacks. Wanda's fighting style was mostly about controlling the enemy and the environment. She didn't have anything to transfigure into allies in this space but she could transfigure the terrain and apply various status ailments against her opponents. Her hex bolts were no longer unpredictable and she could directly transfigure weaker targets into whatever she wanted. Rogue's combat style was more unpredictable. At a distance she would use Cyclops' eye beams, Iceman's freeze rays, Pyro's pyrokinesis, or Storm's wind or lightning. When up close she could cover herself in Speak's spikes or Colossus's organic steel and use Juggernaut's unstoppable force or Quicksilver's speed. In a pinch she would use Wanda's hex bolts. None of the 3 were particularly stronger than the other 2. At first, Wanda and Rogue were stronger than Jean but with the autocorrecting properties of the path system combined with her own Phoenix Flames perk which acted as a multiplier in the speed at which the path increased in rank, eventually she found herself nearly matching them most of the time. All 3 had their weaknesses of course. Rogue's weakness was the duration she could fight. Most mutant powers come with passive physical enhancements which allow the mutant to use them easier but Rogue didn't get those so her use of a power was always less efficient than the original's use. For example she could run at the same speed as Quicksilver but she would tire herself out long before Pietro reached his limit. When she used multiple powers at the same time she tired out much faster so when she sparred with Wanda and Jean, they would use everything they had to force her into a corner and make her use multiple powers at the same time, then drag the fight out until she was exhausted. Neither considered it a cheap tactic as Rogue could use Wolverine's healing and could become invulnerable using either Colossus or Juggernaut's power. Wanda's weakness was her lack of fast, strong, single-target attack moves. Her casting for lesser spells was near instantaneous but if she wanted to take down someone like Logan or any of the other first-generation X-Men, she would need something stronger which took more time to cast. She had been getting around this by using stalling tactics and learning different strategies while increasing the strength of her Hex Bolt's ability to disrupt other mutant powers. Jean's only real weakness was her lack of experience. In that sense, Wanda and Rogue were perfect practice partners for her and she was learning something new every day. Harry offered to allow Jean to copy his own understanding of physics into her mind which would allow her to easily learn it herself using Harry's understanding as a reference. Jean could use telekinesis and astral creation to mimic many other powers and with a connection to the Phoenix Force, using those powers didn't drain her even when she tried something big. However, maintaining a constant connection to the Phoenix Force would change her intrinsically so she only maintained brief connections at various times. In addition to facing off against monsters in battle meditation and sparring against one another, Harry himself would sometimes fight against them either individually, in pairs, or against all 3. Although the girls were strong enough to whittle away at the pack of level 50 wolves without issue, Harry could still clobber them all no matter what they tried. Harry found that close quarters combat was a general weakness for each of them, so he would stack strength energy from Sidorak's realm with immortal dragon chi and use his dimensional longsword along with sorcerer-style physical enhancement. In this way he used his warrior, magic, and dragon path all at the same time and proved to be too strong for them. For now anyways. Harry suspected in 2 years or so they'd be able to give him a very good fight. Though he still wouldn't let them beat him. Harry couldn't fight the monsters the girls were against, or else all the energy would automatically go to him, so he had to just stand around the whole time. Instead of wasting it, he would invoke his immortal dragon chi and practice using it to raise his dragon path. Other times he would use astral creation to practice making astral tech. The astral tech of Lockheed's race was fascinating in more ways than one. Apparently Lockheed's race had actual ships they used in the astral plane they could use to fly from one world to the next and would move their physical bodies with their astral selves. Harry's interest in astral tech was due to the fact that he could not use items from his inventory in the astral plane, but he could place astral tech into his inventory once it had been completed and he could take it out when he returned to the astral plane. That meant he could make weapons and pieces of equipment that he could use in the astral plane. Harry's tech path apparently loved astral tech as well as it had gone up 2 ranks to 34 since Lockheed's tutoring in the subject had started. That along with some other breakthroughs of his allowed Harry to complete several projects he'd been working on. The final wolf died and the natural energy they were formed of scattered and was absorbed in equal parts by the girls to Harry's satisfaction. Wanda, who had the lowest level before, had reached level 40 and Jean and Rogue were already at level 41. Even though they shared the EXP, they were leveling up faster than Harry did at Hogwarts because they already had path ranks higher than their levels and Harry was getting them access to monsters at higher levels than the girls. The multiplayer function had 3 main features which benefited the users. The first was the recovery properties of the Obscurus cells. When injured, their natural recovery increased depending on the ratio of Obscurus cells they had in their body, which increased the more they leveled up. When they reached level 50 they could likely survive being stabbed in the heart, and at level 100 they could shrug off such a wound without decreasing their combat effectiveness. Even Rogue couldn't channel Logan all the time after all. The second function was that they could exceed the limits of their body through leveling up thanks to the Obscurus particles propagation. Even if they all trained at a Spartan-style boot camp from hell for a year, they had no chance of even reaching level 35 from level 25, yet Harry suspected they would all reach level 50 in the next 2 months. They could even distribute the stats they gained however they wanted. Wanda, for example, used a lot of her stats to boost her luck, and Rogue and Jean did the same with a goal of getting the luck to 50 each. Harry didn't want to increase his own luck for the simple reason that he might get bored if he was too lucky, but he had no problem with his girls boosting their luck since they would not come back from the dead if they got unlucky. The third and biggest benefit of the multiplayer status was access to the auto-correction of the path system. Their skills naturally increased with use, and skills within the same path also became easier to use even if they didn't practice them thanks to the auto-correct. For the path system, Jean chose to focus on the Chinook path and Wanda focused on the magic path. Rogue, however, decided to walk a similar path to Harry's and used the magic, Chinook, and warrior paths at the same time to try to stack them together. Most mutant powers fell under one of those 3 paths anyways. Speaks, Colossus's, and even Wolverine's power fell under warrior. Iceman's, Storm's, and even Scott's power fell under magic. And Pyro's and Domino's powers fell under Chinook. There were also powers that fell into multiple categories like Quicksilver's and Juggernaut's, which were both magic and warrior since their power used time or strength energy to enhance their physical combat abilities. The girls loved getting stronger faster, but under Harry's suggestion they had to hold back in the danger room when showing off to others. Rogue and Wanda had been doing so already and Jean was starting to get used to it, though she didn't like it. Harry mollified her by informing her about Sinister, who knew that she had lost interest in Scott and that was why she was kidnapped. The fact that he could find that out meant he had means of monitoring inside the Institute, and the reason Harry was able to get her so fast was because Harry had hid all the useful information about himself behind covers. Jean didn't like it, but she understood it. The fall semester of Harry's first year at the Institute had ended and today was Christmas. Forge and Xavier both had very pleasant smiles on their faces as Harry had shown them his gifts for some of the students and teachers in advance, and both were incredibly happy for everyone. Harry had started openly going out with Jean and had confirmed they were boyfriend and girlfriend. This was something Rogue and Wanda suggested as they wanted to make sure the few eyes coveting Jean knew to stand down. Thankfully, since Harry removed Sinister's influence, Scott had only been treating Jean like a sister and he had given up on all other ideas. He knew that Jean was happy, which made him happy. In exchange for this, Harry would often share Rogue's and Wanda's bed at night. Nothing X-rated happened, but they were enjoying the skinship and closeness. Occasionally Jean would sneak in as well and Harry would enlarge the bed. Jean was not exactly a different person after the mental locks were removed and she regained her full ability to feel love, but everyone could see how different she was since she started dating Harry. She was more colorful and vibrant and seemed both softer and stronger at the same time. Thankfully, everyone attributed it to Harry being an awesome boyfriend, which was not entirely inaccurate. Storm and Logan did of course take the two aside and give them the adult lecture about hormones, consent, and love in general. Harry did his best not to point out that the goddess of nature and the feral animal required a soundproof room when they chose to sleep together. Storm herself had taken an instant liking to Laura and Dr. Kinney, often chatting with the latter over coffee in the morning with Domino. Both appreciated some new female friends as they felt being the only mature women in the institute became droll after some time. They also enjoyed grilling her viciously about how close she was getting to Dr. McCoy. The two geneticists had many things in common after all. When they started opening presents, Harry was given many small knickknacks, a cool poster of Captain America, some books, and some t-shirts. Near the end of the gift unwrapping, Harry had Xavier bring out gifts for Kurt, Dr. McCoy, Josh, Sarah, and the others who had features which prevented them from going out in public. Kurt was the only one Harry had told about this project beforehand, and when he saw the watch and who else got one, he teleported over to Harry, took the forward flick without complaint, and hugged him much to everyone's confusion. Thank you, thank you, thank you. How does it work? Harry answered, the instructions were in the box, but you just tap on the glass 3 times to activate it and tap on it 5 times to deactivate it. Kurt put the watch on and tapped the face of the glass 3 times, which caused his appearance to look like static for just an instant before he was suddenly no longer blue. Kurt looked Caucasian, seemed to have 5 fingers, and no tail though his hair remained its trademark blue. Ah, my tail is getting pressed against my leg. Kurt looked back to where his tail had been and didn't see it. He tapped the glass 5 times and his image returned to his lovable blue demon form. He then wrapped his tail around his waist and tapped the glass 3 more times and looked normal again. Ah, much better. Harry got out a large, full-length mirror he already had in the corner and got it out. Kurt didn't bother walking over to it, he just goofed in front of it and started admiring his reflection. Oh, my hair is still blue. It's perfect. The other kids put their watches on and tapped it 3 times as well. The gold-skinned Josh became Caucasian as well. The bone-like horns on Sarah's face were gone. And Dr. McCoy was suddenly a very bulky man who nearly matched the Juggernaut in profile, though he was not nearly as tall and one would only think he was incredibly fit. McCoy's surprise when he saw his reflection was the strongest. He asked, how did you know what I looked like before I changed? Although Dr. McCoy considered Harry a student and colleague, he didn't tell Harry much about his past. Harry had in fact used some of the man's fur and what he knew of removing the X gene combined with a variant polyjuice potion he used on himself. In other words, he made himself a copy of without his mutation and took pictures of himself to be scanned and used for the hard light construct. Not exactly wanting to lie, Harry answered, it's a secret, though I'll tell you later if you really want to know. Making that particular batch of polyjuice was gigantic pain, but perhaps Dr. McCoy would learn more about his own mutation if he used it himself. Not just the children gifted the watches, but everyone in the mansion was happy and many had tears running down their faces. They all knew what this really meant for the kids and it took away much of the hidden burden that being a mutant entailed. While everyone was laughing and showing off, Harry walked over to a corner and got out his last present. No, I didn't forget about you. Forget-me-not rolled his eyes and opened the package to find a metallic bracelet and a tablet. Harry said, keep that on for the next 4 hours. It will scan your memories and connect to this tablet. The tablet will display events and people you've encountered and you can select them. Any person you select will remember you. Any event you select that you took part in will be remembered by everyone who took part in it. I can make a new tablet if it breaks and there is an extra bracelet if you lose this one, but try not to as this bracelet and the spare are the only ones in existence and I'll never be able to make more. As long as you wear the bracelet, you will not be forgotten. Forget-me-not stopped moving about halfway through the explanation. He was in too much shock. Sure, he knew Harry was going to try something, but he didn't expect him to actually succeed. No one succeeded. He wanted to rebuke Harry for getting his hopes up, but the swarm of smiling children Harry had already done the impossible for today held his tongue. He stared at the bracelet for what seemed like hours before he put it on his wrist and felt someone inside his head. He understood that this was whatever was copying his memories. Not really knowing what to do, Forget-me-not softly said, thank you. Harry patted his shoulder and said, it's an honor. I look forward to working with you in the future. Harry had to practically use alchemy in order to turn the DVDs into something he could store memories on, but eventually he succeeded. The big breakthrough was actually a paired component of astral tech Harry made that connected the tablet to the bracelet through the astral plane. That meant they didn't need to be close to each other and the astral plane could easily access and transfer mental information like memories. Forget-me-not carefully pulled out the tablet and the large instruction booklet it came with and started reading it. Harry knew he wouldn't accept that this was real until later, so he wouldn't bother him for now. Sometime in the afternoon, Harry's own watch started blinking. Harry kept his homemade cell phone in his inventory, so he used his watch like a pager to inform him of incoming calls and messages. Harry pulled out his cell phone and was quickly called by the goblin Bloodclaw. He was basically Harry's secretary. Mr. Potter. A voicemail has been left on the company line by one Winston Frost. Harry asked, as in CEO of Frost International, Winston Frost. The same. He has requested a meeting on the 27th at the headquarters of Frost International in Massachusetts at 10 a.m. Harry tried not to laugh but did not succeed, and he could practically hear Bloodclaw's razor-toothed smile through the phone. Both knew the type of man Mr. Frost was known to be, and both knew it was unlikely for things to end peacefully. Harry felt the goblins were probably rubbing off on him in the wrong way because he was looking forward to it. Harry said, call back and confirm I'll be there. It shall be done. Harry hung up and smiled. It had been about 6 months since Brilliance Incorporated started selling gemstones. Harry wasn't too sure about the name, but a company that made gemstones and would soon make tech had to have a catchy name, and he didn't want to call it Potter something. He felt with things like Worthington Industries, Stark Industries, and Frost International, putting his name up like that would feel just too weird, and he already had Potter and Gold Bank and Trust. The goblins had pretty much figured out how to get around all the annoying laws that prevented them from earning among the muggles. Each leader among the goblins had a human counterpart, and that human's name was on record as the one who was employed doing whatever it was that particular goblin did. These humans were employed in shell companies that looked like they did things, but in reality they did not. The so-called human board of directors were all squibs or muggleborns who knew about the goblins and also knew they were just proxies. They had signed magical contracts to fulfill the role of proxy and were paid relatively well. Thanks to this, however, it was impossible to steal the secrets of the company. The hiring process for most positions that were just covers included magical means of weeding out the criminals and spies, so no one who wanted to look was able to find anything, as they would always look in the wrong places. As long as you ignored a few breaches of the statute of secrecy and squinted a bit, it was all still just barely considered legal. The company itself had actually garnered great success so far. Nearly indestructible sapphire panes to be used as windows, diamond drill bits and cutters, large rubies for lasers. There was indeed a market for Harry's synthetic gemstones that could be crafted to nearly any size and shape, and many groups were starting to take notice. Most companies had things they wanted to make but could not, as the resources to make them were too scarce for the product to sell profitably. Projects that fell under this category that required gemstones were now suddenly profitable as long as they purchased those gemstones from Brilliance Incorporated. Harry informed his girls of Mr. Frost's invitation, and though Jean looked just a little worried, Rogue and Wanda wished him happy hunting. On the morning in question, Harry wore a custom-made acromantula silk business suit with silver cufflinks and his Potter family signet ring. The smile received from his girls at his appearance was a show of how he looked, which was good enough for him. Harry used a portal to head to MIT, a place he had been to before, and got a cab to take him to Frost International's main building, a humble 67-floor tower 30 floors higher than anything else in the nearby 5-square-mile area. Harry figured the man needed lessons on subtly. The guard at the door motioned for Harry to come to him first, as the door wouldn't automatically open for anyone without a badge. Harry said, "Harry Potter, meeting for 10 a.m. The guard didn't look through any schedule or paperwork. He just gave Harry a once-over and directed him through the door behind him. Inside there was another guard who said, "Mr. Potter, please step through here." There was an open-ended box-like path. Harry followed the guard through to the elevator on the other side of the room. He sensed the X-rays that traveled through him and confirmed he only had a wallet, pen, cell phone, keys, and a watch on his person. Some of the keys looked fancy and high-tech, but there were toys Harry made that didn't unlock anything. Nothing Harry secured used actual keys, but not having them would be suspicious. Once he was through, Harry saw the woman at the counter was speaking on a phone, likely notifying others of Harry's arrival. Several others seemed to be coming and going from the entrance, but they used key cards to both enter and exit. There were no doors to be used by guests without going through a guard first. The guard escorting Harry to the elevator seemed to be the most muscular. He seemed to be the type who would never smile, and his silence had an air of intimidation. Harry found the entire setup amusing. Compared to meetings with Harry's actual board of directors, these guys were positively adorable. That board did not have a voting process when there was a difference of opinion. Their arguments were carried out through battle and the shedding of blood. Adult goblins that survived growing up among other goblins had a warrior path rank averaging between 15 and 25, with the strongest ones being above 30. That, combined with their goblin-forged weapons and armor, meant they were very hardy, and goblins themselves were far faster and stronger than their size gave away. Goblins matured slower and reached their prime between the ages of 50 and 75, with the best maintaining their strength when they were over 100. However, although the strongest goblin warrior wielding the finest goblin armaments would likely defeat most wizards, there were far too few goblins who survived the number of battles required to reach such standards, making them weaker than wizards overall and thus forced to abide by their laws. Unsurprisingly, most of the strongest who had in fact reached that standard were on Harry's board of directors, and none of them were meatheads or younger than 60. Harry did have to kill one particularly stubborn goblin during his second board of directors meeting, but that asshole had it coming. He thought that because Harry hadn't killed him up to that point after all the times he tried to cheat him and fail, that Harry was a pushover. The remaining board members and that goblin's replacement knew not to make that mistake again. So compared to that, Harry had to stop himself from laughing at Winston's so-called intimidation tactics. The elevator ride was unsurprisingly all the way to the top, and the security guard motioned for Harry to continue into the following room while he stayed behind. Something that was slightly surprising was that Harry's mental trip wires went off just before Harry entered the room at the end of the hall. Someone was listening to his thoughts and was very discreet about their entry. However, even Xavier couldn't get in without tripping Harry's alarms, because those alarms were made using wizard magic and invisible to even the strongest telepath. Harry smiled at the opening move of his opponent and figured this meant it would not be boring. Harry opened the door and saw Mr. Frost on the other side of a large, apparently hand-carved desk, sitting in a large, leather chair. Behind the man was an open view of the Boston cityscape, and in front of the desk, in what he supposed was reserved for him, was a smaller chair. Winston himself wore a three-piece suit, and the gray hair on his head was slicked back in a way that both appeared professional while giving the aura of experience and wisdom. fully knowing that his thoughts were being heard by another party. Harry thought that Winston was very stereotypical, and without a dead body in the room or bloodstains on the desk, this entire charade was cute compared to what he was used to dealing with. Harry had already sent a reverse tap to the telepath and confirmed it was a teenage girl in another room, not the man himself. The man looked up from his desk as if he only just realized Harry had walked in and said, "Ah yes, Mr. Potter. Thank you for accepting my request for a meeting." Harry didn't bother sitting in the provided chair, instead he just leaned against it and answered, "Now why would I turn down such an interesting invitation from a man such as yourself? As in, why should I fear you? I obviously don't." Harry could swear he heard a giggle coming from the other room, which was quickly stifled, though didn't make anyone aware he had noticed it. Harry continued, "You are also the first person to successfully reach my voicemail. I'm most certain I didn't make that number easy to find, so it would be quite improper of me to decline your request. By law, contact numbers have to be somewhere, but the goblins knew how to hide things within bureaucracy and Harry knew computers. The FBI hadn't found his contact number yet and he knew they were still looking." Winston seemed to attempt a smile, but it was strained. He didn't ask Harry to take a seat as Harry already seemed quite comfortable leaning over the back of the chair and was standing above the seated Winston. The old man said, "Quite. Your company, Brilliance Incorporated, is certainly interesting. There is potential, but only if handled well. I called you over to discuss the future of your company." Harry only laughed in his head instead of out loud that the man thought anything he said or did would have any say in the future of his company. Outwardly, Harry said, "Of course it has potential. Nobody has my company's techniques when it comes to producing gemstones. No one can even come close without burning more money than they'll ever make competing with me, so my company's future is, well, brilliant." Harry said that last part with a smile that showed his supernaturally clean teeth. Brilliant was such a fun word to say with a British accent and a smile. Winston didn't bother smiling back, instead he seemed to decide playtime was over and said, "Indeed. It's that potential that has me interested. I called you in here to buy controlling interest in your company. Frost International has a clothing and jewelry line that could use someone with your manufacturing capabilities, and I already have everything here you'll have to sign." Within Harry's head he heard words which sounded mostly similar to his own voice. "It is a good idea, it is dash." Harry interrupted the false thoughts and thought to himself, "No, that's a terrible idea. Gemstone manufacturing is the tip of the iceberg. Selling now before I make my true play isn't an idea worth considering." Harry was immune to telepathic persuasiveness as long as he wasn't dealing with an elder god within their own realm, but he didn't want others to know that, so thought to himself a logical reason to ignore the thought along with some juicy bait to keep the telepath interested. Harry blandly said, "I refuse." Was there anything else? Harry didn't hide his thoughts that this man was already boring him with his cliché gimmicks. He hoped that by thinking such thoughts, he'd draw out the telepath directly. Winston didn't appear to expect a refusal, but added easily, "You should reconsider. Young companies such as yours often face difficulties which cannot be recovered from. Becoming a branch of Frost International would protect you from such things." He didn't even bother trying to hide the various threats within that statement. Harry knew that the goblins had become a bad influence on him when his reflexive response was to give a toothy smile and answer back, "I look forward to the challenge." It was clear they had nothing else to discuss, so Harry turned to leave. The telepath from before seemed to run around the hall, and after reaching the corner where she was in view she started calmly walking as if she hadn't run up to him. The guard didn't block her and she opened the elevator and said, "I'll escort you out. I'm certainly better company than Mr. Orth here." Harry said, "I'd be a nutter not to agree with that." "Harry Potter, at your service." She appeared to be a little older than Harry, at about 16, though matched him in height, which was impressive as he was quite tall for his age. She was completely lithe in form but showed no weakness in movement, meaning she had a well-conditioned body. That and the whole flawless white skin, golden blonde hair, and perfect blue eyes made it very clear this telepath would not have to rely on her powers to get herself a man, as long as she didn't get greedy, that is. The elevator door closed and she said, "Emma Frost, charmed. I'm impressed with the way you dealt with my father. Most have difficulty looking him in the eye, much least denying him so outright." Harry's internal thoughts about Emma's appearance was simply that she was beautiful and he wished she had been sitting at that desk instead of the grumpy old man. Sharing the company of a beautiful woman was far more pleasant than staying in a room with an irritable gray-haired old fart. Harry said, "Compared to my own board of directors meetings, that was outright boring. Every member carries at least one weapon and the better parts of our discussions and negotiations over disagreements don't start until first blood is drawn." Harry thought back to a few of those meetings and the sparks that his own personally crafted knife carved out of his opponent's blade before biting into their flesh. After thinking about it for a moment he paused and turned to see Emma's face comically distorted in utter shock. Harry couldn't help but laugh at that. She didn't see goblins in Harry's memories, though, as the contracts he signed prevented him from telling others he worked with goblins, and the secrecy within the magic of those contracts prevented that information from being taken. What she saw would then be appropriately altered to look like old balding men snarling at him while rapidly exchanging blows with exotic blades. Harry unpaused and turned to see she had corrected her face so that he wouldn't see her gaping. She said, "That would certainly put some things in perspective." After a moment of silence she said with worry clear in her voice, "I just hope you are not underestimating my father. He has many ways of bringing down companies that go against him, and I understand that Brilliance Incorporated doesn't have any military contracts yet. In most countries, military contracts were shields of protection. If someone went against a company that was contracted to sell products to the military, the government would likely step in to assist. Harry thought, to himself, that her mention of yet implied she had a way to get him a military contract through her. Harry wondered if she was poaching or if Winston put her up to it as a plan B. However, it didn't matter. Harry said, I don't need them. Although it was hard to find out that I am the CEO of Brilliance, it is not impossible. What is impossible is finding out what else I am the CEO of. I wonder how silly your father would feel if he knew I am also the owner of Potter and Gold Bank and Trust. I had trouble not laughing in the man's face. P&G Bank and Trust had partial ownership of thousands of businesses and was an unstoppable stream of wealth that spanned most of the UK, much of Europe, and was rapidly expanding in the US. Even if no one purchased a thing from Brilliance Incorporated, he'd never go into the red. Once more Harry thought to himself that this would be a fine test. If Emma told her father of this, it would come to nothing for either of them. If she kept that from him, it would be a good sign she might be trustworthy when she takes over the Frost International in the future. Harry didn't look, but he did pause again to see her smile a bit at that. The fact that Harry clearly believed that she would lead the company in the future was something she likely enjoyed hearing. Harry unpaused and Emma said, in that case I can't imagine you'll have much to worry about. There may be some personal attacks, slander, libel, that sort of thing. But your board of directors doesn't sound like pushovers, so I don't think there will be an issue. Harry said, well, I don't want to get their hopes up. They sharpen their blades enough as is without knowing they are being targeted. I see. I must say, you are far more interesting than most I've met. Would you mind meeting me another day for a longer conversation? She added a mental suggestion that Harry would like to ask her out on a date. Harry smiled and asked, are you asking me for a date? I don't mind. She frowned, just barely, that he thought she was asking instead of getting him to ask, but endured it. Harry continued as if he didn't notice, I know a nice restaurant in New York. Would you be able to make it for say, the 31st? Harry was clearly implying that he went to Massachusetts for their invitation, so she should come to New York for his own. Emma smiled and asked, where and when? Harry pulled out his wallet, which contained a business card and his pen. He wrote down an address and a time on the card and handed it to Ms. Frost. An eyebrow raised at the address, which told Harry she recognized it. The fact that Harry could get a reservation on New Year's Eve, just 4 days from now, showed his capability. She gave a beautiful smile and said, I'll be there. The elevator reached the ground floor and Harry left for the exit. Once he was further down the street and away from any cameras, he directly apparat back to the institute and told his girls of the meeting with the young telepath. Jean asked with a mischievous smile, so, a date huh? Harry said, well, she did ask me for a date and I do plan to deliver. First things first though. He turned to Jean and asked, would you like to go on a double date with me? Wanda realized what Harry was up to and started giggling. Ah, so you'll give her a date. It just won't be you who will be taking Jean, who is also a telepath. I want pictures. Harry said, I'll show you the memories. Jean smiled and asked, so, Scott? Harry nodded, yup, Scott. Chapter 46, Chapter 46, The Threat of Hellfire. You want to set me up on a date? Unsurprisingly, Scott was looking at Harry as if he had grown a second head, which started singing opera. Perhaps not the strangest request he had ever been asked, but Harry was certain it at least made his top 5. Harry confirmed, yep. Miss Frost asked me for a date, but as you know, I'm already dating Jean. So I told her I'd get her a date, so my options are you, Kurt, or Bobby. We're going to a fancy restaurant, so Kurt is out of the question, and although he hasn't said anything, I'm 90% sure that Bobby has zero interest in girls, if you catch my meaning. Scott shrugged. That was something of an open secret that no one really cared about. Still trying to get out of perhaps the most awkward conversation of his life, he asked, why would you agree at all? 2 reasons. First, being the daughter of a CEO, it is unlikely she has any friends that are not trying, in some shape or form, to take advantage of her. That made Scott frown. He had some serious protective instincts. Harry continued, and 2, she happens to be a mutant and I doubt she has any friends who are also mutants. Wait, really? What's her power? Sorry Scott, I'm not sharing a girl's secrets behind her back. If she decides to tell you, she will. And if you agree to this, I'll give you a watch. Scott was about to refuse before he remembered some Christmas presents. What kind of watch? I actually just finished it. It will assist you with turning your powers off and on. Scott froze at that. Harry figured he was being just a bit too dramatic. He had problems, but his life was in no way worse than a dozen others in the institute before Harry's arrival. Forget-me-not literally had nothing and no one, and yet he still moved forward. Harry truly admired the guy. Rogue feared growing up without being able to touch another human being, yet she still trained every day to control her power. Wanda had problems caused by a megalomaniacal father and an elder demon god of chaos, but she didn't ask for pity. And then there are those like Kurt who couldn't show their face in public without being screamed at, and yet he always maintained an upbeat attitude and tried to make others smile with his pranks, not frown at his misfortunes. After holding the question back for a few moments, he asked, how does that work? Well, as you know, I am familiar with magic, among other things. Certain forms of magic I am familiar with channel energy through your body to use its power. There are forms of anti-magic which can prevent a person's body from channeling that energy. The watch is a project I worked on with Forge and a certain wizard I know to inscribe it with an anti-magic seal that can be enabled and disabled. What Harry wouldn't tell him, as he would rather the drama king figure it out himself, was that the watch was basically a set of training wheels. If Scott could feel his power getting enabled and disabled, he could replicate that sensation to control his power on his own. If Harry just wanted to turn Scott's power off, he had some anti-magic monocles when he arrived that would probably work just fine. Instead, he wanted something that Scott could use to train himself. Harry considered himself a teacher, not a babysitter. After asking to test it first, Scott agreed to the double date. The fallout from Christmas and Scott walking around without sunglasses was a large amount of laughter and smiles. Even Xavier was shocked that Harry had made something for Scott, as blocking a mutant's power was very different from making a disguise. There was a possibility for misuse. Forge of course informed the professor that Scott's watch only worked for Scott, and anyone trying to analyze it would get nothing for their troubles. Harry had asked Forge to check his work, as he was fully aware of what could happen if such technology fell into the wrong hands. On the 30th, Harry took Wanda, Rogue, and Jean out to New York for clothes shopping. 12 hours later, Harry was able to convince the girls their respective closets were not big enough to hold more, and they would likely outgrow anything else before they wore half of what they purchased. Having been defeated by the evil that was logic, the girls grumpily decided to call it a day. The following evening, Harry wore a tuxedo that looked both simple yet classy. Jean wore a green dress with gold highlights she'd gotten the day before, and Scott wore a slightly snazzier tuxedo Harry bought him to look good for his date. Harry told him he should keep the habit of wearing his sunglasses outside but could take them off indoors now. Emma apparently was neither the type of person who was late or early. She walked up to the entrance right at the second and easily spotted Harry. Just as easily she spotted the redhead in his arms and the guy standing next to them gapping at her beauty. Harry said, "Ms. Frost, I'm glad you could make it. Here is the date I promised you. His name is Scott. And this is my girlfriend, Jean." Jean smiled and extended a hand. Emma paused only for a moment before she took it and gave a friendly shake. The smile that appeared on Jean's face and the shock that flashed across Emma's eyes clearly showed Harry that the blonde telepath had attempted to access Jean's mind and had likely been politely told off. Once she realized things were not as they seemed, Emma gave an impish smirk and said, "Thank you, Harry. I have been looking forward to this. You didn't tell me he was such a dreamboat." Jean reached over to Scott's chin and closed his gaping mouth and said, "Scott, aren't you going to take your date's arm?" Scott blushed but composed himself rather quickly and presented his arm. "Ms. Frost, would you do me the honor of accompanying me as my date this evening?" Harry and Jean shared a smirk. Scott had met Deadpool before, so although he could be rattled, he could still pull himself together. Emma seemed to raise an eyebrow, not at the display of chivalry, but likely because of what she was seeing in Scott's mind. She now knew that Harry had told Scott she was a mutant but had not told him her power. The lack of surprise from Jean at her mental intrusion told her that Jean was certainly a telepath and knew that she was as well. Scott was a mutant but had no great defenses against psychic intrusion, meaning she could get everything she wanted to know about the group from Scott's mind, and Jean and Harry appeared to be inviting her to do so. Not one to turn down such an invitation, she took Scott's arm and Harry walked the group up to the reservation desk, and moments later the group was escorted over to a table for four adjacent to the window overlooking Times Square, where the ball would be dropping in a few hours. Emma hid her surprise well but knew this table should not have been possible to get with just a couple of days' notice. Jean, acting the part of the sister enjoying watching her brother squirm, said, "So Scott, get the ball rolling and tell Ms. Frost a little about yourself." Emma said, "Please call me Emma. I don't believe I've ever been on a blind date before, so I think I'll start. I like art museums, moonless nights, and rock music." Scott responded with, "Well, you are clearly more cultured than I am. I do like walking through parks though. Dogs are also good. Who do you listen to?" Harry could tell that Emma was going through Scott's head. At some point she tried once more to enter into Harry's mind. The last time she was there, she was completely taken aback at the level of organization. She was tempted to take one of the books from the shelves, but her instincts told her not to. This time when she entered, she found that a representation of both Harry and Jean were there, waiting for her. Within Harry's mind she asked, "So Mr. Potter, what exactly is this? A recruitment for Xavier's Cub Scouts?" She had already learned much from Scott's head. Harry shook his metaphysical head and said, "Nope. More like an offer of friendship. If you actually are interested in me, you'll have to get Jean's permission. And Rogue's. And Wanda's. A harem? Really?" she asked with amusement. Jean answered, "For reasons I don't want to go into at the moment. I am ridiculously empathic and need a healthy dose of love to keep sane. And grounded. On Earth anyways. I fell in love with Harry, but so did two others. Both however have had isolations issues in the past, so both are comfortable having more people to love than less, as they don't want to be alone. They love me, and for that I love both of them. It is all very warm and fuzzy." Emma frowned at that. Problems with isolation and the need for people to care for you were things that hit just a little too close to home. That being said, she was selfish and didn't intend to change. She said, "Thank you for the offer of harem membership, but I'm not the type who shares." Jean shrugged and said, "It wasn't so much an offer as a warning of what you'd be in for. But declining is fine too. Also note that I'll be able to tell if you try anything to Scott, and so would the professor. Harry hasn't told him or anyone else in the institute about you though, so you won't get his attention as long as you don't try anything funny." Emma tried not to roll her eyes. Scott didn't need the slightest bit of manipulation. A naive Boy Scout with a hero complex who only felt valued when he was being useful to someone else. She had noticed he was sincere too. He didn't know that Emma was a telepath, but likely due to his experience working with telepaths, even his thoughts were polite and well-mannered. Very different from men her age she was used to dealing with. Deciding to change the subject, Harry asked, "So what did you tell Mr. Frost about me?" "Nothing. I doubt you didn't want him to know. Exceptionally well-organized mind and heavily resistant to outside influence. Large plans for your company in the future. Oh, and the fact that you found his intimidation tactics cute." She smiled at that last one, likely reveling in the memory of whatever expression her father made upon hearing that. Harry shook his head and said, "I wasn't lying about my board of directors." Jean rolled her eyes and said, "They are a bad influence on you." She knew Harry's company was run by goblins even though Harry hadn't told her, and any viewed memories of them didn't show that. However, someone who had read Harry's memories from start to finish could put 2 and 2 together and figure the rest out without breaking the contract. The waiter came and the group ordered some appetizers and drinks to munch on until their main order was ready. Scott was somewhat hanging on in the outward conversation as Harry and Jean both brought up various things about the X-Men and their training, so Scott figured it was okay to talk about those things. The only problem was that Scott was just a little too enthusiastic about one particular subject. Within Harry's mind, Emma blatantly asked, "Does Scott have a hard-on for Xavier or something?" Jean rolled her eyes and Harry chuckled. He answered, "Xavier has sacrificed a number of things to put himself into a position where he can help as many people as possible, including Scott himself. Scott admires him more than anyone else. In my opinion though, the professor gave up things he should not have, and the man is ignorant of the fact that he can be a hypocrite at times." Jean shook her head and said, "Yeah. Sometimes he'll discourage us from getting our hands dirty because he wants us to have a normal childhood, and other times when we are enjoying ourselves doing something childish, he reprimands us for our childish behavior." Harry turned to her and said, "You're just upset he doesn't allow food fights." "Food fights are awesome," she countered. "As long as I didn't cook it, that's fine." "Of course not, that would be sacrilege." Jean turned to Emma, who was quite amused by the conversation, and said, "Harry is a very skilled chef." Harry said, "There are better. This restaurant has chefs better than I am." Emma couldn't keep a smile from forming on her lips. She could not remember the last time she took part or even listened to such a warm-hearted conversation. Emma was a very skilled multitasker, so it was possible to converse with Jean and Harry in Harry's mind while taking part in the conversation at the table while also looking through Scott's mind. She found it interesting that Scott had been infatuated with Jean for some time but seemed to have completely given up on her, though he still cared for her greatly. All in all, she could not find any deception. She knew from Scott's memories that Harry was a very powerful mutant that could use telepathy, magic, and other skills. He was also ruthless to those he felt didn't deserve a chance, but he was very logical as well. Emma had gone over Scott's memory of that mission to rescue the orphans several times. She also knew Harry was a genius scientist who had unlocked the mass production of hard light technology. It didn't take a genius to figure out the direction Harry's company would go in the future and that he didn't need anyone's help. In other words, this evening really was just an invitation for friendship with Harry, along with an introduction to someone who would likely become the leader of the X-Men in the future. Emma was entirely unused to dealing with people who offered help and information so freely. On the table part of the conversation, Emma did eventually speak more of her own life. She had an older brother who she cared for, but he didn't care enough for himself. She had an older sister who cared for no one and seemed to have caused several staff members to vanish. Then there was her youngest sister who was in her rebellious phase, though with a father who cared only for his legacy and a mother who used alcohol to escape from the reality that was her life. Calling her younger sister rebellious didn't seem entirely accurate. Emma's older sister worried everyone on the table, but no one asked further on her, as it would be improper to ask for more than what was given, especially as the subject was likely not appropriate for dinner conversation and the waiters had delivered their orders by that time. Emma had much to discuss with Jean, both at the table and inside Harry's head. She was the first and only mutant telepath her own age she had ever met, and though they lived different lives, they had much in common. Emma did show interest in the occlumency practices Harry had created for Jean, and Harry offered to let her copy the material into her own head, which Emma was happy to accept. Within Harry's head, and around the time they approached the end of the meal, Emma said, "You know, my father will want to know what we spoke of. He seemed to be under the impression I would have you wrapped around my finger by the end of the date. He even gave me a copy of the papers you'd need to sign to sell your company." Jean laughed at that and added, "Harry's business partners cannot legally operate a business due to laws you'll never hear about. Harry owns everything on paper, but even if he signed away his ownership, nothing would come of it." Harry nodded and continued, "You can tell your father that Brilliance Incorporated will be expanding soon, which is why I cannot be persuaded to sell. You can also hint that I seem to possess technology that grants resistance to mental manipulations." Emma asked, "Do you have technology that grants resistance to mental manipulations?" Harry considered it and said, "I can probably put something together. Is there a way around it?" "Subtly, I suppose. Brute force could technically work but would alert the user. You seem pretty good at subtle though." She gave a smile that was not a smile at that and said, "Years of practice." Jean frowned and said, "If you do need help with something, don't hesitate to ask." She didn't like that someone like her was forced into a position to use her powers. Emma understood that Jean was being genuine but decided not to answer. She hadn't made up her mind at this point. Dinner had finished and no one cared for dessert or staying to watch the gathering crowd admire the ball drop. Harry was 15, and Scott, Jean, and Emma were all 16, so they did not order any wine, though the restaurant was known for it. Other than offering assistance, they didn't ask anything of Emma, and she had long since figured out why. They were basically trying to save her. You didn't need foresight to see what someone with powers like her would grow up to be in an environment like hers without assistance or friends. They were offering her a way out of that future she seemed destined to be in from the day she was born. When they parted, Harry gave Emma a rectangular compact mirror that was actually a disguised touchscreen cell phone and a wireless charger she could set it in. The contact list Harry programmed it with included Harry's, Jean's, and Scott's phone number, though the latter didn't know Harry would be giving him a phone later that night. The phone could not be bugged, tracked, or monitored, but he did recommend not using it to call others her father knew of if she didn't want her father learning of her possession of such a thing. Harry showed the use of a diamond to make a portal back to the institute where they had set up their own fireworks and were waiting until midnight to set them off. Harry explained to Scott how the cell phone worked and that it was a prototype his own company would be producing one day. Overall, Jean and Harry agreed it was an enjoyable date, though Jean did feel a little bad about Harry's trick against Emma. The watch Scott used set a ward inside his own brain that would prevent intruders from thinking of doing bad things to Scott while under the ward. So the entire time Emma was inside his head, she was being conditioned not to feel any urge to do anything that could harm Scott using the information she was learning from him. Harry countered that such a trick was the only reason he allowed Emma into Scott's head in the first place, and all he did was prevent her from thinking of ways to use him as a tool. He didn't do anything to make her think more of him, so anything she felt about him would be real. The fact that both Harry and Jean knew that the energy Scott produced was attractive to Shinix was left unsaid. Harry didn't consider it cheating in the same way he didn't consider how attractive many found his eyes to be cheating. Unsurprisingly, Forge went all out on the fireworks, and at midnight the sky above the institute could probably have been seen from the space station in orbit. With that, the year 2008 started, and for a while everything returned to routine. For the spring semester, Harry was released from his position as teacher's aide in all classes but Forge's and Dr. McCoy's. However, Harry had successfully installed a hard light platform in Forge's class and granted remote access to that system for Danger. Forge and Danger were able to make hard light demonstrations that showed off more than he ever could before, and Danger acted as assistant as she had nothing better to do during class period. Dr. Kinney likewise acted as Dr. McCoy's assistant in class, meaning Harry was suddenly left with a large amount of free time, and that was without counting the time turner. Eventually, Harry decided to act on his girl's advice, and with a camera and his own hard light platform, Harry started making teaching videos. Due to the autocorrect of his scholar path, Harry was perhaps one of the best teachers on the planet, so he was told to expand his audience. After several brainstorming sessions, Harry decided to make another website. Unlike the server for his magic website housed in Camartage, this server would be housed underground with the goblins. He'd make a fake server room and put it somewhere in one of his companies, but for the real one he would use the same tricks Forge taught him when making Danger's CPU. Over the course of 2 months, closer to 4 if you count the time turner usage, Harry had created over 1,000 videos on various math and science subjects. The main line of videos, however, went over Harry's new branch of science, metaphysics. You couldn't understand a thing if you just watched the last video, but if you watched them all sequentially you'd gain a surface-level understanding of what it was and how it worked. Of course, no one could truly learn a subject from a video, no matter how interesting. So each video also came with a little 20-question quiz at the end you could use to test yourself. If you got a question wrong, the site would tell you how to get it right, and the system generated problems randomly, so taking it repeatedly was actually a decent study method. Just for kicks, Harry wore a larger version of his Hogwarts robes and used a wand-looking stick when pointing at things, and would use his hard light holograms to cast magic-like effects using the stick. The videos included disclaimers, of course. Since he wore a collared shirt and tie beneath the robes, it actually looked very professorish, so he doubted anyone would give a negative remark. Other than the standard, "Aren't you 15?" comments. Harry had already invented his own magic keyboard that could type pure programming code far faster than a normal keyboard, so the longest and hardest part of setting up the site was the videos. In addition to his own videos, the site also allowed others to upload their own videos for others to watch. Another similar site, YouTube, had popped up a little over 2 years prior, and Harry wanted to replace it. When evidence that would reveal the magical world appeared, it was likely a video sharing site like YouTube would be the source, so if Harry controlled such sites, he'd be able to buy more time. Google bought YouTube not long after it came out, but Harry's servers would be far faster and more secure than YouTube's would. The only catch was that unless he built his own internet, he wouldn't be able to control the default search engine, directing everyone to his competitor. Thankfully, a number of goblins were getting very good at not just using computers for hacking, but making them as well. Once there were enough goblins capable of crafting his magic servers, Harry intended to spread their use around the world and become the hub of centralized internet usage. Ping. Business path has risen to rank 28. Harry smiled. That one was rising pretty fast these days. On March 5th, Harry launched the site, submitted his findings in metaphysics as a dissertation to a doctoral committee with McCoy's, Xavier's, and Forge's recommendation, and had some publishers he paid release his textbooks, which some stores and his website sold. Other than his scholar path raising by 1, nothing happened. This wasn't surprising. Even with world-famous geniuses like Dr. Hank McCoy, Charles Xavier, and Jonathan Silvercloud backing his paper, it would take weeks and months for others to check his findings, and once they determined he was not talking out of his ass, he'd be asked to defend his dissertation in person, and only then would his dissertation get published. The fact that McCoy and Silvercloud basically signed off on master's degrees for him through their own accreditation a week prior would probably cause a few heads to turn, but Harry looked forward to the faces everyone would make. For now he would wait. Harry didn't advertise his website, so unless someone searched for something and the website was relevant, no one would randomly get directed there. 2 weeks later, however, someone did notice. While Harry was in his study group with Jean, his own cell phone went off and he excused himself to answer it. The caller ID had a picture of Emma on it. Harry casually answered, "Evening, Emma. Same to you, I suppose. Interesting website, by the way. I'm surprised videoshare.com wasn't already taken as a domain name. It was. I bought it. Made a random dude very happy. Watch any. Your lesson on variable probability was certainly more interesting than my private tutors. In any case, that is not why I'm calling. Something wrong. Most likely. I am not sure if it has any relation with your site or something else, but my father asked me to contact you and get you to come out somewhere. He didn't say it directly and I cannot read his mind, but it sounds like in some way, shape, or form, you won't be coming back from where I am to invite you to. I suppose the fact that I haven't left the institute in 3 straight months would make any would-be kidnappers or assassins quite irritable. Indeed. However, my father is a member of a group called the Hellfire Club. They have muscle that is not easy to go against, and I believe there is a mutant within the club my father is asking assistance from." Harry paused and went over a few worst-case scenarios. Winston would not know he was a mutant but would know he had tech that could defend against telepaths. Xavier did a surprisingly good job of covering for his institute, and it was not anywhere close to public knowledge his school was for mutants. Emma had told them she was almost certain her father wasn't aware of them. Worst-case scenario should be a team sent to injure him in a show of force or a team to kidnap him for his tech. Worst case for that was that they were all mutants. However, they shouldn't be too powerful. Mutants at Sinisters or even the first X-Men team's level would not be grunts. Harry was tempted to go in alone, but he knew he would never be forgiven for that, even if he was immortal, and he knew he would not be able to talk his girls out of coming. That's right. There was someone else he could take who could provide assistance if everything went horribly wrong. Harry unpaused and asked, "You'll call me back on a line you know he is listening to, right?" "Of course. Can't let him know I have a private way to contact you now, can I?" "All right. Invite me to go clothes shopping. I'll refuse, citing that I am too busy, but you'll counter that you'll buy several swimsuits for the summer and want my opinion on the best one. I'll agree, of course, and pick you up from wherever, and you won't tell me where we're going until I get there. Then your father can tell whoever, they'll give you a destination and we'll be attacked either at the location or en route." "Wait, what do you mean pick me up? You can't drive." "Well, I know how to drive and do have my learner's permit, but I don't have a car. I'm sure you remember that Scott is 17 though, since you spent all of his birthday a few weeks ago together, so he'll be driving. You'll need to call him and tell him to invite me, Rogue, Jean, and Wanda as well. 6 is too much for a car, so that will get him to take the van we have, which happens to be armored." That sounds like a plan. What about the fallout from what my father learns his attempt was rebuffed by mutants you are associated with? He won't be pleased with me once he discovers I was unaware of that information. Tell him that everyone who I invited had a telepathy blocker as well, so you couldn't tell they were mutants." She sighed over the call and said, "All right, I can work with that." A few minutes later, Harry got another call redirected to him from his work line, and Emma invited him to go swimsuit shopping. Harry said he had a few other girls he wanted to invite, and Emma playfully asked if she was not enough for him. Harry said they were people he liked too much to leave the house without, and he wanted to see them in swimsuits as well. If one listened to the call in hindsight, it would seem that Harry had special bodyguards he paid to keep him safe, but that would only be obvious after everything happened. Harry told his girls, and Emma called Scott, though he wasn't given the details of the trap. Harry found the last person he wanted to recruit for this possible ambush lounging in the garden. "Hey Goose, I'm going to get ambushed tomorrow by parties unknown and likely kidnapped. Want to come?" The orange tabby cat-shaped Flurkin lazily looked over to Harry and conveyed, "Might as well. I have been getting bored lately." Chapter 47. Chapter 47, showing hell to the Hellions. The following weekend, Scott took the X-van out for a road trip. Harry used a bit of magic to hide the big red X on the side to make it look like an ordinary van, and along with Wanda, Rogue, Jean, and one Flurkin, they were driven by Scott to Massachusetts. Scott did ask Emma why she wanted Rogue and Wanda to come, as she had not met them, and she simply answered that Jean spoke well of them and she wanted to see them in swimsuits too. Scott also asked Harry, "Why are you bringing your cat?" Harry answered, "I haven't taken Goose anywhere in the time I've been in the States, and she has been getting bored lately. Don't worry. She isn't a normal cat. Is that why I've seen her hanging out with Lockheed?" Harry smiled but didn't answer. Eventually the van pulled up to where Emma was meeting them, and the blonde heiress hopped in and introduced herself to Rogue and Wanda. She told the group where they were going and gave instructions on how to get there. Emma informed Harry through telepathy, "I'm almost certain we'll be attacked en route. I don't suppose this van is armored, is it?" Jean answered back after eavesdropping, "It is." Harry asked, Did you find out what the goal is? Kidnapping, yours of course, but I'm not sure if my father asked for it or if you've gotten the attention of another member of the Hellfire Club and they asked him to arrange this. Jean confidently said, regardless, we'll be enough to take them. Emma asked, is that a cat? Harry answered, she does look like a cat, doesn't she? After a few minutes Harry's senses pick up on a few forms of energy. They were directed through a street which appeared to have construction work done and a man in what seemed to be a city worker's uniform and hard hat directed them through. After driving past, Harry said aloud, we're going to be attacked within the next couple of seconds. Do brace yourselves. Scott tensed and said back, I knew something was up. From the side a massive burst of green energy slammed into the van, tipping it over and putting a decent dent into the frame. Once the van stopped sliding, Harry paused and confirmed everyone was okay before he unpaused and asked, everyone all right? Jean sends a telepathic message to the group, Emma is fine but unconscious. There are several hostiles outside and they seem to be targeting Harry. She wasn't, but they didn't want Scott to ask why she wasn't participating in the fight. Harry says aloud, I'll get some info and draw them out first and then we'll go blitz tactics. Harry opened the van's side door, which was now above them, and paused again. While paused he hopped out and surveyed the area. He saw 3 people. 2 girls, one with short-cut brown hair and the other with shoulder-length blue hair. They looked around the same age as Harry's own group, and behind them stood an balding older man wearing a red shirt and a lab coat. The futuristic rifle-shaped sidearm he was holding looked moderately disconcerting, but he wasn't pointing it at the van. Instead he seemed to be directing the girls at his side. After confirming no one was likely to blow his head off for doing so, Harry unpaused and popped his head from the van and asked, I don't suppose this is a mugging, is it? The middle-aged guy in the lab coat chuckled and answered back, not quite, Mr. Potter. Get out of the van and follow me and your friends will not be harmed. Harry got out and both swiftly and smoothly removed 2 handguns from behind his back and said, you're going to need more than that to take me, you know. One gun was already pointing at the guy in the lab coat and the other pointing at the teen with the short-cut hair Harry sensed was the one who hit the van. The man in the lab coat smirked and said, my, how disrespectful. I'm Dr. Redman. This here is Serge, he said, pointing to the girl with the blue hair. And this is, what were you calling yourself again, dear? The brown-haired girl who hit the van sighed and answered, Negasonic Teenage Warhead. Right. That. And over there we have Cannonball. From behind the van came a loud smash of who appeared to be the guy in the city worker's uniform. He seemed to have shot himself into the air from where he was and landed just behind the van. The red-shirted villain continued, and Magma and Firestar. 2 more girls walked out from a nearby abandoned building. Harry felt one of them was filled with thermal energy and the other was actually saturated with microwave energy. And finally we have Taro, he said once more, gesturing to the side to a black-haired woman who walked out from behind a car and seemed reluctant to respond. Harry raised an eyebrow and asked, all this for little Olmi? What surprised Harry was that, with the exception of the lab coat wearing Redman, none of them looked old enough to vote, with the oldest looking about 17 and the youngest 15. Dr. Redman answered, honestly I was going to meet you alone, but my Hellions do need a chance to stretch their legs, so I thought this would be a great chance for some fresh air and exercise. The one called Taro added from the side, that and I couldn't predict anything about how this would end and he is a coward. That earned her a glare she nearly flinched at. Dr. Redman said, someone needs more training it seems. Luckily you'll have a training buddy. Now I won't ask again. Surrender dash. Harry fired 3 shots, 2 at Dr. Redman's head, 1 at Negasonic Teenage Warhead. Rubber bullets of course, however they were enchanted with a powerful stunner which should have knocked the targets out. Harry liked enchanted bullets because they traveled so much faster than cast spells and didn't look like magic from an observer's perspective. Jean and Wanda simultaneously jumped out of the van and took to the air. They had been in telepathic communication to discuss their plan of action since first contact and already had a formation in mind. Rogue was staying inside to protect Emma and to be used for backup. Less than a second after Harry fired and the girls jumped out, the aptly named Surge countered with a bolt of lightning which Harry had no time to dodge. What surprised every one of the Hellions was that Harry responded by firing several rubber bullets back at her instead of going down. Harry's magic and energy attack-based resistance was determined by his wisdom, which was over 40 times more than a normal human. Even a normal human can survive getting struck by lightning, much less Harry, who barely flinched. What surprised Harry though was that the lab coat wearing Redman and Negasonic Teenage Warhead didn't go down from the stun bullets. Harry could understand the latter, who seemed to be some kind of mutant gamma sorceress, if his senses were right, as magic was less effective on such people, but Harry didn't sense any type of energy from Redman and he hit that guy twice in the head. Surge wasn't getting back up because Harry got her 3 times in the head, which even without magic would knock her out cold. Jean used a powerful telepathic wave to launch Cannonball back to the end of the street and she floated through the sky after him. Wanda fired hex bolts at Firestar and Magma while Scott suppressed them with his optics beams. Watch or not, he never left home without his visor. Before Harry could unload the rest of his clip into Dr. Redman's temple or groin, 3 beasts that felt like real illusions materialized and pounced at Harry from the side. Taro had 3 cards in her hands which were glowing and seemed linked to the beasts. Harry shot them, but the bullets had no effect, forcing Harry himself to have to jump out of the way. He tried shooting Redman again, but this time a green energy shield was formed in front of him by the Gamma Sorceress with the excessively convoluted call sign. Harry paused to get a closer look at what was happening. He saw that Redman had 2 syringes next to him, implying he had just injected himself with something. If the man already had something in him before Harry shot him, that might explain why he didn't go down with the bullet stunners. To the side, Harry saw Jean was throwing things at Cannonball, but the guy seemed to have some kind of barrier over his body that prevented impact damage. That, however, was a cover as Jean was navigating the man's head, and once she found a weak spot she'd knock him out. Invulnerability doesn't stop telepaths after all. Magma seemed to be turning the street into, well, magma. And Firestar was shooting microwave beams at Scott, but the X-Man was holding those beams back with his own optics blasts. Magma, however, was also getting tripped up by Wanda as her hex bolts made the geothermal kineticist lose control of her powers, and Wanda herself was transfiguring various things around the pair to control the fight. Harry unpaused and Dr. Redman said, "So you didn't come alone? Well, you're still outnumbered and your bodyguards will make an excellent addition to the Hellions once I'm through with them. Take him out, girls." The expensive-looking rifle-type weapon Redman was carrying turned towards Harry and fired bolts of energy, while Negasonic Teenage Warhead fired gamma blasts and Taro ordered her beasts to attack. Harry did his best not to smile. These days he wasn't invited with the X-Men when they went to rescue a mutant or fight the Brotherhood, so he had accumulated a number of toys with no one to play with. Sure, he could just go all out, but where would the fun in that be? Harry dodged the incoming shots fired and blasts. Unlike lightning, which tracks its target and is far more difficult to dodge, Harry could easily dodge guns by pausing and checking the trajectory and unpausing. He could also sense the gamma energy, which moved far slower than lightning and wasn't difficult to dodge. Harry took a metal sphere out of his pocket, pointed it at Redman, and squeezed it. The hard light tech in the sphere created a hologram around the sphere which matched the exact appearance of Dr. Redman's head, hair, and face. Then it was set on fire. Then, in Dr. Redman's own voice, it started screaming. Harry threw the screaming on fire head at Dr. Redman, who foolishly looked into its eyes and saw his own face distorted in pain and horror, screaming in his own voice back at him. Dr. Redman jumped to the side to dodge, but the head did not fall. Instead, it continued to fly and turned around to make another screaming pass at Dr. Redman. Harry noticed Goose had hopped out of the van and was making her way over to Taro, so Harry started shooting Negasonic Teenage Warhead with more bullets. Her shield was holding up well, but she couldn't attack while defending, and Dr. Redman was running from his own screaming on firehead that was chasing him. Cannonball launched himself at Harry in a bad attempt at a sneak attack. The man's power seemed to generate an explosion at his feet to launch his invulnerable body like a rocket, so it was not compatible with subtlety, and though he was able to adjust his trajectory while in flight, Harry was still able to move out of the way fast enough to dodge. Firestar and Magma had started pushing back against Wanda and Scott. Firestar had used her own powers to superheat the asphalt of the street, and once it was molten, Magma was able to control it. At that point, Scott shouted, "Rogue, now!" Rogue flew out of the van and used Iceman's ice powers to freeze the molten ground back to solid state, and Scott used the chance to take Magma out with a well-placed optic blast. Jean started attacking Cannonball's mind, as he had actually lowered his guard against her when he targeted Harry, and she was not going to let the opportunity pass. What the hell is that? Taro, of course, was now enjoying the company of Goose the Flurkin. Goose's unspeakable mass of razor-toothed tentacle flesh were shredding Taro's monsters to pieces. Negasonic Teenage Warhead unfortunately looked to check what Taro was screaming at and was appropriately horrified by what she saw. Her shield wavered and Harry's bullets pierced through, and Harry got her twice in the temple, knocking her out as cold as her friend. Scott and Rogue were now suppressing Firestar, and Wanda was preparing to capture her using transfiguration. Cannonball had been knocked unconscious by Jean, who started going through the minds of the two Harry knocked out. Dr. Redman had got a lucky shot and destroyed Harry's toy and shouted, "You bastard! I was going to treat you well, but now I promise you that once I've gotten my hands on you that you'll never see the sun again." The man obviously had not gotten a good look at the state of the rest of his group. Harry felt some serious mad scientist vibes come off the guy as he took out another needle and moved to inject it into his arm. Harry shot it, of course, before the man could press the plunger. Though Harry wanted to enjoy playing for a bit, he was not going to let someone else control the battle with a stereotypical last-second drug-induced power-up. For good measure, he also shot the man's gun, which seemed pretty high-tech. "You bastard! Help me!" Dr. Redman looked over to where Taro was screaming. She was suspended in the air by one of Goose's tentacles and being waved around. Goose liked to play with her food, it seemed. Jean saw this and shouted, "Not her, Goose. Him." She pointed at Redman. Goose tossed Taro into a wall and knocked her out before she walked over to Redman, the various mouths at the ends of the grotesque tentacles snapping ominously in his direction. The lab coat-wearing doctor finally took a moment to assess the scene. Wanda had just transfigured some concrete around Firestar, and Scott had knocked her out. Rogue, Scott, Wanda, Jean, and Harry were all walking over to Redman along with the terrifying Flurkin. Instead of surrendering, Redman sneered and said, "Fools. Do anything to me and all the mutants you've just spared will die. Surrender or I'll kill them all right now." Jean said, "You can't hurt them with anything you have on you, and the explosives in their necks won't go off unless they receive a signal from your heart after it stopped. If you aren't around when your heart stops, nothing will happen." Harry smirked and said, "Goose, lunchtime." The mass of tentacles coming out from the cat's mouth whipped around menacingly and approached Dr. Redman from all sides. A look of horror formed across the man's face as it dawned on him he wasn't going to survive this. Scott also seemed to figure out what was going to happen, but before he could say anything, Jean seemed to send a mental message to him. Scoot gave the soon-to-be Flurkin food a hard look and then looked away, deciding not to interfere. Redman pointed his gun at the Flurkin and pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The magic in Harry's bullets fried whatever sensitive electrical components were within the gun, making it an expensive paperweight. Serrated tentacles wrapped around the man's legs, drawing blood as he struggled to pull himself free while shouting that he was lying before, that he was sorry, that he would work for them. No one moved to help as he started screaming hysterically. Goose then quickly yanked the man into her mouth, causing him to shriek like a little girl, which was then silenced as the jawed appendage closed and retracted into Goose's mouth. After a few moments of silence, Scott said, "So, definitely not a cat." Harry smiled. Goose conveyed through their familiar bond, sour, but not in a bad way. Jean explained to them what she had learned from their minds. The leader of the Hellions, Sebastian Shaw, used a machine called Multivac to find mutants. Unlike Cerebro, which used a telepath, Multivac used a mutant called Cypher who could mathematically predict things, together with Tarot who could use tarot cards to predict things. Multivac amplified their powers to find mutants for them to approach and recruit into the Hellions. Most were not aware of what type of group it was, and those who did not want to do bad things were persuaded. Dr. Redman was a chemist and engineer who used drugs combined with implanted explosives to ensure those who didn't want to stay didn't have a choice. From Tarot's mind, Jean explained that Shaw found that the growth of Harry's company was directly impacting Multivac's prediction capabilities, and they couldn't figure out why. The only way to fix the issue was to kill or recruit Harry, but they couldn't predict the outcome of any plan involving Harry, so they sent every one of their heavy hitters. Luckily, this entire group also included everyone who wanted to leave but could not due to the explosives. Others who wanted to stay were Empathy, who was a terrible excuse for a human being, and Cypher, who didn't mind doing terrible things as long as he got paid. The explosives seemed somewhat shielded against energy, which was why they didn't go off when the Hellions used microwaves, lightning, or gamma radiation. That also seemed to be why they didn't go off from Harry's bullet, which made him sweat a bit, as if they were not shielded then the teens' heads may have exploded when Harry shot them. In either case, Harry wouldn't use magic to remove them. It was better to take them all to Dr. McCoy. Emma was only pretending to be unconscious so she would have an alibi, so she was still laying in the van in an uncomfortable position waiting for the group to finish up. After some discussion in their minds, Harry decided to call the shopping trip off. He used a portal to take the girls and all the soon-to-be former Hellions to the Institute and called Xavier and Dr. McCoy. After Wanda used her magic to fix the road and the van, Scott took Emma to the hospital because that was something normal people did after someone was injured. Harry got a call later from Emma informing him that she called her father right after being dropped off at the hospital, and she told her father the story. She met up with Harry's friends who he insisted on bringing, and she didn't suspect anything because they were all around the same age, though they did have telepathy blockers as well. She was knocked out when the van was hit and woke up with Scott driving her to the hospital, and Scott told her they were attacked but not much else. She pleaded ignorance about anything that happened, including the fact that the Hellions were defeated. After Scott dropped Emma off, Harry had made a portal for him to drive the van through to skip driving back to New York. Scott was still under the impression Harry used diamonds to make portals, so he didn't question why he didn't use that to get there in the first place, though he did grill Harry on what happened. Dr. McCoy and Dr. Kinney easily removed the explosives from the Hellions and even flushed their system of drugs. Once they were conscious, Xavier had agreed to offer them a place at the Institute. From what Jean had told him, Sebastian Shaw's Hellions were under his own banner and were not truly a part of the Hellfire Club. Shaw was considered new money but was already in a high position in the Hellfire Club due to his Hellions and his machine that could predict the future, both of which were taken out as the ripples of Harry's influence on the future would make anything he saw useless, and the Hellions were the strongest force under his control. Shaw himself was a mutant as well, and not a weak one. He was strongest when facing energy attacks, as he apparently could absorb all forms of energy and use them to make his own attacks. He used this power to assert dominance over his Hellions to make them understand they could never defeat him. Harry wondered if he could absorb Phoenix Fire or if the latter would burn his power, his flesh, and his soul away for even trying. Harry could also just pick him up with telekinesis and gently toss him into a portal to the North Pole. Without the ability to fly or teleport, that was a one-way trip. The Hellions woke up surrounded by the X-Men and Xavier, who explained the situation. Unsurprisingly, they all started crying. What was surprising was that it was the only guy, Cannonball, who cried the hardest. Apparently he was a softie and couldn't stand hurting people. Harry felt they were still a bit too trusting and naive, as they all agreed to join the X-Men without checking them out first. Harry figured that was Scott's influence, as he was the one who stayed with the group and conveyed to them what the X-Men were. Jean told Harry to stay out of the infirmary as she didn't want any of the girls to get Nightingale syndrome over Harry for saving them, though she apparently didn't mind leaving Scott in there for the same fate. Harry figured once they found out Goose was his familiar, any chance of that was nil or less, but he didn't argue. Things got exciting for a while with the new arrivals, but once more calmed down at the Institute. On April 1st, Harry's tech company had launched 2 models of cell phones and cell phone plans for said phones. Both cell phones could be used nearly anywhere. The goblins were able to mass-produce crystal terminals housed in magically hidden spaces in various cities, which acted as cell towers with far greater range than standard ones. Each cell phone included an extremely tiny quartz which had its material physics altered by the knockoff sonic screwdrivers Harry showed the goblins how to make. The new properties of the crystal massively increased the range, and if they wanted, they could have it cover the planet. The only reason they didn't was because if they did they would have nothing to work up to. The first model was for calling and texting, and their plans were reasonably rated while keeping their competitors in mind. The second model, however, had a rudimentary touchscreen with limited data internet browsing capabilities, Wi-Fi capabilities, and a built-in link to video share. Future phones would be able to record videos and upload it directly to video share, but that was only after Harry had made a system to scrub the phones and sites of any videos that could endanger the secrets of the world if posted. Thanks to the existence of companies like Stark Industries, any newcomer to the tech world was thoroughly checked, and when the people who knew their stuff realized the physics behind the phone was impossible from their own understanding, things got interesting. Harry had of course included in the instruction guide links to his videos on metaphysics and references to his textbooks to explain how the phone's range could be what it was and why the phone was not hampered by being underground or even inside a Faraday cage. The fact that his phone seemed to even work while on an airplane really stumped a lot of people and got many talking. What really got people's attention, however, was that the phone's signal could not be intercepted, tracked, blocked, or monitored without the ability to produce the same type of altered quartz. Eventually Harry's dissertations were noticed, and in the middle of April, 2 weeks after Harry released the phones, he was asked to come to MIT to give his dissertation and defend it. The fact that he was already selling products which proved the physics behind his dissertation was left unsaid. For Harry, the best part was that every branch of metaphysics was useless without the sonic screwdriver. In order to use, measure, or even detect the new energies which Harry had shown existed, a material physics modified gemstone was required, and only Harry could make them. This meant only his company could use the magic-like technological advancements he was going to display. Harry fully expected people to buy his products in mass and take the stones to use for their own projects, but Harry had contingencies in place for that as well. He also made it illegal to use his phones for anything other than their intended purpose. That wouldn't stop people from doing so, but it would justify what he could do in response. Xavier, Forge, Dr. Kinney and Dr. McCoy, wearing his disguise watch along with a number of the students, went to MIT with Harry so they could watch him defend his dissertation. Harry gifted the teachers a free cell phone with internet access and gifted students with high grades the same under the condition they maintain their grades if they want to keep using the phone. The goblins had already mastered the art of the assembly line, so assembly lines crafted by goblins mass-produced flawless tech. The only problem that eventually popped up was that they found they would eventually be making more money than they had to pay their employees, and goblins did not accept anything but their own coin and did not work for free. After another boardroom meeting which left several goblins almost mortally wounded, it was agreed that 2 new forms of currency above the galleon would be created using Harry's altered gemstones as a base. The altered gemstones had great use in magic, as the goblins themselves were delighted to experiment with, therefore it was accepted as a form of payment for the thousands of goblins now working under the banner of Brilliance Incorporated and Potter and Gold Bank and Trust. Thankfully, goblins were just as interested in technology as mundane humans were, and thanks to Harry's servers they could purchase personal computers and cell phones themselves, meaning they were spending what they earned instead of hoarding it. Harry would later learn that many of the toxic players on the online video game communities were shamed and disgraced by the goblins who enjoyed playing online games. At MIT, Harry was met by a committee that wanted to show him around the place and squeeze a few questions in before the dissertation. Forge and McCoy led the students and staff off to show them around, and Harry was escorted to meet some VIPs. Harry didn't mind answering questions, getting to know the various geniuses of their fields, and exchanging numbers with many of the brightest minds in the world, including a few fellows sent by the government to ask for military contracts. Harry had no problem arranging a date for later discussion with. A number of notable names were not there, and Harry was slightly disappointed Tony Stark didn't show. That meant either the man had cracked Harry's tech and didn't feel like asking more questions, or he was off in his own little world and didn't even know the existence of Harry's tech. Considering what Harry heard of the man, he figured it was the latter. 15 minutes before Harry was scheduled to go up on stage, one of MIT's staff insisted he meet one of the key organizers for the dissertation. That wasn't a problem for Harry, but his watch getting a text message was. The message said, Bill and Ted BJ Cage, RBMK5. Double KO. Harry did his best not to tense at the message and politely followed the staff to an off to the side room the staff member showed him into, but did not enter before closing the door. Hello, Mr. Potter. I've heard a great many things about you. The woman walking towards him from the shadow of the room was an unmistakable beauty with sleek black hair that went past her shoulders and a sculpted face that was difficult to describe as anything other than perfect. It was a face Harry had seen before in pictures drawn hundreds of years ago, and though Harry sensed nothing from the woman, that meant little for someone as skilled as she was known to be. It was Selini Gallio. Chapter 48. Chapter 48, Harry vs. Selini. Harry reflexively paused to get himself together and not freak out. The first recorded sighting of this woman was more than 10,000 years ago, and according to the Ancient One, Selini had been a contender for the position of Sorcerer Supreme a number of times. Not that this meant she was a good person. The position of Sorcerer Supreme was given to someone who was strong enough to protect the world from mythical threats. Morales were not a requirement, and many a Sorcerer Supreme in the past were not people one would want to meet. Harry knew he wasn't going to like what was to come, but he still had to act as if he didn't know it. The text message he received at least made sense now. Harry didn't hold out his hand for a shake, instead he gave a respectful half-bow and said, I'm certain most of what you've heard about me won't do me any justice. So what is it you wish to speak of? The immortal gave a beautiful smirk and said, I'd like for you to sell your company to me. The telepathic command she gave to simply do as she said had all the subtlety of a wrecking ball. Harry snapped his fingers and conjured a chair behind him and behind her and sat down. No, I don't think I will, Ms. Gallio. Selini could not detect any mental protections within Harry's outstandingly organized mind, and yet her Chinook abilities had no effect. That, and the fact that he seemed to have just cast magic in front of her and she couldn't feel its presence, made her eyebrows twitch in surprise. Harry wondered when was the last time this woman was surprised and felt he should be a bit proud of himself. Selini turned to confirm the seat behind her was not an illusion and sat down before turning back to say, It appears my sources are woefully underinformed. Harry smiled back and said, Yes, I doubt they've informed you I've a student of an acquaintance of yours. Though calling her the Ancient One when she is a mere trifle over 9 centuries old is a bit much, don't you think? Selini's gaze quickly changed. There was no twitch or narrowing or eyes or movement, but she no longer looked at Harry like a predator would look at meat. She saw another predator. Continuing with the initiative, Harry continued, My company cannot be sold, so I'm going to politely request that we stay out of each other's way. You will gain nothing from going against me. Selini lightly asked back, Can your company truly not be acquired if I were to kill you? I doubt all of your employees would be so stubborn. Harry paused and considered this. Not her threat. Using telepathy on a goblin was not a great idea, and goblins had dozens of ways around magic-based mind control, both of which were irrelevant points, as no one would ever assume Harry's employees were goblins in the first place. No sane or powerful person would allow themselves bound by the contracts required to work with goblins. Harry always laughed at that and wondered if he was an exception or just insane. Of course it didn't matter to him. Sanity was highly overrated. No, Selini's point was that Harry's company not being in her control or not being destroyed outright was not an option for her. That meant she had something to lose if Harry's company continued as it was. Harry unpaused and said, I see. So you're the one who built Multivac. Selini's smile was all the confirmation Harry needed that the machine that could predict the future and the location of mutants was designed by her. That meant that Sebastian Shaw was Selini's minion, and the fact that Harry was affecting the future was affecting her as well. Of course, they seemed to be assuming it was Harry's company that was making the future harder to see, and not Harry himself. Selini also inferred a few things from Harry's accusation and answered back, So Shaw's toys are still alive, I see. Harry gave a curt nod. Information had to come from somewhere after all, so there was no point in denying it. Harry said, I can promise you that my death will grant you nothing. If I have unintentionally gotten in the way of any plans you have, then either adapt or ask for my assistance. As I said, you will gain nothing from going against me. You are making many assumptions. If killing you gives me nothing, then what about killing your friends? Your family? And I don't believe you have earned the right to speak to me as if you were an equal. If you know of me, then you should know your place. Harry sighed and raised a hand. He had already been chanting mentally for the last few moments, and at the chant's completion, a blood-red flame emerged in Harry's hand. Harry said, Now you are the one making assumptions. You think I care about them? What do you think will happen if I release this hellfire heart? I'm sure you can guess. Harry used his strongest occlumency and mental prowess to lock away his feelings for others and emitted only a cold indifference and apathy. Can't use hostages if the other person doesn't care about them. The Hellfire Heart was a spell Harry came up with after going through Belasco's book of spells. It used the principle of fiendfire, which was strengthened by Harry's knowledge of the Darkhold, and principles of hellfire Harry learned from the Grand Grimoire, which were strengthened by what he learned from Belasco's book of spells. Since the magic contained far more sources than just his own, Selini could easily feel it. And what she felt was uncontrollable. Once the heart was released, it would burn everything until it went out. At the moment they were at MIT and everyone there wanted to listen to Harry's dissertation. She knew that Harry had brought friends and professors with him. They were all die if Harry released that spell. Selini gave Harry a cold look and said, You're bluffing. Harry smiled and dropped the flame. Selini was absolutely certain Harry was bluffing, so she was stunned to see him release the spell and could only watch it fall to the ground. Harry teleported out of the room and the fire exploded into a torrent of black flame. Selini was fast, but she couldn't teleport, so she could only shield herself and watch as her barrier was smashed back through wall after wall as the tide of flames devoured everything. In the blink of an eye the entire building was devoured and she was thrown through the final wall outside. Blood red and black flames danced against each other as the entire grounds of MIT was reduced to cinders. Of course this was not the end. The black flames started flowing into themselves and formed a massive flame demon. The spell created the heart, and the heart created the flame. Once the flame was created, it would join the heart and the true purpose of the spell was shown, the birth of a massive hellfire fiend. Selini knew she had to get away. She gained nothing from fighting such a thing after all and didn't care that it would destroy the city. She could stop it, but that would require more resources than she would gain from doing so. However, the moment she looked away from the hellfire fiend, she realized she had been duped. In the sky above the city was another city. Look down. In the distance was another city that was aligned vertically from up to down. The room they were in had been taken into the mirror dimension without her being aware of it, and she was now trapped with the fiend. Selini glared at the massive beast of flames and lifted a hand in its direction and closed it. The beast felt what she was doing and looked over to her with its blood-red flaming eyes and roared, however the flame around it was vanishing, being put out. The towering construct charged at her but was losing height and strength with each moment. Before it could reach her it was shorter than she was. Selini bent down and blew at it, snuffing out the last of the flame. In the same moment, a glowing red longsword pierced through her chest from behind, destroying her heart. Selini instinctively threw out a psychokinetic wave to toss her now visible assailant back and in the next instant her wound healed. Harry steadied himself and said, "I heard you were good with fire but seeing it in person is really something else." Selini realized then that Harry had only pretended to leave her in the mirror dimension. She assumed that he was under the impression she would not be able to leave without a sling ring as even the Ancient One could not do so. She could of course and she had already sworn revenge against Harry for his trick but it turned out he was simply waiting. Selini answered back, "You've seen nothing yet. Fighting me in this dimension was a great mistake." Black sigils appeared in the air all around her and darkness coalesced into them taking the form of demons. In the next instant over 30 high-strength demons wielding weapons and armor forged of shadow had appeared. She pointed at Harry and said, "Capture him." Harry didn't move. Summoning was actually much easier in the mirror dimension though there was no way to move a summoned creature from the mirror dimension back into the normal world without cost so that was not a loophole. Once the demons were within range, Harry conjured a golden glyph which shot red chains into the chest of each demon. Most tried to block but the chains were ethereal and passed through their weapons, shields, and armors. Harry released the glyph and the chains vanished, but the demons didn't move. Harry smiled and said, "Attack Selini with everything you got." Selini was more than a little surprised when her summoned demons she spent her own life force to call had been taken out of her control and were attacking her instead. How could she know Harry had memorized the Grand Grimoire which contained both the Greater Key of Solomon and the Lesser Key of Solomon, books which had more information on controlling demons than any other. As long as it was a demon Harry knew about he would know a way or two to control it. He didn't know about them all of course and he couldn't control a demon in their own realm, but Selini's summons were ones Harry was familiar with so there was only one way for that to turn out. Selini cast multiple spells at the attacking armored demons and while she was distracted Harry used his dimensional energy to shift the space of the mirror dimension. Buildings folded out from the ground and changed the landscape as direction and gravity lost meaning. Selini's footing easily adjusted as she was also manipulating the mirror dimension to crush or separate the demons. She only needed to touch them to dissipate them so they were not threats to her if they did not attack all at once. In the next moment the building Selini was fighting on folds over at Harry's command and smashed against Selini. A breath later the entire building cracked and shattered into rubble floating in the directionless space with Selini floating in the center. An invisible Harry slashed against her once more with his sword and she flew back to distance herself and conjured her own sword. Harry matched her flying speed and slashed through her flesh over and over. At this point Selini realized she is slower than normal. Harry's strength is much higher than what she could wield but she could see that his speed did not reach her own, yet she was failing to dodge or parry his slashes and was taking more and more damage. She cast a wave of magic through herself and returned to her max speed, deflecting Harry's sword and throwing him back. She realized that the sword to her heart he initially struck her with had cast a slow spell against her and the spell had been refreshing with every slice of Harry's energy sword. Harry felt the impedimenta jinx he'd cast on her get dispelled and knew she figured out his trick. Harry's magic was undetectable so fighting while casting jinxes and invisibility spells was obvious. Harry's standard spells seemed to have no effect on her but when cast through his sword the spells worked as it was the equivalent of casting a spell through a wound instead of against the skin. Harry was going for the long fight. Selini's body had much in common with his own in that she was basically a bundle of flesh and magic held together by a massive life force. Much like a video game boss, she would not die until her accumulated life force, her health points, had reached 0. Harry had spells that could drain life force of course but draining life force was Selini's mutant power and the spells he tried had no effect on her as they were weaker than what the immortal could do naturally. Harry turned invisible again and moved to strike once more. Not wanting to be left on the defensive, Selini used her psychokinesis to freeze all the debris in the area around her in place. She could feel if any of it was touched so she could find Harry through that. Harry teleported some distance away when he felt what she was doing and took what looked like a gourd out of his inventory. Harry pointed it at Selini and used his own psychokinesis to pull the trigger within. Selini's head and upper torso exploded in a mass of blood and gore. A line of buildings behind her shattered outwards damaging the line of buildings to each side of them. The gourd contained a pocket dimension which contained a very long railgun Harry eventually crafted at Jean's nagging to make one. The bullet traveled roughly 20 times the speed of sound and were actually magically shrunken. The bullets unshrank to the size of a cannonball before it reached its target and the kinetic force could probably put a dent in the moon. This of course meant he couldn't use it on Earth. The mass of flesh reformed itself back into Selini with her clothes perfectly intact just as Harry reappeared behind her and slashed her once more. The bullet only did physical damage which was actually less than the magic damage Harry's sword strikes were dealing to her so after striking her again Harry teleported away and fired another round with his railgun. However instead of Selini turning into paste again, the path of the cannonball-sized bullet bent hard to the side the moment it was close to her. Harry sensed the spell she had just used and realized she had bent the space. Projectiles that moved using physical momentum would be turned away from her. Harry made note of that spell and reappeared in front of her and started slashing again. he couldn't give her time to breath or escape. Both were capable of flight, so the twisting buildings and mountains of rubble around them didn't get in the way. Selini took the next slash without blocking and sent a lightning bolt spell at Harry, which smashed him into a nearby building. Harry endured it and countered her next cast of lightning with a lightning rod spell he cast at the ground that caused lightning to be directed to that point. Selini tried holding him in place with psychokinesis, and Harry countered by making a film of psychokinesis around himself, which allowed him to slip out of any Shinnik grip she placed him in. Selini shouted, "Enough." 12 enormous purple glyphs appeared in the space around them, and Harry felt the space lock up, preventing him from magical teleportation. Selini conjured dozens of shards of black ice and pointed them at Harry before launching them forward. Harry threw a silver ring in front of him, and when it expanded, Selini saw her own back on the other side of the ring. She looked behind her to see a second ring had formed, and Harry used his own psychokinesis to speed up the shards of black ice to prevent her from blocking. Harry's portals had so many different types of magic in them, he had yet to find a way to block them, and even standard space locks could not do so. Selini dodged a few, but some of the black ice hit her and Selini's body instantly froze. Harry flew over to the ice sculpture and tried to place it in his inventory, but unsurprisingly, it didn't work. Harry could in fact put petrified non-magical animals in his inventory and hoped he could do so with a frozen person as well. The black ice exploded as Selini's flesh and blood changed into shadow. The shadow expanded and engulfed Harry before reforming into Selini. She had grabbed Harry's arm and smiled, then frowned. Her life force absorption ability was unable to drain anything from Harry. Harry knew the gig was up. She had only humored him with this fight because she knew once she touched him, she would win. Selini was a Shinnik vampire, and she could drain the life and will from her victims, turning them into her slaves. No matter how strong Harry was, once she had him in her grasp, she would control him. Or so she thought. Harry released the strength energy of Sidorak, his immortal dragon chi, and created his heavy eldritch sword. His single slash shattered Selini's Shinnik barrier and cut her in two, dealing many forms of damage. Harry didn't stop at one cut and sliced over and over. Selini's dismembered body parts shifted back into shadow, and Harry cast a non-verbal patroness charm, and a bus-sized dragon of light appeared within the shadow. The dragon exhaled its fire-shaped light breath and, from what Harry could tell, dealt serious damage to Selini. Serious damage being relative. If Selini had a health bar at 10,000, then Harry's total damage up to this point would be less than 1,000. Of course, Selini's magic and Shinniks also required her life force to use. Putting out the Hellfire Fiend used over 1,000 points, and the skills she used up to now also used up about 500. Of course, this meant that Harry had only forced her down a quarter of her total might, but his own magic was nearly empty. The Hellfire Heart alone used up more than 2/3 of his magic. Not that Selini could sense his reserves. Selini's shadow form turned back into flesh. Harry almost flinched at her look. She was beyond livid at this point. Selini spoke calmly, but her voice traveled through every inch of the mirror world. "I went easy on you because I wanted you alive. As you don't understand how to appreciate my kindness, it is time for you to die." Harry calmly answered back, "There is still much about me you do not understand. Just remember that I did warn you. You will gain nothing from going against me." Her eyes narrowed at that. She could tell Harry was referring to something, but she could not grasp what. In any case, it was time to end this. Harry could feel a significant portion of Selini's life force was suddenly being used. In the next moment, wave after wave of Shinnik force spread out from Selini. Every building and structure was shattered, and the space around Harry became nearly solid. Since she couldn't hold Harry, she held the space around him using her psychokinesis. The buildings getting wrecked around them was not done intentionally, but was merely a byproduct of the intense power she was using. Suddenly, another wave was expanding outward from another direction. Harry sighed and used load save. Harry's body turned to dust just as the wave reached the pair, and all concepts lost meaning. Solids turned to liquids and multicolored matter formed from nothing, and the outlines of structures blurred and bent. Selini's control over space was cut and caused a massive backlash as her Shinnik senses, which should have been able to passively scan everything around her, started ripping her own mind to shreds, as if the knowledge of the space around her was an attack against her own mind. Matter, space, and color blurred together and broke apart as the immortal's body crumbled and elongated. Every moment of existence dealt heavy damage to her, and anything she tried to defend herself with ended up dealing more damage to her. The bubble that engulfed her and caused this had engulfed the entire mirror city, which caused the view to look like something from a Salvador Dali painting. From the outside, the bubble had lasted only a few seconds before popping, but within where time and space had lost meaning, so it could not be calculated if Selini experienced moments, seconds, or minutes within. What could be seen, however, was that when the bubble popped, everything within turned to dust as reality re-established itself. Selini herself was nowhere to be seen. Harry's particles were able to shift from his existing position back to his save point even during the collapse of causality, as nothing about Harry's load save feature worked using logic or physics. Harry emerged inside a closet in his room back at the Institute. One benefit load save had over actually dying was that he did not drop a full level. If he was 80% of the way through level 100 and died, he would return to 80% of the way through level 99. Load save, however, actually would take him to 99% of level 99, just barely under the energy requirement threshold to restore his level. Thankfully, he had leveled up 2 days ago, so there was barely a waste in dropping to 99% of the previous level. Harry paused and went over his stats and the fight in his head. Harry Potter. Level 231 age 15. STR 300 AGI 310. Int 510 WIS 475. Luck 30. Warrior Path rank 29. Scholar Path rank 46. Magic Path rank 42. Tech Path rank 36. Business Path rank 30. Crafting Path rank 29. Dragon Path rank 12. Chinook Path rank 23. Rogue and Wanda would not stop nagging him to increase his luck, and since he was inventing more often he eventually relented and brought it up to 30. The rest of his skills and stats were more rounded out since Harry was a multi-class character with stackable abilities. That's why his Eldritch Sword did measurable damage to Selini when a normal sword would do almost nothing, and normal magic would likely not pierce through her magic defenses. Selini herself, if Harry had to give an estimate, would have been around level 400 with a Magic Path rank of 35 and a Chinook Path rank of 45. Unless Jean went full Phoenix Avatar, which had irreversible consequences, then Selini could be considered one of the strongest Chinooks on the planet, just behind Charles when he was boosted by Cerebro. Even if Harry used everything in his inventory, he had no way to kill her before she could run, which was why the only thing he brought out from his inventory was the railgun gourd. Harry could use powerful equipment to fight beings at higher levels, like when he killed Kyan Tang, but the Black Dragon fought him without flying and actually died when his heart exploded. For high-level immortals who could survive their hearts exploding, Harry could only fight them until they ran away and came back for revenge one day. The demon Enister was a good example. Harry wanted to deal as much damage as possible before she could run, which was why he didn't use Phoenix Flame. Harry didn't know if Selini survived the reality bomb or not, but it didn't matter. Records show that Selini was successfully killed around the 6th century and came back sometime later. Even if her store life force hit 0, she could still somehow come back. She wasn't called immortal for nothing after all. No, the point of the fight was not to kill Selini or make her flee, but to make her understand that she had nothing to gain from fighting Harry. If Harry wanted to make her flee without a fight, he would have summoned Phoenix Flames instead of a Hellfire Heart. Harry felt such a thing could permanently kill the immortal if used against her while she was in a weakened state. This time, if she survived, she would find out that Harry had survived as well, thus making her think Harry could resurrect or was immortal like her. Immortals tended to stay out of each other's way, so revealing this was the only thing Harry could do. Harry doubted she would recover the same strength anytime soon, so if she did show again, Harry felt with some prep and magic armor, he could finish her off. Since he didn't show her his Phoenix Flames this fight, she wouldn't know he could end her until it was too late. As for the reality bomb itself, it was something he needed to go back and plant. The text message he received, Bill and Ted BJ Cage, RBMK5, was the shorthand of a plan. In the movie Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, which he abbreviated to Bill and Ted BJ, they used a cage against the villain, which they set up by coming back from the future after defeating him with the cage. RBMK5 meant he needed to use the reality bomb Mark V, his strongest weapon capable of wiping cities from the map. Harry wouldn't consider the fight a win or loss. He had to use a reality bomb after all, and she was better built for a long fight than he was. Of course, Selini was far worse off. Harry could recover spent magic and levels, and the resources he lost in the reality bomb's use could be regained. Selini's health points were not recoverable with rest. She had to drain life force from others to regain her might, and that was not an easy thing for her to do without attracting attention. Selini was a mighty enemy, but her weakness was that she could in fact be defeated by numbers if she spent more life force attacking others than she got from draining her attackers. Harry unpaused and got out a time turner and went back 3 hours. He then opened a portal to MIT and another to the mirror dimension and found a place to set the reality bomb out of harm's way. He didn't need to arm it with a timer. This thing was dangerously unstable and would go off pretty easily, so Harry had to set up all kinds of protections around it. The immense Chinook wave Selini emitted at the end to finish him would be enough to break through the protections and set the bomb off. Next, Harry found the room Selini intended to meet him in and created a portal to the mirror dimension in the doorway and spent some time hiding it. He concealed himself and waited there while maintaining the portal, whose silver ring was hidden in the wall, roof, and ceiling of the door frame. Selini eventually showed, and Harry held his breath and presence with every wizard magic he could think of. Selini wasn't expecting an ambush, of course, so she entered the room through the door after hypnotizing one of MIT's staff to bring Harry to her. The concealed Harry from the future then sent the text message to the current Harry, who shortly afterwards was led into the room where the door was shut. Harry cancelled the portal once the door was closed and walked over to the hypnotized staff member. Harry wasn't the type who invaded every person's mind to tell if they were controlled or not, so he hadn't seen that this woman had no idea what was going on. Harry used telepathy to release her from the weak hypnosis Selini had over her and asked, "Excuse me, I seem to have gotten lost. Can you direct me to where the stage is for the dissertation?" The woman shook her head for a moment and asked, "Mr. Potter?" "Of course, right this way." Harry met a few more of his fellow nerds and geniuses who wanted a few words with Harry he was happy to share. When it was time, someone went on stage to quiet the audience and get them ready. Once called over, Harry walked up on stage. He was tempted to imagine everyone in their underwear, but far too many members of the audience were older men. In fact, with the exception of his girls and some of the students from the Institute and from MIT, most of the audience were older men with many a bald spot scattered throughout the seats. A cinematic projector lit up the wall behind him, showing the slides he had prepared to introduce the basics of metaphysics. Although on paper Harry was 15, 6 weeks shy of his 16th birthday, Harry's 6-foot stature, well-defined muscles and healthy frame could easily pass for someone in their late teens in casual clothes and early 20s when he wore professional attire. His confident gaze prevented any member of the audience from thinking he did not deserve to stand there. Electricity, as we think of it, is a property of the electromagnetic spectrum. Now, imagine there is a planet out there that through some quirk, does not have a single ferrous metal on that planet. No iron, no copper, silver, or gold. Nothing that could conduct electricity or could turn into a magnet. Imagine if some form of life existed on that planet. Now imagine explaining electricity and magnetism to that species. Could you do it in a way they would understand? Not really. You would need to reference ferrous, electrically conductive metals. Such materials are how we interact with the electromagnetic spectrum. Harry had several slides which showed magnets, copper wires, and semiconductors to illustrate the point. Harry continued, metaphysics is the study of other spectrums of energy previously unknown because we did not have any materials that could interact with them. Such materials do not form naturally on this planet, and it was only within the last year that a means to synthesize materials that could interact with these spectrums was discovered by me. Several hands rose, of course, to no doubt ask what these processes were and where Harry discovered them. Harry certainly was not going to tell people he met a Time Lord and spent centuries studying his sonic screwdriver to figure out how to use sound to alter the material physics of nearly anything. Hold your questions until after the lecture, please. There are questions I am going to answer and questions I am not going to answer, so asking either at the moment would be a waste of time. At the end of the lecture I am going to hand out 10 packages which include several samples of these materials which I'll be calling metagems, and instructions on how to use them to interact with the fields I am going to go over. Harry would of course tell everyone that he expected the care packages to be returned and he expected many of them to be stolen or lost. Each metagem had a spell which combined the port KS spell and the switching spell to make a long-distance switch. After the designated time, the metagems would be swapped with identical gems which had not been processed with the sonic screwdriver. There was also a spell that would destroy the gems if they were damaged, so if someone tried to scrap any off, the gem would break and its properties would be lost. Not that scrapping any off would let someone make more. It was possible if you knew how to use a tiny bit of a gemstone and use it to grow more. Using such a process on Harry's metagems would either not work or cause them to turn back into normal gems. Harry's dissertation was about 2 hours long, and the only reason it was so short was because much of it referenced material he included in his textbooks, and the dissertation was just a sample to prove that he wasn't talking out of his ass. Once it was over, Harry told everyone how they could get one of the 10 sample packages. Any group with research purposes may apply to receive one of the packages. The group, however, must have a history of at least 10 years and sign a form stating that all samples must be returned in the same condition they were given in 2 months, no later than June 17th. They must also agree to the penalties of losing any sample in the care package. Those who cannot agree to such penalties should not bother to apply for any of the samples. You must also sign an agreement that any and all findings from studying the samples must be openly published. The sample package included 7 metagems and showed how to use them and what they could do. For example, a material physics altered quartz could be used to interact with the astral plane. Altered quartz was actually how Harry's cell phones worked. They transmitted info through the astral plane, which was why they could bypass physical barriers and distance. Harry used some tricks he learned from Lockheed about astral tech to make the signal undetectable in the astral plane without specific tools. If he didn't, then astral travelers would be able to intercept the signal or would just be bothered greatly by it. They could even block those signals in the astral plane if they knew it was there. The fact that Xavier has not said anything and many of the students had cell phones meant the concealing part had worked fine. Other pieces in the package were an altered ruby that could channel strength energy, an altered sapphire that could channel ice energy, an altered tourmaline for fire, heat, and light energy, an altered emerald for illusion energy, an altered opal for cloud and mist energy, and an altered diamond for dimension energy. Of course, Harry didn't show it off as sorcery, even though that was basically what most of them were. He used scientific jargon and called the effect phenomenon, and showed charts and graphs and numbers explaining how each energy field interacted with the world. Of course, not calling it magic didn't stop people from recognizing how unbelievable it all was. No one in the lecture hall would argue that if all the properties shown by those materials were possible, the world would change. A number of groups did not apply for the packages either because they couldn't afford the penalty fees from losing them, or because they were smart enough to realize the possibility of them being stolen and their security wasn't enough. Harry somewhat rushed through the rest of the meetings, and once the day was over he headed over to Camartage to give the Ancient One an update. After tea, the Ancient One summarized, "Overall, I cannot say you could have done better. Using a self-generated time travel loop is disturbing and there may be consequences in the future, but having tricked her into the mirror dimension and dealing so much damage to her to the point of possibly killing her physical form is a worthwhile feat." Harry had not left out anything about the conversation they had and the fight that followed, including the spells he used and how she responded. He knew that some part of him may have wanted to be praised a little for getting one over on Selini the Immortal, and he did smile at her assessment. Harry did not consider himself a hero, but he was of the mind to keep the collateral damage caused by him to a minimum when he could. The Ancient One continued, Selini is not the only person of power you have drawn the attention of. Does the name Jean Khan, of Khan Industries ring a bell? Harry nodded, CEO of one of the largest, most advanced, nastiest tech companies of Asia. The Ancient One continued, Jean Khan is the given name of the Mandarin. Harry froze for a moment and sighed. He did in fact give his name to that guy and showed his face. Although they were literally on the other side of the planet from each other, that didn't mean there would not be any interactions. However, he accepted that he would have come to head with such a person eventually, so it didn't matter. The Ancient One then pulled out the cell phone Harry had gifted her, and after a moment handed it to Harry. The phone was on the Mystic Knowledge website the temple hosted and seemed to be a post on the forum with some pictures of old texts. The Ancient One asked, do you recognize this? Harry recognized the script of course, and the content was more than a little disconcerting. Harry answered, pages from the Book of Erebus. Scripts about the blood god La Magra. Where did this come from? Ping. New quest, stop the rise of the blood god. Vampires are plotting the resurrection of La Magra. Stop the ritual or defeat La Magra. The Ancient One didn't see Harry get the quest and said, it was posted by someone in New York. I believe his name is Whistler. Chapter 49 Blood and Blade. Harry read over the post a few times. Whistler had posted a picture of some ancient parchment which appeared to be from the Book of Erebus, the Vampire Bible. He was asking for expert on the matter to assist with the translations, and it had only been posted a few hours ago. Harry told the Ancient One he got a quest, so she asked, would you like any backup? Harry considered it but answered, no. La Magra can turn humans into vampires with its mere presence if some of the things I've read are true. I don't have actual blood, so I should be safe, but I can't guarantee anyone but you would not be affected. And her needing to stay at Camartage was left unsaid. The Ancient One's body was not exactly alive due to the presence of energy from the dark dimension. If removed from her body, her blood would rapidly age to dust, and a blood transfusion into her would do more harm than good, which was why she had to be careful in combat. The Ancient One then said, then I expect you to call me if you cannot handle it on your own. Harry agreed of course, and after using some means to track down the IP address, he used a portal to take himself back to New York. What he found however was just a routing box someone hacked into, so Harry had to take out some hacking tools of his own to track the physical location of the IP address. 5 minutes later he found it. The system was rather old, which, oddly enough, was a great anti-hacking measure as old stuff takes longer to hack than new stuff. Harry tracked the IP address to a warehouse and concealed himself. The warehouse smelled of metal, gunpowder, and blood. Fresh blood. He teleported in and found it seemingly silent of life. There were fresh corpses strewn about from what looked like an assault squad that had raided the place no more than an hour ago. The fact that their bodies were not recovered was a clear indication of the alignment of the corpses. In the center was a workstation with a chair. There seemed to be a man sitting on the chair covered in blood. To the side of him was a gun. Harry used several spells on the man and found a number of things. First, and unsurprisingly, there was a bullet hole in his chest. It entered one side and went out the other. The next thing he found was that even before the bullet, the man was severely lacking in blood. He was covered in bite marks and claw marks, and his face looked like someone had taken a baseball bat to it, repeatedly. The last, and probably most interesting thing he found, was that the man was not dead. Not completely anyways. This man appeared to be Whistler and Harry's only lead on the blood god. He was obviously attacked by vampires and left barely alive. He then shot himself, probably with a silver bullet, but the bullet went through the other side and he had yet to completely turn. There were two types of vampires to Harry, magic vampires, and non-magic vampires. Magic vampires were vampire witches and wizards, and stronger in some senses and weaker in others compared to Muggle vampires. Magic vampires were not mortally affected by sunlight and could survive minor exposure without harm, though long-term exposure would make them extremely sick and kill them eventually. They were not harmed by garlic or silver, though they did have a strong aversion to it. Magic vampires also had better control over themselves and required blood less frequently, which was why, though considered dark creatures, it was illegal to hunt magic vampires. Since they did not instantly burst into flame upon contact with sunlight, they were not considered threats to the statue of secrecy. Magic vampires also had to follow interesting rules, such as they could not enter a house uninvited. They were also incapable of turning someone else into a vampire in the presence of a heavy garlic smell, and had issues crossing running water or setting sail from the sea during the changing of tides. However, a magic vampire could only turn a witch or wizard into a magic vampire. Their bite had no effect on muggles. They were also only marginally stronger and faster than a normal magical and could not have children. Most magic vampires hunted only muggles and used memory charms to hide their activities. Since they weren't a great danger to witches and wizards, only muggles who they usually didn't kill, they were not considered a great threat to the magical communities. Magical vampires also aged at about the same rate at witches and wizards, so they were not immortal and not considered all that different from uninfected witches and wizards. Non-magical vampires were different. They had many weaknesses but were physically much stronger and faster. They did not have to follow any rules either, so breaking into a home and killing everyone wasn't difficult for them. They stopped aging once infected and could sexually reproduce. Their children aged to adulthood before they too stopped aging and were considered pure bloods. Either type, turned or pure blood, could spread their vampirism to any muggle who survived their bite. Should a muggle vampire bite a witch or wizard, said magical would lose their magic and turn into a muggle vampire. Solely because of this, the magic community had one policy on muggle vampires: exterminate on sight. This policy, when compared to magic vampires, really showed that magic communities only really cared about their magic. Harry took a vial of elixir of life from his inventory and poured it down the man's throat. The elixir didn't technically heal people. It used life to remove death. This meant it was also a handy cure to most things. It shouldn't heal muggle vampirism, but the man was still, just barely on this side of human, and his wounds had not started healing yet. Harry smiled once he sensed the man's life return. The vampirism was eradicated and the man's wounds were closing up. Some of his wrinkles smoothed and an old injury in the man's leg also appeared to be healing. Once the man was no longer mostly dead, Harry pressed a finger to the man's forehead and read his memories. Once finished, Harry paused and looked over what he had just read. Overall, he was impressed. Technically, Whistler was a murderer and could be considered prejudice against another race. Harry wasn't going to hold that against him though. Harry didn't consider himself a saint either. What was most interesting was this Blade character. From what Harry could tell, Blade was a Muggleborn whose mother was bitten by a vampire. Because of that, somehow, Blade was a hybrid. Part Muggle vampire, part magic vampire. Harry didn't know if he could cast magic, but he had no doubt his blood was special. He had complete immunity to sunlight and no aversion to garlic or silver, which even magic vampires couldn't say. According to what Harry read on the situation, some Muggle vampire named Deacon Frost was going to resurrect the blood god. Such a ritual would not work without magical blood, which was why they needed Blade. Deacon and his minions found the warehouse and kicked Whistler's ass and took a woman named Karen. Karen had, surprisingly, figured out how to cure non-pure blood vampires. She had been bitten and had cured herself. Blade knew it was a trap, but still went after her. Harry ran over to a DVD player in the shop that already had in it a DVD that Frost had left for Blade to watch. The video showed the address of a penthouse Harry didn't recognize. Instead of pulling up a map of New York, Harry went over to the workstation Karen had set up and found some of her blood. Harry used a tracking spell to lock in on her location and made a portal. On the other side was Karen, lying on a couch with a handkerchief on her neck. She looked quite shocked at the portal and Harry just asked, "Where's Blade?" She apparently got over her shock quite quickly and said, "Downstairs killing vampires." Harry shrugged and pointed to the portal behind him. "That's Whistler's warehouse. Get out now and I'll help Blade." Harry didn't have time to argue, so he put a light compulsion spell on the woman to get her to leave. Harry read her surface memories as she walked past him and saw that they already got Blade's blood and she had given him lots of her own to get him back on his feet. Harry also cast a discreet diagnosis spell on her and confirmed she had Muggle vampirism. Did that mean that Blade could only transmit Muggle vampirism, or could he turn a wizard into a magical vampire? Harry supposed it didn't matter. No one would ever volunteer to test that. Harry ran down the stairs and saw the bodies of dead humans and the ash piles of slain vampires. Harry didn't care about the humans as they were certainly vampire servants. Such people considered themselves future vampires and stopped considering themselves humans, meaning they could look down on and treat humans as disposable. If they didn't consider themselves humans, Harry had even less reason to care about their deaths. Harry cast a few stealth spells that rendered him invisible and hid his smell. The building was a penthouse from the outside, but the inside had been heavily renovated with cut stone into an exact replica of a ritual chamber. Harry admitted whoever built this thing wasn't an amateur, and if he wasn't dead by dawn he'd need to find him. Harry peered over a ledge and saw the center of the ritual formation, which had a pale vampire saturated in high-level necromantic energies watching a black vampire with an interesting magical signature dust his way through groups of other vampires. One look at the pasty vampire told Harry this was not going to be simple. He immediately conjured a mandala of dimensional energy and started casting a heavy barrier spell over the site. One bonus from a working ritual room was that it was compatible with lots of other spells. This one would prevent anyone from leaving until Harry dispelled the barrier or was killed. Blade finished off the last vampires and Frost took up a sword. Blade charged forward to meet him blade to blade as Harry watched from above while continuing to cast his barrier spell. The sound of metal echoed through the ritual stone chamber was each rapid clash of their weapons. They moved faster than the human eye could follow, and Blade was on the losing end of speed but was gaining ground through skill. A feint that turned into a parry removed Frost's arm, but in the next moment it grew back. Frost's speed suddenly magnified and Harry cringed. At the moment, Frost was still in control, but the more time went on and the more of the blood god's power he used, the less Frost there would be. Harry put in a bit more magic into speeding up the barrier spell. He'd be needed soon. After being knocked down, Blade threw his sword into the crack of a stone wall that had some vials Harry recognized lodged within. The sword handle snapped open using a clever mechanism, and the rock holding the vials cracked and allowed Blade to catch them as they fell. Frost didn't seem worried about the vials and referred to them as Blade's serum. Harry knew what they were from the info he got from Whistler and knew what was going to happen. Blade threw vial after vial at Frost of the anticoagulant compound, and after a moment the human form of the blood god had swollen to massive proportions. Harry heard Blade calmly state, "Some motherfuckers are always trying to ice skate uphill," before he did a flying roundhouse kick to shoot the last vial straight into the bloated god's forehead. The swollen mass grew larger and redder until with a painful groan of Frost's it burst open and showered the room in a mass of blood. Harry sighed and shouted down to the vampire hunter, "Hey, You didn't think it would be that easy, did you? Blade looked up to the unfamiliar 15-year-old wizard pointing at the bloodstains on the wall. Harry was thankful he completed his barrier spell. The real fight was about to start. The puddles of blood had Blade's attention and he watched as they started wriggling. Harry heard the hunter utter a curse as the blood shot up into the air and formed a wriggling ball of blood. Harry jumped down from the ledge several stories and landed with a crouched fist to the ground and a crack of stone beneath his feet. He figured the hunter might give him some respect if he made an entrance. Harry was wearing a basilisk hooded cloak to make himself look a bit more professional. The t-shirt and jeans he changed into after the dissertation would not leave a reliable impression. Blade apparently wasn't the type for small talk, so he motioned to the massive rippling ball of blood floating in the center of the ritual chamber and asked, "And you have a better idea?" Harry conjured some golden eternal fire and said, "I might." He enlarged the inextinguishable fire and from within dozens of small birds and large birds composed of yellow flames flew out and into the blood mass. Harry expected the eternal fire to incinerate the blood, but the firebirds that flew into the blood ball were engulfed and went out. Blade looked over to him and raised an eyebrow. Harry awkwardly admitted, "That wasn't supposed to happen." Streams of blood poured in from various corners and floors of the building. Harry recognized their paths as those from the human corpses he had walked by. Harry said, "You certainly killed a lot of familiars." Blade answered smoothly, "It's what I do." Harry rose a hand into the air and started building up a charge of lightning. His hand started to glow and crackle with electricity, and in the next moment Harry fired an enormous bolt of lightning into the blood ball which pierced through to the other side. And did nothing. Blade looked unimpressed and added, "Can you do ice?" Harry sighed and called forth icy energy from Inithalan's realm. He conjured a dozen ice spears of various sizes and shot them into the blood ball. And nothing happened. The ball had finished collecting all the blood in the building and was now squirming and molding itself into a solid shape. Harry pulled out potions, poisons, and acids from his inventory and threw them at the blood mass with no effect. Harry tried transfiguring the blood into something else and tried alchemy, but neither had an effect. He tried pulling it into an expanded bag with telekinesis, but it had no effect. Harry was getting pissed and shouted, "Do you think this is Dungeons and Dragons? Are you a god or a news? What other species is immune to fire, ice, lightning, poison, acid, and Shinix you knock off?" That earned Harry a slightly amused stare from Blade. Harry concentrated his anger and summoned Phoenix Fire. This took too long to create for a fight and was too slow to shoot, but the god had yet to finish his transformation and was still just floating there. Harry created the largest batch of Phoenix Flame he could and launched it at the blood god. The blood seared and a shriek of pain could be heard. The blood successfully caught on fire, but only the surface. All parts of the blood that were ignited were thrown off the blood god, which decided to stop taking its time and quickly finished its transformation into a giant creature seemingly composed of bundles of thick, crimson vines Harry knew to be densely packed volumes of blood. It looked like a giant bundle of veins of various sizes given a bipedal form. Blade readied his sword, and at the moment the creature formed, he sliced at the creature's side. The sword passed through without difficulty, but the wound closed up in the next moment. The creature opened its eyes and shouted in a razor-edged voice, "Blade." Harry figured this meant Frost was still in there. The blood god avatar moved far faster than would be expected from its size, and the grotesque appendage it used as an arm stretched and quickly wrapped around Blade's torso and began to crush him. Harry cast a slippery spell on Blade which made the surface of his body frictionless, though Harry left his hands and feet unaffected. This allowed Blade to use his strength to slip free as Harry tried to distract the blood god by shooting the avatar's eye with some bullets from his magic gun. Blade got some distance and Harry shouted, "I've been wailing at him for 3 minutes and the first thing he does is attack you? Where is the love?" The blood god finally noticed Harry and said with a blood-curdling voice, "Human, you serve me now." He emitted a red aura which engulfed the ritual room and spread out to engulf the whole building. Harry felt it stop at his barriers though. Ping. Status effect, instant vampirism negated due to Obscurus body. Harry threw a silver ring behind the blood god which expanded into a massive portal into black space. Harry then pulled out his railgun gourd and pulled the trigger. The blood god exploded and the bullet traveled through the silver portal behind the blood god into the vacuum of space Harry set as the destination. The nature of the portal prevented air from getting sucked through it into the vacuum, so Harry used his telekinesis to push the scattered drops of the blood god through the portal. However, the moment the first drop reached the surface of the portal where it should have been sucked into the vacuum, Harry felt the portal shatter. He suddenly felt like he had been electrocuted from the backlash. It was common sense that powerful magical beings could not be forced through portals, but he hoped the blood god was an exception. Turns out nope. He can trick powerful beings into walking through a portal themselves, but he couldn't push them through. The blood drops converged and almost instantly the avatar reformed and was looking rather pissed at Harry. Blade used the moment where the god's attention was not on him to cut several times through its legs to disable it for a moment. Blade asked Harry, "That fire which hurt the fucker, can you make it again?" Harry knew he was referring to the Phoenix Flame. The backlash from the collapsed portal would make it difficult to cast magic for a moment, but Shinix were not an issue, it just took a while. Harry said, "Yes, but it will take a few seconds." "He's not going to just stand there and take it though." Blade asked, "Can you use it on my sword?" Harry smirked, "Now there's an idea. Keep him distracted." Blade ran over to continue pissing the god off and impressively dodged the monster's high-speed attacks. Harry opened his inventory and got out a goblin silver sword of his own design and started coalescing phoenix flame into his hand. He didn't know if this would work, but he figured this blade would last longer than the silver-coated sword Blade was using. Goblin silver was far stronger than normal silver after all. The blood god realized Blade was a distraction and that Harry was up to something, so it pointed all its appendages at Harry and they shot forward like spears. Harry wondered why the monster hadn't been doing so all along and apparat to the other side of the room and continued gathering flames. His barrier prevented others from escaping, but he could still make portals and teleport as he pleased. Once Harry had enough fire, he placed it onto the goblin silver edge and threw the sword to Blade, who jumped into the air and caught it with ease. The sword had natural enchantments on it to raise the user's speed, and Blade turned into a blur. The glowing flames of the sword created a path of light as Blade zigzagged around the blood god and slashed into its form over and over from every angle. Within 3 seconds from grabbing the sword, Blade had cut the blood god 20 times, leaving trails of burning blood over every inch of its body. The blood god tried in vain to separate itself from the flames, but more and more flames continued to be added with each slash. Finally realizing this was not going to end well, the blood god did what all-powerful evil villains do when it looks like they were going to lose. It ran. The phoenix flame couldn't permanently kill the actual blood god who had simply been resurrected into this avatar, but it would certainly do real damage to it, and the lingering remnant of frost which insisted on killing Blade was smothered from the blood god's instincts, forcing him to give up the fight. The blood god's form elongated and stretched into that of a spear coated in phoenix flames and quickly charged into the wall to pierce through, only to smash straight into the barrier. Harry couldn't help but smirk. This was the difference between power acquired quickly and power acquired properly. Frost was instinctively using the properties of the blood god pretty well for defense, but didn't know the first thing about using godly energies to attack. He was ignorant of magic, and since the barrier was tied into the stone of the very ritual room used to create the blood god, it was very effective against it. This was not exactly a coincidence. Harry doubted it was written down in whatever Frost used to make this room, but most ritual summoning chambers doubled as containment chambers. This ritual room really was well done and could be used for both. Blade caught up to the blood spear, still smashing into the barrier in a panic, and Blade launched himself forward, cutting the entire spear-shaped mass lengthwise in half. He then noticed the sword's hilt had caught fire and threw it before Blade himself was taken by the flame. Harry created several Chinook barriers around the dying avatar and performed a few detection spells to make sure none was missed. It was a shame they killed it with Phoenix Flame, as that meant there would be no experience points since Phoenix Flames burned everything into pure life force, but he would at least have something to collect. Blade asked, "Why didn't you turn?" Blade knew that La Magra could turn humans into vampire minions instantly, and Harry smelled human. Harry answered easily, "I'm made of stronger stuff. Speaking of turning, I found Karen upstairs when I got here and used a portal to send her to Whistler's warehouse. So she wasn't here when La Magra here used his aura. And what are you?" Harry smiled, "A rich guy with a hobby." The final embers of Phoenix fire burned the last bits of the blood god, and Harry heard the sound he was waiting for. Ping. Quest completed. Stop the rise of the blood god. Reward, +2 magic path rank. Harry smiled at the reward. His magic path rank jumping from 42 to 44 was a very large increase in skill for him. It was getting really hard to increase path ranks after 40, though in retrospect the difficulty of the quest deserved that reward. Frost was like a noob using a level 99 character for the first time, but the longer he fought the stronger he would get. If it were for the non-standard effect of Phoenix Flame combined with Blade's excellent sword skill and quick thinking, that battle would not have been so cut and dry. He probably would have hidden in a corner and called the Ancient One for backup. Harry dispelled the barrier and collected the life force. Blade noticed the glowing glyphs on the wall which shined when La Magra smashed into it fade away. Harry said, "I want to check on Karen to make sure she is alright." With that, Harry made another silver portal into Whistler's warehouse and walked in. Blade followed once he confirmed the scent of the place. Harry felt Blade and Wolverine would get along very well. Harry could tell Blade wanted answers, so Harry said, "I'll answer your questions after everyone is here." Karen shouted from another room in the warehouse, "Over here." Blade led on and Harry followed. Karen was at the same workstation Harry got her blood from and seemed to be using whatever she had developed to cure her infection once more. Harry definitely wanted to speak with her about that. Blade. What the fuck happened? For the first time since Harry met him, Blade showed some actual surprise when Whistler walked over. He had changed his bloody shirt and gotten himself cleaned up. He was no longer limping and even seemed a few years younger. Yet Blade could tell he wasn't a vampire and that Whistler himself had no idea what was going on. Harry said, "That was me. Sit down and I'll tell you what happened." Neither Whistler nor Blade sat, which wasn't a surprise. Harry continued anyway. Whistler posted some pages on the Book of Erebus to mysticknowledge.com for assistance with the translation. That site is actually serviced by something of an order of mystic monks who defend the world from mystic threats. I'm something of a freelancer who works with them. I was asked to confirm the translation as well and determine the threat. I tracked Whistler's IP address here and found him mostly dead. I used some rather valuable mystic elixir to heal him, though not because I'm an upstanding guy. Harry turned to Whistler and said, "No offense, but you were my only lead, so saving you was my only option." Harry continued, "After returning him from the brink his mind was healed enough for me to read. Yes, I can do that. I learned what Frost had planned but had no idea where you were, so I used tracking magic on Karen's blood which she left around. Yes, I can do that too. Once I found her, I made a portal, sent her back, helped Blade kill a god, and now we're back. Any questions? Whistler asked quickly. What else did you learn from my head? Harry answered, enough. You guys do good work. Harry turned to Karen and asked, now Ms. Jensen, would you mind showing me how your cure works? I'd prefer if some more testing was done, but if there are no lasting negative effects I'd like to sponsor your research and perhaps mass production. Karen looked taken aback and asked, how much? 50,000 for startup and another 5,000 a month until you finish or give a reason to need more. Karen asked, will you need an invoice? She was asking in a roundabout way if the money could be spent on things other than her research. Harry said, I can pay you in cash off the books if that's what you want. If some of the funds gets donated. Harry looked at Whistler and Blade before continuing, to a cause you support that's fine with me as long as there are some results within 6 months. Karen smirked and asked, where do I sign? Much less results. She had a finished and tested product and had no problem making money reconfirming her results. Harry explained some of the details of his ideas and said he'd have some papers over the next day. He also asked if she wanted some extra security for her lab and Harry said he'd be willing to pay out of his own pocket for that. Whistler caught on that they were basically coming up with legal ways to pay and upgrade Whistler's and Blade's operation and both had a few words of input and suggestions on security equipment and guards. Harry also said he'd introduce Blade to a master smith who would enjoy forging weapons for someone who put them to good use. Up until now he had alluding to mystic monks but hadn't told them about the magic world. Blade was either an untrained muggleborn or a variant squib, so introducing him to the goblins was not against the law as long as he didn't tell Whistler or Karen what he saw and learned. When everything was settled, Harry called the Ancient One and gave her an update. She asked what Harry would do with a mass-produced cure and Harry would just sell it on mysticknowledge.com as exactly what it was. If the cure acted fast enough he could even put it in a gun and combine it with a potent tranquilizer to knock out vampires which would then wake up cured. Harry wouldn't do so to be nice to them, of course. It was closer to a sinister prank than an act of kindness. He doubted a cured vampire would praise the loss of their superhuman abilities even if it meant not thirsting for human blood and being able to see the sun. Someone who was used to such a thing having suddenly lost it would feel weak and powerless. Of course, they might be able to find someone to turn them back. He'd have Karen look into ways to stop people from being turned or ways to poison a person's blood against vampires to set a trap for those who tried turning the cured. Harry wondered if he was turning sadistic and decided to consult his girlfriends about it, though some of them were worse than he was. Harry spent the next 6 weeks signing papers, negotiating deals, and dealing with property. One of the companies partially owned by P&G Bank and Trust purchased a property Harry chose in New York and had it demolished. It was currently being rebuilt under Harry's exact specifications and would be finished by the second week of August. Harry's metagems were due to return in 2 weeks and Harry was eagerly waiting to see what shenanigans they tried. He wondered out of 10 how many groups would return all the samples and how many would have them stolen, lost, or try to return fakes to him and claim they were real. One night, however, Harry received a text message from the compact mirror phone he gave to Emma Frost. The message actually had Harry do a double take and in the next moment he filled his backpack with gemstones and teleported to Xavier's study. The message read, I've been kidnapped by giant, mutant hunting robots. Can't talk, please send help. Chapter 50 X-Men vs the Sentinels. Xavier needed some clarification on Emma's identity when Harry showed him the message and Harry basically told him she was the mutant daughter of a businessman Harry met and that Scott had been dating her for the past 6 months. This was enough for him to believe it wasn't some kind of trap, allowing him to assemble the X-Men. Harry asked Xavier, want to follow me to the astral plane and scout for more info from Emma? She can't call us but we should be able to contact her there. Xavier asked, can you track her through the astral plane? I can track my phones through the astral plane and she has one. Scouting in the astral plane was mostly useless as the astral plane did not reliably overlap with the physical plane. For example, the institute in the astral plane was far larger due to the presence of multiple telepaths. Walls and buildings were not always in the same position and distance was not accurate. However, they weren't going to use the astral plane for reference, just to find Emma and get more intel. Xavier nodded and said, agreed. Logan, inform the others and ask Scott to give them some details on this Ms. Frost. Logan grunted in affirmation from the side and Harry sat down in a meditative stance and took out a piece of quartz he made glow before he put it in his inventory. His astral self separated from his body and was followed by Charles's own. The astral plane didn't exactly have a color, but if one were to describe it they would probably call the space purple and the things within were a vaporish white. Xavier was rather confused when he saw Harry pull out some astral tech and say, she's this way. Hold on. Xavier suddenly found himself feeling enclosed and then pulled through space as if he was in the Blackbird while it was accelerating. This was a transport system that Lockheed's race used to travel long distances through the astral plane, though they used it for interstellar travel. Harry was just going a few hundred miles. The pulling motion stopped and they were floating in the air and saw what appeared to be Emma's signature. She was not actively using the astral plane but all telepaths passively connected to it, which was how they would communicate with her. Overall she appeared heavily stressed out but fine. Harry sent a mental call to Emma. This is the Mutant Assistance Hotline. Please remain on hold until the next operator is available. Your call is very important to us. Emma sent back with an audible sigh. A pleasure as always, Harry. I assume that is Professor Xavier traveling with you. Harry answered, yup, so what's going on and how were you kidnapped? Collateral damage, I suppose. My father was having a meeting with Shaw and the latter was not doing so great. I suspect you have something to do with that. Whatever protections he seemed to have were missing from what I could tell. Suddenly a great big bloody robot showed up and shouted, mutant apprehension in progress, and nabbed Shaw. Apparently it could detect mutants and nabbed me too once it saw me. I'm currently in some kind of cell being flown over to wherever. I have no signal on my cell but my mirror seems to have worked just fine. Her cell phone was not one of Harry's but rather one her father gave her to keep tabs on her. Xavier put in his 2 cents. Mutant detecting mutant hunting robots? Could it be the government or a private sector operation? He seemed to ask himself. Harry turned to Xavier and asked, you wouldn't happen to have Magneto's number, would you? If we're going to raid this place, we're going to do it right and a master of magnetism would probably be helpful. Harry knew a thing or two about the leader of the Brotherhood of Mutants from Wanda and from the time he used legilimency on Mystique. Xavier quickly answered, no. Although I have no doubt Eric would be of assistance in the goal, I cannot set him loose on the very people he has sworn to fight. Harry rolled his eyes. Xavier seemed to be making a lot of assumptions. Harry added, all right, can we at least bring the 3rd X-Men team and the available teachers? The former Hellions can stay and are strong enough to defend against attacks if anything happens while we're out. Last time there was an emergency like this, the available teachers had to stay behind to protect the Institute. Now with the addition of the well-trained former Hellions, the Institute had more strength to fall back on, giving Xavier more latitude. Charles nodded and said, agreed. Scott and the others are 16 and old enough to face the trials ahead. Harry still had a month and a half until his 16th birthday, but there wasn't a way to argue against Harry's inclusion in this mission, so that point was not mentioned. Emma added, do be prepared for the possibility of a trap. If they are taking me alive, that means they have enough confidence in their security to keep Shaw and myself from escaping, or they are using him as bait. In either case, expect resistance. Harry said, try to make yourself appear as someone else if seen by a human. When I get there I'll erase whatever footage they have of you. Just because Shaw got outed doesn't mean you should too. Emma stated back with a little relief, I would appreciate that. Harry used the astral tech to return himself and Xavier back to the location of their bodies and returned to the physical plane. Jean, Scott, and the others had already gathered and suited up for a fight. Though Bobby had to stay because he was down with the flu. The second team's Kitty Pryde offered to replace him since she was always around the mansion. Xavier stated, a new enemy has revealed itself but may not yet know of us. A robot that can detect and hunt mutants has captured a mutant who had a means to contact Mr. Potter, and she is currently on her way to either a place being set up for a trap or a detention center. Our new arrivals will stay at the Institute and remain on high alert to protect the students still at the school while we will mount a full-scale assault on the holding facility. Forge said, our priority should be the rescue of the captured mutants and seeing to their safe return, but we also need to find the source of these robots and see if we can take them out before they become a larger threat. We should do this in 3 teams. 1 to act as a distraction, 1 to infiltrate and rescue, and 1 to find the source of the robots. Scott added, agreed, but we should stick together at first until we learn the location of the other 2 objectives. Wolverine said, us teachers will act as the distraction then. You kids will do the infiltration. Forge, I'm guessing you and Potter will be team 3. Harry confirmed, works for me. Scott said, Harry and Forge should stick with us to help bypass security at first. Harry, can you bring some diamonds to make those portals for when we find anyone who has been captured? Once they are safe, you two can finish your espionage thing. Harry and Forge shared a glance and smiled. Calling it espionage wasn't exactly inaccurate. With the plan assembled they boarded the Blackbird and took off. Harry shared a mental conversation with Wanda, Rogue, and Jean to not hold back if things were to get hectic. All 3 had enough Obscurus particles to survive getting shot or stabbed, but he didn't want them to take chances. The only annoying thing about the trip was that Harry could only track Emma's mirror with astral tech, so to get directions he had to keep going into the astral plane over and over. Being reliant on astral tech was intentional as it made it so that only astral tech could intercept or track calls, but for situations like this it was annoying. The Blackbird parked in an abandoned train yard in a warehouse district some distance from where Emma's signal was coming from. Jean and Xavier used clairvoyance to map out the area and maintain a psychic link to all the groups. Before splitting up, Forge said, according to the readings off my equipment, this is definitely the place. It's using more juice than downtown New York, yet it's off the grid. I've got signal from hundreds of different security cameras and they're all heavily encrypted. Harry asked, government or private sector? The type of encryption used could tell you a lot about a group's origins. Private sector, definitely. Harry sighed. Private sector paid for the good stuff, meaning hacking wasn't easy. The group Harry took down in Canada with Wolverine was technically government, which was why their stuff was so easy to get into. Comparatively speaking, Xavier conveyed into everyone's minds, I can sense dozens of guards around the complex. I can shield you from their sight, but the cameras will give away your position. Harry said, even if we're showing our hand, it's best not to reveal the existence of a telepath on our side. Logan said, I'm with the kid on this one, Charles. Quick and quiet is not the way to go on this one. We need to be loud and messy to make a point today. Aurora added, children who use force must be taught that the use of force invites the force of others. Xavier conveyed back, very well. But I ask that you keep the loss of lives to a minimum. Harry added, but keep damage to a maximum. Fallen lives become martyrs which can be used to instill fear and get money out of investors. Damaged property has the opposite effect. Scott slightly glared at him for the fact that his justification for saving lives wasn't for the sake of the living. Warren sighed and said, he's not wrong. If this is a project from the private sector, it's getting its funding from investors. The results of tonight need to deter further investment. After finishing the plan, Harry got out 3 smoky quartz and made the infiltration group invisible. The only tech some of them had were cell phones from Brilliance which were protected against magic, and Forge's personal tech had been protected from magic since Harry worked with him on upgrading Danger. A heavy mist started flowing into the region at Storm's command. Harry's group quietly rushed through the warehouse district to the secondary entrance Xavier spotted, and there they waited. The group invisibility spell allowed them to see each other, but if they did not arrive at the wall before the mist set in, it would give away their position while moving. Once the heavy fog was thick enough to block cameras and guards from seeing more than a few feet ahead of them, the teachers rushed for the entrance. From Harry's group they could quickly hear the sound of gunfire and shouts. The occasional crackle of thunder echoed throughout the district. The radio clipped to the guards at the second entrance shouted, incoming hostiles main entrance. 3 sets of guards at the second entrance rushed over to the main entrance, leaving only 3 behind. Once the coast was clear, Jean and Wanda knocked out 2 guards while Rogue touched the strongest-looking one with an ungloved hand. Since learning how to erase remnants with Forget-Me-Not's power, she could add temporary knowledge taken from others without lasting effect. The man Rogue touched collapsed when she released her finger, and Rogue ripped a keycard from him and swiped it on the door. A metal panel opened, revealing a keypad and a hand scanner. Rogue changed her hand using Mystique's power to that of the guard and placed it on the scanner while typing in the security code. A surge of light forced Rogue removed her hand with a wince as an electric shock went through the hand scanner. Jean asked, problem? Rogue answered testily, no, it always does that. Anti-mutant security to make sure they're not being controlled. After getting shocked, if you don't type in the correct pin, they'll know. Forge whistled as Rogue finished typing the code. That's a lot of security for a side entrance. This type of scanner won't work on someone unconscious, and if they're controlled by a telepath, that shock would definitely wake them. Rogue said, that's not all. Can you make me visible? Wanda said, I can, and dispelled the invisibility with a silent finite. Rogue continued, follow me and stay quiet. Rogue then completely morphed into the body double of the guard she knocked out and pressed a switch to open the door. The door opened with a heavy thunk, showing the weight of the deadbolts holding the door in place. Rogue led the way, having gained something of a map in her mind of the place and knew where to go. The inside of the warehouse was completely visible to everyone within. There were no walls or places to hide, so anyone within the warehouse could be seen from any location in the warehouse. A number of heads turned to see the side entrance open, but when they saw Rogue in the form of the guard walking through, they turned away. Rogue stood to the side of the door as the still invisible team entered, and Rogue said aloud, if anyone approaches, shoot the lock. A breach cannot be allowed. Do you understand? To anyone paying attention to her, it looked like she was talking to someone outside the door while the door was still open. Once the last of the team was through, Rogue closed the door and kicked it for good measure. Infiltrating a site without walls was very different from normal location and heavily relied on misdirection. Thankfully, every member of the group was well trained and could adapt to this easily enough. The sound of heavy gunfire continued to echo from outside. The interior of the warehouse was at least the size of a football field and had an assembling line of complex industrial parts. At the end of the warehouse were a dozen 20-foot-tall robots with red steel armor over a purple armored chassis and in the shape of humanoid weapons. Rogue marched forward with a stern expression that made others want to get out of her way towards the end of the facility. According to his last reading in the astral plane, Emma's mirror was at the opposite end of the facility. Most of the engineers seemed to be in an armored room, so the few personnel in the way could be walked around for the invisible group. Using Jean's telepathy to talk with the group, Harry said, our invisibility should protect us from heat scanners or mutant scanners or whatever, but a mutant scanner can probably detect Rogue and those robots. Rogue interrupted him, Sentinels, they're called Sentinels. Harry continued, fine, those Sentinels may detect her and they're right next to the holding cells. Rogue said, if they see me, I'll use Mr. Rasputin's power and make some noise and draw them to the other side of the warehouse. Scott said, all right, we'll back you up as soon as Harry gets the prisoners out. He knew that Rogue using Colossus's power made her invulnerable and she could take care of herself. Wanda and Jean held back their full strength in most training sessions, but Rogue didn't. There was no way to really hide the fact that she could use anyone's power and look weaker than she was, so she might as well practice as much as she could. Much like Harry, she was becoming a jack of all trades type, so she needed a higher variation of practice anyways. Kurt said, shouldn't we leave once they're safe? Scott answered, no, Harry was right. We need to do as much damage as possible. Forge added, and that will make an excellent distraction for our own little espionage. He mentally chuckled. Once they got closer, they saw a group of engineers setting up the Sentinels. Jean took a moment to get a read on them and said, they're about to turn them on. A man with dwarfism in a tailored suit was shouting to the men climbing over and setting up the Sentinels. Get these operational now. Mark 1 and 2 don't look like they're gonna last much longer. This is not a test, people. Xavier said through their link. The teachers are engaged with 2 of these Sentinels at the main entrance. They do appear a bit buggy though, so there have been no issues so far. I cannot say the same if those doesn't reinforce them. Scott conveyed through the link. Harry, you can break those robots, right? You're good at breaking tech. He said that last part with just a bit of humor. If they're not shielded, I brought a dozen smoky quartz and used 3 to make us invisible. I can use the other 9 to disable the Sentinels, but I can't guarantee I can take them all out. 9 at best, 4 to 6 at worst. There really shouldn't be a way to shield them, but the team didn't need to know that. Jean, Rogue, and Wanda all turned to him and raised an eyebrow in disbelief. On a separate telepath channel, Harry conveyed, "What, did you think I was going to keep all the fun to myself?" Yes, he could take them all out, but then what would the others have to do? Rogue smirked and conveyed back, "Ah, that's so sweet, Suga." The fact that she smiled at him while looking like a buff security guard made Harry flinch. Jean rolled her eyes and conveyed through their private link, "Take out 9 to be on the safe side." Wanda conveyed, "Did Scott forget my magic can do worse things to tech than Harry's?" Harry answered, "Yep. You can cast magic without breaking tech, so you don't break it nearly as much as I do." Harry's wizard magic always broke tech and Wanda's only did when she wanted it to, giving the false impression that Harry's was worse towards tech than her own was. Wanda cutely pouted, which made Harry want to pat her head. He reminded himself to do it later. "They're up," shouted one of the engineers. The remaining lab techs jumped off the Sentinels just as they were lightening up. They all stood up and seemed far more intimidating standing upright than they did sitting down. One of them turned to face Rogue, which was a sign for the others of the group to move away from her and stand off to the side. A speaker on the robot's neck shouted, "Mutant apprehension in progress." All of the other Sentinels turned to face Rogue, which confirmed that Harry's invisibility shielded them from whatever mutant detection system the robots had. What Harry found interesting was that only one of the Sentinels noticed Rogue and the others just followed that one. The dwarf and all the scientists turned to see Rogue, who smiled back and lightly waved. She then transformed into a tall, beautiful, brunette woman who looked to be in her early to mid-20s. This face and body did not belong to anyone specific. All X-Men had masks and costumes to hide their identities, but Rogue took it a step further and used Mystique's power to make a completely different appearance. With practice she was able to stay in this form without much effort, and this allowed her to fight without having to wear a mask or one of Harry's hard light disguises. Rather than run away, Rogue took the moment the Sentinels charged their weapons and ran over to the shorta, calling the shots. Without warning she knocked him out with a finger touch, and picked him up. It wasn't the Sentinels she concerned herself with, it was the dozen guards with energy-based weapons that were still in the warehouse. This hostage was both important and easy to carry, so he was the obvious choice of human shield. Carrying the little man, Rogue then started running over to the other side of the warehouse, with the Sentinels tracking her movements with their arm cannons. Their targeting system registered her as a mutant but registered the dwarf as a non-mutant, and their programming prevented them from shooting when she used him as a shield. The guards around the cages at the end of the warehouse ran after Rogue, leaving the cages unattended with their backs to the prisoners. The cages contained 6 adults, 2 teenagers, and 3 children. Harry said through the link, "Wanda, remove the separations inside the cages and unlock their monocles." Wanda fired half a dozen bolts of red light into the cells, which struck the ground beneath the bars separating the cells. The bars then appeared to liquefy, as if melted through. They weren't hot. Scott said through the link, "The invisibility is wearing off, get into position as soon as the prisoners are out." The group was going from invisible to see-through but were gradually fading back into view. Since everyone had their backs turned, Harry figured this was a good time for his invisibility to wear off. He wasn't going to hold their hands forever after all. Harry pulled out a diamond and, after making it glow and putting it back in his inventory, he made a silver portal at the end of the cells. The blonde-haired Emma Frost was having an off day. She did not care for being suspended by chains and monocles in a cell. Shaw was in another cell and unconscious from whatever drug they used on him to stop him from struggling. She'd watched the Sentinels learn as they observed his energy absorption and moved right to physical force and knockout gas. Emma didn't put up a fight, so they didn't drug her. She couldn't reach her mirror since arriving here, but the sound of fighting in the front had been promising. She'd gotten much from the minds of these men, as long as she got out of there, she'd be able to use it. She certainly hadn't expected a disguised rogue showing up, taking Bolivar Trask hostage, and getting the Sentinels away from her cage. The bars melting and her boyfriend wearing his costume slowly becoming visible in front of her were also rather surprising. She unconsciously smirked at his costume but put those thoughts away. For later at least. Wanda shot a few more hex bolts which unlocked the captured mutants. Those who were unconscious were caught by Jean's telekinesis, and Scott quietly said, "Get them through the portal." Emma didn't argue and motioned for those still conscious to run through, followed by herself. Jean lifted the unconscious ones through just as the portal closed. The students recognized the main hall of mansion through the portal, so they weren't worried about them. Dr. Kinney would be able to look after any injuries. Jean conveyed through their private link, "Isn't one of those guys a bad guy?" Harry answered, "Possibly more than one." Harry wasn't going to assume that everyone had been innocent victims before being captured. "It'll be handled," he stated. "Mutants? The prisoners are escaping." One of the guards had coincidentally turned around and saw the now visible X-Men. The Sentinels turned around just as Harry finished charging a spell. 9 egg-sized pieces of smoky quartz crystal levitated in front of him and glowed using the Lumos charm. Harry used the vanishing charm on them all and cast a massive field stunner. A red wave shot out from Harry's hands and the guards dropped. 8 of the Sentinels emitted heavy sparks and the lights in their eyes dimmed before they fell and crashed. Harry eyed the Sentinel he intended to fry which had survived. The speaker on its neck shouted once more, "Mutant apprehension in progress." Harry figured that the one which could sense mutants was shielded somehow. He'd need to look into that. The arms of the 4 Sentinels shot 8 red beams of what Harry and Forge recognized as heavy ions. Basically super electricity. It could melt metal or shock flesh. Sustained use on a living person would kill but a single shot would only injure and incapacitate. Jean and Wanda raised a Chinook and magic shield as the Sentinels raised their hands and the shields held back the beams. 2 of the Sentinels stopped shooting and moved to approach while one turned around to attack Rogue and the last maintained firing at the shields. Scott shouted, "Hit 'em hard." Jean and Wanda reduced the size of their shields to only block the ion cannons, giving Scott the room to fire his eye beams. Kurt took Kitty's hand and teleported above the Sentinel firing and released Kitty, who fell intangibly through the 20-foot-tall robot and a moment later walked out of its foot. Unsurprisingly, the robot stopped firing, started twitching, and small explosions were heard inside as the Sentinel collapsed. Spike shot bone spike after bone spike at the approaching Sentinels, but the first set bounced off the robot's red steel armor. He aimed for the joints, which allowed him to lodge his spikes into the crevices and inhibit the bot's movements. For a moment, the Sentinel used its metal hand to sweep the stuck spikes away. Scott's concussion beams targeted a Sentinel's head, which pushed it back, showing the massive force of Scott's power, but the Sentinel put a steel hand in front of the beam and by bracing itself against it, was able to move forward. A massive crashing sound echoed from the back of the warehouse where a steel-skinned Rogue had used a strength-augmented fist to smash off the upper torso of the Sentinel, which had gone after her alone. She was holding back, showing off only until the guards were unconscious, since she wanted to play around a bit with her evil, little, human shield. The 2 remaining Sentinels looked back to see the destruction of the other 2. Wanda and Jean used the chance to attack. Jean created a large Chinook blast and shot it across the warehouse, and Wanda cast what appeared to be a bolt of red lightning. The Chinook blast passed through the armor of one of the Sentinels and shook it apart from the inside, while Wanda's supercharged hex bolt caused the other Sentinel to directly explode. Kitty, who watched the whole thing with a grin, shouted, "Who? Girl power," referencing that the girls took out the last Sentinels while the boys, besides Harry, did not contribute much to their destruction. Kurt complained, "Hey, I helped too." Kitty said, "It's okay Kurt, you can be one of the girls too." Kurt did a 3-finger facepalm and said, "Oh, why me? I never get a break." Harry and Forge were busy hacking the computers and Harry said, "It's not their fault. These things were designed to go against serious firepower. Attacking from within or using tech-disrupting attacks are the most effective unless you have the impact strength of the Juggernaut." Scott asked, "What about the teachers outside?" Xavier answered telepathically, "Already defeated. Wolverine's claws were able to penetrate their armor, forcing them on the defensive, and it only got worse for them from there. Very few sensors can easily penetrate a thick layer of fog." Forge added, "If these readings are right, then we're very lucky. Jean's and Wanda's shields are far stronger than what most can generate, and Harry was able to take out most of them at first. If not for these facts, those dozen Sentinels could have made very short work of us." Most of the kids nodded. Kitty could only take one out at a time, and her surprise assault was not guaranteed to work when it was no longer a surprise. After a few more moments, the door to the main entrance opened and the teachers entered from what looked to be a battlefield. The Sentinels were in pieces as Wolverine had sliced off their knees, arms, and heads. Ororo looked over the large pile of Sentinels and said, "My word. There were so many." There was concern and real fear in her voice. Speak quickly said, "It's all right Auntie. Harry took out most of them in one shot and we handled the rest." Harry walked over to the Sentinel that Jean took down. It was the one which had the mutant sensor and the one that survived Harry's spell. Harry said, "Logan, can you open up this one's head?" His claws came out without question and he slashed open the robot's face. Harry reached his hand inside and after a few moments, pulled out a box connected to dozens of wires. He ripped the wires off and smashed the box into the ground, revealing the content. Dr. McCoy asked, "What is that?" Harry pulled out a very small metagem emerald from the system and said, "This is mine. One of the samples I loaned out. Seems someone figured out a very creative use for it, sensing mutants. It was also singed. Apparently it acted as a lightning rod for magic, which was why the Sentinel survived the spell. The implications didn't need to be said. Harry would start working on this soon." Jean said, "You're the only one who can make those, right? Please be careful with those." Harry answered back, "Emeralds can generate holograms, illusions if you will. The scanning system uses the emerald to make an illusion of a person. The problem is that the illusion gives more information about the person than a picture does, including whether or not that person has a mutation. Making an illusion of the person and scanning the illusion is how this system works." Kurt said, "Wait, isn't that the same emerald as the one in my disguise watch?" Harry nodded. "Yeah, don't lose those. If you do, a mutant scanner can be made from it." Scott said, "Then don't sell emeralds." McCoy said, "But the same technology could be used as an advanced, non-intrusive medical scanner and save thousands of lives." Harry smiled. This was a problem, but problems kept things interesting. Forge used his toys and Harry's assistance to successfully hack into the systems and lock everything down. The safe room where the remaining personnel were hiding would remain locked while they finished up. Scott, Jean, Wolverine, and Wanda were busy destroying everything that looked valuable to all but reduce it to rubble. On the computers themselves, Forge and Harry didn't delete anything. Instead, they made it look like someone tried to hack in, failed, and tried to destroy it and failed. The data on the computers was likely backed up offsite, so deleting it was useless. What they did instead was fill the computer with hidden viruses. Once the current data was connected to the offsite system so the backup could be updated, the backup would be uploaded with the viruses. The viruses would not go off then either. They would simply, slowly, infect every system connected to the computers. 1 week after the virus was uploaded, it would start to slowly scramble the data. It wouldn't even be obvious at first. The most insidious part about this was that when data seemed corrupted, the user would always try to find a backup copy of uncorrupted data. The act of doing this would infect the stores of uncorrupted data as well. Once the virus went off, the very personnel in charge of fixing it would ensure its spread. Jean and Xavier had ensured that the faces of the captured mutants in the memories of the personnel were edited. The security footage was destroyed and purged using some super electromagnets Harry carried around with him. Once everything was done and the group returned home on the Blackbird, Harry used his time turner to go back 2 hours and set up a few things. He returned to the warehouse and invisibly sat on the roof of a building overlooking the entrance of the warehouse. Soon, the fog enveloped the area. Harry's energy senses could easily see through the fog, and since all of the X-Men could be considered high level, they were all very bright. Even the energy weapons on the guards were bright, making everything visible for him. Harry saw Wolverine rush up the left side of the alley and Beast the right side. Logan backhanded or performed a rotating elbow strike on the guards' heads, knocking them unconscious, while McCoy simply smashed his largest hands together against their heads, knocking them out. With the fog clouding their vision, the guards were dropping one by one. An alarm sounded and they finally figured out something was wrong. Massive turrets rose from steel platforms and charged themselves, but they could only rotate aimlessly through the heavy fog. Harry figured they used motion sensors or thermal vision. Either would be fine in light fog, but this pea soup fog made them nearly useless. Human guards, on the other hand, were more than willing to open fire blindly into the fog, shooting at random and hoping for a lucky shot. Harry was magically concealing his mind so Xavier didn't sense him, but Harry did sense Xavier mentally knock out several guards, one by one. He wasn't just sitting on the sidelines in the Blackbird watching the group. He was the most powerful telepath alive after all. Mutant apprehension in progress. 2 sliding doors opened from buildings to the side of the main entrance and the massive Sentinels were revealed. In the next moment they started firing their heavy ion beams. Accurately too. Harry had seen their schematics by now and knew they could target using heat, light, and sound. Sound was partially muffled by the thick fog, but at this distance it wasn't by much. Wolverine and Beast were shot and blasted back within 2 seconds. Colossus charged forward at one of them and shouted to direct their aim. He then tanked the heavy ion beam but was having trouble continuing his charge. The Sentinel then used the beam of both hands and the metal-skinned Colossus was finally pushed back. Several of the guards were still firing and Angel was sitting on the rooftop observing the rest. The fog made the turrets useless and held the fire of the guards, but it also makes his wings too dim to use effectively, and the movement of fog, should he try to fly through it, would give away his position to the energy weapon-wielding guards. Not everyone was useful in every fight after all. The cackle of thunder above them and the concentration of natural energy around Aurora was another reason Angel was just scouting instead of flying around. Beast was jumping around to take the aim of the second Sentinel while Colossus continued trying to push against the beams of the first. Both were distracting the pair while Wolverine finished taking out the remaining guards with Xavier. The immortal mutant only took a few moments to recover from the shot and knew how to walk quietly. 3 bolts of lightning struck the head of the Sentinel, firing at Colossus, which stopped its beams and made it nearly fall. Nearly. It righted itself back up and looked for its target once more. The Sentinels were completely shielded from most forms of energy, including heat and electricity. Harry cast a very light finite incantatum spell at both Sentinels. The spot he aimed for was the tracking system, meaning they would have lousy aim for a while. This was why the professor said the Sentinels were buggy. Harry then teleported to a certain location and moments later, a portal opened and he received his guests. The location itself looked very much like Xavier's mansion, but it was not. It was a duplicate Harry had prepared in advance. Harry used a selective invisibility spell on himself when the rest became visible so the prisoners never saw him and wouldn't think there were 2 of him. Emma might find out if she looked hard enough, but she had already given up on figuring out Harry's secrets because they gave her migraines. Harry walked over to the group and started casting diagnosis spells to check their health and asked Emma, "So who are your new friends and what should we do with them?" Emma had read all of their minds as well during her stay. She pointed at the unconscious adults, all criminals and deserve to be locked up somewhere. She pointed at the other teen mutant and the 3 kids. They are simply known mutants who were easy targets. Field tests in controlled conditions. Though their powers could be useful if duplicated. Harry would leave them to the professor then. He asked, "What do you want to do with Shaw?" Emma smiled and said, "Leave him to me. I took a peek at what you've done." Apparently he was being protected by a woman named Selini and she hasn't been seen in a while. He practically outed himself several days ago and without a telepath to clean up the mess, he became a target. Harry said, "This Sentinel program won't end because of what we've done today, but it will certainly be held back. Hopefully long enough for the anti-mutant sentiment to change or until we can remove the possibility of funding. Emma threw her hand back as if it was a minor concern. Within a year, the money that funded my little adventure will find its way into more reputable endeavors. Harry smiled but didn't ask. After what she'd been through, he wasn't going to say anything against a little payback. Harry opened a portal for Emma to return home. She took Shaw's unconscious body with her and Harry doubted he'd ever see the man again. Emma was fully capable of controlling a person and without a telepath to back and protect him, he was likely going to become a puppet and after serving his purpose, he doubted he would ever be seen again. Yachts sink so often these days. Harry then opened another portal to the actual mansion and used some light compulsions to get them to go through. Once through, he used a light memory charm to erase the moment and let the people think they'd gone from the warehouse to the mansion directly. Harry had already changed the timestamps on the cameras in the mansion so no one would notice the discrepancy. Harry had specific protocols for this type of situation and it required moving the unknowns to a safe location before moving them to the mansion. Only after scanning to make sure they didn't have any pathogens or surgically implanted bombs would he move them to the school. He had also used some stunners on the remaining knocked out adults for good measure. A little over the top, but Harry had all the time in the world to think and came up with a lot of security measures to keep those he cared about safe. He doubted he'd get everything but it didn't hurt to try. For now, he just had to wait for time to catch up to him. Then he would find which group lent his metagems to the Sentinel program and get as much as he could out of them. Then he'd find some time to spend with his girls. He was turning 16 soon and it was summer after all.